Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became Eraserhead Part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see Part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story apprentice of InsomNyaC from 𝐴3. So let's start the video. He was alive. Normally, this inconsequential stray thought would not even register. Of course he was alive. After all, he was thinking, so being alive stood to reason. The issue, however, was the fact that Izuku was fairly certain he had just died, that Shigaraki had won. But here he was, breathing, a pulse thundering in his ears. But that is where it got even weirder, because the hands he now held up in front of himself in wonder were not his own. They were far too small and unbroken. The scars from the UA Sports Festival gone, and with them the constant background ache. The hands of a child. 9th, Izuku looked up in the darkened bedroom that he had awoken in. Standing over his bed was the misty form of First, looking at him in concern. First, what happened? First seemed to sag slightly in relief. Your guess is as good as mine. I am just glad that whatever happened did not destroy your connection with One for All. Not to worry you, but you don't exactly look much like you anymore. That had Izuku jolting to his feet and stumbling over to look in the mirror. Staring back at him was not his face. It was close, but not a single feature he had shared with his mother stared back at him. None except his green eyes that glowed faintly from within. His hair was just as much a mess as always, but the green that he had known was replaced with snow white. He kinda looked like a curly-haired version of First like this. He met First's worried gaze reflected over his shoulder. Do you think that when I died, we reincarnated as someone else? First looked like he had bit a lemon but gave a reluctant nod. That is what seems to be the case. From how old you look currently, I think it is likely that we all woke up as a result of your new body possibly manifesting One for All for the first time. Do you have any memories of who the kid used to be, or are we flying blind? Izuku had to think about that. Suddenly, memories that he had been glossing over jumped to the forefront of his mind. He jolted as his name suddenly clicked into place. Amizawa 𝐴. What the fuck? 𝐸𝐸𝐸. The next couple days were a bit of a mess, but Izuku learned a lot about his former homeroom teacher over those waking hours. First, he was now an orphan. His mother had died in childbirth, and with no known father, he had ended up in the foster system from the start. His current fosters were not bad people, but their relationship was tainted with the knowledge that they would not keep him after his quirk came in, since they dealt only with infants and toddlers. Once they knew what his quirk was, he would be transferred to a home equipped to deal with it. Second, he did in fact have Erasure, and using it was as easy as breathing for him, unlike One for All. The first time he used it, he had not even meant to. He had just turned to glare at Fifth for distracting him and felt his hair swirl up and away from his scalp. That had earned him a panicked yelp from the man and a few of the other vestiges that had First later explaining that with his eyes glowing red like that, he was a spitting image of All for One. That was concerning enough so that he ended up asking his fosters if he could turn his hair black. They said no, but that perhaps his future family would let him. When they asked why, Izuku had activated Erasure for them for the first time and stated that his white hair made him look creepy when his eyes changed color. Third was the fact that evidently his quirk made him the spawn of Satan in his guardian's eyes. Okay, sure, he could understand why, given he knew what it felt like being on the other end of Erasure. Your quirk disappearing was bound to be jarring when you weren't expecting it, but it was not like he had hurt them even if they had acted like it. That was how, less than 24 hours after waking up, he was bundled off to a special orphanage for kids with villainous quirks to receive the treatment they deserved. There, Izuku learned all about a new kind of quirk discrimination, as his new guardians treated him like an active threat, a treatment that most of the other kids in the shared home seemed to agree with. After Izuku erased another kid's quirk as they threatened to hurt another kid, Izuku got his own room as a result. Then, as he grew older, the blindfold came out, as Izuku was forced to sit through the dullness that was elementary school again. He found himself being forced to wear it even in some classes from the clear fear his teachers and classmates had of him. This gave Izuku a whole new level of respect for his former homeroom teacher. To go through all of this and still become a hero spoke a lot about his personal character, especially given that the vestiges had started joking that they should hunt down All for One, so that they really knew what it would be like to have their quirks stolen like they accused him of doing, instead of, just temporarily switching off their connection to their quirk factor. If that didn't say just how bad things were that they were saying that Izuku should seek out the symbol of evil and the man at least in part responsible for all of their deaths, then Izuku was not sure what could. Still, as a literal child, there was not much they could do about it. Not if Izuku was ever going to get into UA again. 𝐸𝐸𝐸. The years slowly crawled by, with Izuku slowly becoming more and more Aizawa 𝐴. After all, that is who he was now, as strange and slightly depressing as it was. The Aizawa sensei that he knew and looked up to would never exist in this timeline. Not now that he had so thoroughly replaced him. So, to try and desensitize himself more about the name change, he asked the ghost to start calling him 𝐲𝐸. That eventually rewarded him with actual names from the other dead holders. While, yes, he had known the names of a few of them before, it had felt odd using their given names up until then, especially with a few of them still being unknown to him. Now, however, they were not 1st through 7th but Yoichi, Katsumi, Toyami, 𝐬𝐻𝐦, Degoro, and Nana. They were a strange little broken family of the dead. But it was not just internally that he was changing but externally too. The lack of positive attention led to him starting to grow out his hair and eventually allowed him to dye it black like he had long wanted. Additionally, as more and more time passed, and he used his erasure more, the darker his eyes became until one day he looked in the mirror and saw a child version of his former teacher staring back at him. But it wasn't Aizawa-sensei, it was just 𝐲𝐸, just him and the ghosts of his past, both literal and figurative. Still, the twisted familiarity was something to cling to. Proof that his previous life was real and not a fit of madness. More proof that the ghosts that made up the vast majority of positive human interaction were not just hallucination. It helped ground him in this new timeline as he made new memories, and his old became fuzzier around the edges with the passage of time. That spurred him to use all the pocket change he could scrounge up to buy a pocket notebook for a couple of $100 that he and the Vestiges used to catalog every important detail of the other timeline they could think of. Unfortunately, it wasn't until it was all written down on paper that he realized how many holes in information he had been dealing with when it came to his various villains. Take Kurogiri for example. He knew that the man was actually a Namu from what Aizawa-sensei had told him, but who had been used to create him was a mystery to him. At the time, it had not mattered since there was little to be done about that fact by that point, but now, likely before the first Namu was even in the planning stages, he could have saved the man that fate if he could have found him. But that was just one example of an issue. Another one was not even the Vestiges were 100% sure where and when the big fight between All For One and All Might had been 5 years before Izuku had met All Might. He knew vaguely when it happened since the incident had been covered up with his fight with Toxic Chainsaw likely earlier that day and the rough area in which it took place, but he had no way of stopping the fight or being in right place at the right time in his now future to help All Might without risking becoming collateral damage. And it was not like he could warn him off from the fight either. After all, if Sir Night-Eye, the man's sidekick and one of his best friends, could be so completely ignored despite the fact the man's quirk literally could show him the future, what chance did a complete stranger claiming to be his successor from the future have? If anything, 𝐲𝐸 found himself worried that he would get mistaken for a follower of All For One, as it was because of his own multiple quirks. As a result, he found himself resigned to only using erasure and the imperceptible from the outside danger sense unless an emergency forced his hand. Worse come to worse, he could develop a separate vigilante persona to use all his quirks later on down the road. One issue 𝐲𝐸 was quick to discover about his new life in his foster home was that he was generally better off if he just didn't go back unless the weather got really bad, like major snowstorm or heat wave bad. The issue was, he ate better if he didn't. Okay, sure, it was safer to sleep locked up in his closet at night, but he could easily catch up on his missed sleep at school since between the blindfold and lack of anything to actually learn, there was no reason not to sleep then. So 𝐲𝐸 found himself developing his teacher's old nocturnal nature, sleeping in class, happily undisturbed at his desk, only woken when the teacher was forced to remove his blindfold for testing. At night, he roamed the streets avoiding other people and scrounging up meals from wherever he could find them. Of course, this inevitably led to very awkward run-ins with various heroes working the late shift, the most interesting of them being the young hero in training 𝐷 during his first internship, whose mentor for the week probably had thought he could use the later patrol experience since he had been purely training for daylight patrols. 𝐷, he discovered, was now only 5 years older than him, a fact that he had never really registered given that, well, he hadn't known that his homeroom teacher had been only 15 years older than himself until he woke up in the past. The teen had been hanging back from his hero mentor in an alley while he attempted to pop the lens from his mask since they had not been made with night vision in mind when 𝐲𝐸 had rounded the corner and froze at the sight of the unmasked future pro and current UA student. 𝐷, to his credit, spotted him immediately and quickly gave chase to grab him before he could really get away. "Hold your horses, kid. What are you even doing outside alone this late? Where are your parents?" 𝐲𝐸, scruffed by his uniform shirt, went limp like a cat in the hopes that the sudden increase in weight would allow him to escape. It didn't work, of course, since 𝐲𝐸 probably weighed half what a kid his age should weigh and was admittedly a bit on the small side from the lack of decent food for 6 of this body's 10 years. Resigned to his fate, he gave a pointless quirked glare at 𝐷 before answering, slightly mortified that his future colleague in heroics and teaching was seeing him like this. "I was looking for dinner. The bakery you were behind sometimes tosses out their leftover pastries that are too stale to donate to the food bank." It was about then when his mentor, quickdraw, rounded the corner to investigate what was taking 𝐷 so long. She paused at the mouth of the alley at the sight of them. 𝐷, put the kid down. You don't grab little kids like you would a cat. 𝐻𝐸 turned back to look at her. If I let him go, he is gonna bolt again. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 flashed his quirk in annoyance again. I'm not a little kid. I'm nearly 11. The heroine hissed through her teeth at that. Kid, you really don't look like you are nearly ready to start junior high in a little over a year. 𝐻𝐸 obviously did not hesitate to repeat what little 𝐲𝐻𝐸 had told him. The kid was planning on digging through the dumpster behind the bakery here for his dinner. From the sounds of things, he has done it before. She frowned and met 𝐲𝐻𝐸's glare. So what's your name, kiddo? I'm 𝐀𝐦 and this guy with me tonight is my hero in training, 𝐻𝐸. Aizawa 𝐲𝐻𝐸. And why are you out so late like this? 𝐲𝐻𝐸 was not stupid. He knew what she really wanted to know. My fosters don't care what I do so long as I am not a threat to them or the other kids with my monstrous quirk. She winced at the words with the amount of sarcasm that 𝐲𝐻𝐸 was dripping with as he said them. What is your quirk then? Erasure. I can temporarily disable most quirks by looking at someone that lasts only until I blink, after which I have to activate it again. Using it is reflexive when I am startled or upset. 𝐻𝐸 winced. Is that what you were doing glaring at us? Hate to break it to you, but neither of us were ever gonna use our quirks against you. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 huffed and squirmed in his grip slightly. Obviously, I was pretty sure neither of you were going to shoot me. Oh, does your quirk tell you what the quirk you are canceling does? 𝐲𝐻𝐸 blinked. Don't be ridiculous. I just already knew what your quirks were. Your quirk is public record as a Limelight Pro hero, and his was literally just broadcast all over the country thanks to the UA Sports Festival. Even if I hadn't gotten the chance to see his face, I doubt there are any other guys his age walking around with guns here in Japan. 𝐻𝐸 snorted as he lowered 𝐲𝐻𝐸 so his feet were both resting on the ground. He has a point there, 𝐀𝐦. I'm not exactly packing common support equipment. The pro shrugged. Hey, you can't exactly blame me for wondering. Quirks that directly affect other quirks are pretty rare. Come on, let's get you down to the station. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 ended up trading that set of shitty fosters for a new pair. Okay, sure, his new ones at least fed him, gave him a proper bed, and never blindfolded him like his last ones, but they were hardly nice to him either. The indifference that he had grown used to was replaced with active aggression to enforce their rules. If he was late getting home, his foster father would drag him by his hair inside, and he would be assigned tasks that really should have been reserved for someone that was at least a full teenager, but whatever. If he had to obsessively scrub surfaces with dangerous chemicals every other night, well, at least it was him doing it and not one of the actual kids. So what if the man grabbed him hard enough to bruise? At least he never did it somewhere visible, so 𝐲𝐻𝐸 was never at risk of losing his steady food source. The Vestiges did not agree with the sentiment, especially Yoichi, whose disgust with the man was somehow heightened by the fact that as bad as his own brother had gotten with him, he had never raised a hand to physically hurt him until the end. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 was quick to point out that while Yoichi personally had been fine with starving himself, 𝐲𝐻𝐸 was not. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 could deal with pain, but he could not really risk his health by continuing to starve. Plus, as already stated multiple times by that point, it was better him than the other real kids. Another side effect of his new foster situation was the fact he was in a new school for his last year of elementary. That was going just about as well as he had expected it to, though, with his blindfold now gone, he was now getting in trouble for nodding off at school. Thankfully, the one other social pariah had latched onto him almost immediately and had seemingly decided to help 𝐲𝐻𝐸, if not stay awake, at least not get caught sleeping as much. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 couldn't exactly blame him for it, even if he was largely indifferent to the kid. Yamato was mute and completely reliant on using JSL, and with 𝐲𝐻𝐸 being the first other kid his age that knew it, well, 𝐲𝐻𝐸 was his first ever friend. A fact that hurt slightly with the knowledge that had 𝐲𝐻𝐸 not had his memories or the Vestiges, the boy probably would have been his in this life too. It wasn't even like Yamato was mute because he couldn't handle social interactions like had been the case with 𝐀𝐦. The guy was a complete social butterfly trap, speaking a language that only a select few that he interacted with could understand. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 wondered if Aizawa-sensei had known Yamada in their past life and been friends. He hoped for Yamada's sake that they had. They had been loosely considered friends for a few months when 𝐲𝐻𝐸 asked about the boy's silence. The boy shrugged. My quirk is basically just my voice. I can't control how loud I am, and well, I break eardrums when I talk. My parents are both deaf from my quirk when I was an infant since I was born with it. Suddenly, 𝐲𝐻𝐸 realized he had already known Yamada the whole time. The cheerful blonde that had always glued himself to Aizawa-sensei in the form of present Mike was who his new best friend had the full potential to become. Well, that answered the question of if their alternates had been friends, didn't it? You want to try talking while I use my quirk on you to turn it off? Yamada blinked before his hands flew up, stumbling through signs in clear excitement as he signed over himself in a mess of half-finished thoughts. You could how do that is what your quirk does. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 laughed slightly before activating his quirk. Try talking. Yamada gave him a suspicious look before taking a breath. Okay. He jolted when his voice came out at a normal speaking volume, his quirk's nature having shielded him from his vocal cords from becoming damaged from disuse. Wah, how are you doing that? 𝐲𝐻𝐸 snickered and blinked. So long as I maintain continuous eye contact, I can disrupt a person's mental connection to their quirk factor and thus shut off their quirk. It doesn't work on mutations, obviously, but emitters like your voice are fair game. Yamada continued to speak, seeming to not realize 𝐲𝐸 had stopped using his quirk. But how did you even know that it would work? Wouldn't it make more sense that with my voice shut off I just wouldn't be able to talk? To 𝐲𝐸's and the Vestige's collective amusement, Yamada stayed at a reasonable volume. True, but it was worth a shot. So you've never been able to talk at a normal level? No, never. 𝐲𝐸 gave the other boy an amused grin. Ah, well, congratulations then. Congratulations. What for? You seem to be talking at a reasonable level just fine. Well, yeah, but you were using your. He cut himself off as he blinked and seemed to register that 𝐲𝐸's eyes had stopped glowing red at some point. Holy shit. And in other news, the placebo effect seems to have done your control wonders. 𝐲𝐸 turned back to his homework that they had been working on together when he had asked. Your control was bad because you thought it was bad, so you raised your volume to high levels because you thought that you would. Yamada stared at him with wonder in his eyes before tackling 𝐲𝐸 in a tear-filled hug. From that moment forward, 𝐲𝐸 was really stuck with him, Yamada trusting him to use his quirk when he got too excited but finally speaking normally, much to their teacher's seeming relief as the boy began to finally come into his own. Okay, sure, they were both hardly popular kids, but some of the other kids in their class had apparently been slightly curious about what Yamada had always been saying, even if they hadn't cared enough to invest the time into learning sign to find out. Still, they were a duo now, so while his home life continued to get worse, his life outside of those walls only improved. That is why, after they started junior high and Yamada had firmly become 𝐬𝐻𝐸, 𝐲𝐸 started to eat dinner at his friend's place and just eventually stopped going home to his fosters again. Sure, he hadn't actually moved in with the Yamadas, but his parents were always more than happy to let him eat dinners with them after he had accidentally mentioned in front of his 𝐬𝐻𝐸 that dinners with them were vastly better than what he got from his fosters. The only reason he never tried more than once in a blue moon to sleep over was because, well, he wouldn't exactly be sleeping since he still really could only sleep in the relative safety of the school during daylight hours. It wasn't that his 𝐬𝐻𝐸's place didn't feel safe. It was the issue of nighttime always putting him on edge. So he was pretending, at least to them, that he was still going back to his foster every night and that he just had a sleeping disorder that he had developed while living on the streets for a couple of years, which was not exactly untrue. They never questioned it, at least, even if his 𝐬𝐻𝐸 seemed to know he was lying from how he always tried still to get him to stay the night. Why would they? 𝐲𝐸 always turned up to school in a clean uniform, looking tired, sure, but always in good condition with all his homework done. Sure, he dozed off in class a lot, but the teachers had clearly decided a while ago he was likely just bored in class and would have bumped him up a couple of grades had 𝐲𝐸 not refused the offer, pointing out that he couldn't exactly get into the 𝐴 course until he was 15, so that would have left him spinning his wheels outside of schooling for 2 whole years. They had reluctantly dropped it. While they clearly were not confident in his ability to make it as a hero, they did at least recognize that the written exam would be a cakewalk for him and he could easily get in on an academic scholarship to the other courses. What really annoyed 𝐲𝐸 about that, though, was the fact that they did not think the same was true for his 𝐬𝐻𝐸. Despite the fact he was nearly as book smart as 𝐲𝐸 and he hadn't cheated with future knowledge and helpful ghosts to get there. As they walked to his home for dinner after a day full of students getting career counseling, 𝐲𝐸 crumpled up the sheet of alternate career paths for himself and chucked it into a bin on their way past. What a bunch of bull. Me an accountant. Really? His 𝐬𝐻𝐸 snorted. Oh God, really? That was one of your recommendations? 𝐲𝐸 rolled his eyes. I mean, I get them saying teacher, given that I was planning on that being my fallback when I retired from active heroics as well as lawyer and cop for obvious reasons, but what about me screams that I would make a good accountant? His 𝐬𝐻𝐸 turned to look at him and scratched his chin with a mock serious expression. Well, you certainly have a mind for numbers. His expression cracked. Oh well, if I really had to guess, it would probably have to be how plain your face is. It makes you blend into the background a lot when you are trying to fly under the radar. Shoo, and, well, an accountant is about as below the radar as you get. 𝐲𝐸 pulled a face as he had to admit the truth to that. It was an unfortunate side effect of basically being identical to 𝐬𝐻𝐸. While at the time he had been alive, he had stood out as fairly attractive. By current standards, he was actually pretty plain looking. So what about you? Anything as stupid as that? His 𝐬𝐻𝐸 shrugged. Sort of. I actually got recommended going into modeling, which, while flattering, plays into like 0 of my actual skill sets. I mean, seriously, I am a polyglot, so if nothing else you would think they would suggest a form of language-based career, but no, I am obviously just a dumb airhead blonde. I could never be smart enough for that. All I am good for is standing around looking pretty. 𝐲𝐸 patted him reassuringly on the shoulder. To be fair, I am pretty sure All Might has to put up with that crap too. People always seem so surprised when he breaks out into fluid English as if he didn't live over in the States for the better part of a decade. Plus, in order to pull off some of his attacks without actually killing someone, he has to know how to do a lot of force calculations on the fly. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 gave him an odd look. You know, I always forget that you are some sort of All Might superfan and then you go and say stuff like that and remind me. It is like getting decked in the face. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 scratched the back of his head. I mean, my encyclopedic hero knowledge is not just All Might exclusive, he is just easy to find information on since he has been #1 for so long. The mystery of how his quirk actually works was just a fun puzzle. Plus, there was the whole cheating from formerly being the man's successor. That piqued 𝐬𝐻𝐸's interest. Wait, you think you figured it out? Maybe. I think it has to be a transformative quirk of some sort given that there are never any sightings of All Might in casual settings, and despite it being common knowledge that he attended UA, there is no sign of him in any of the archived UA sports festivals, but there is a skinnier blonde guy that looks a bit like him who won all 3 of his that is in the right ballpark for his age. A guy I was able to trace to being currently employed as All Might's assistant. Either he has a brother or close cousin or I accidentally stumbled upon his secret identity. I'll show you everything after dinner. A part of 𝐬𝐻𝐸 couldn't wait for the chance to meet All Might in person if only because he wanted to know how he would react to someone having accidentally discovered his actual identity in junior high. He was hoping he could use that fact to get UA to maybe change how the UA Sports Festival was broadcast, even if he likely couldn't get them to stop given that the televised 3-day festival brought in the bulk of UA's income outside of the student fees. He and the Vestiges had long resigned themselves to the fact that there was little chance of ever being able to tell anyone about the truth of 𝐬𝐻𝐸's whole existence given that they had no explanation as to how it even happened. Well, Yoichi blamed his brother, but given that was his go-to for everything, that was not terribly surprising. Still, there was no reason he couldn't have a little fun in how he acted upon his future knowledge. This was his second chance at life and he was going to live it. It was later that night when 𝐬𝐻𝐸 met All For One for the first time upon his return to the past. Only, that wasn't how he met him. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had briefly frozen while walking through the park on the way back to where he had been staying during the nights in place of his shitty fosters when he spotted a familiar couple walking in the opposite direction. Midoriya and Ko and Hisashi, newlyweds, and, given the date, likely expecting their first. The funny thing was, had he not stopped when he spotted them and drawn attention to them, he wasn't sure the Vestiges would have noticed his former father. However, their reaction to him startled him, because they didn't see them the same way he had but saw All For One with an arm curled around his mother. The explosion of noise from them all startled him to the point he found himself falling to the ground clutching his head, desperately trying to stop the noise coming from inside his own brain. This of course got both of their attention as from their perspective an older junior high student just collapsed out of the blue right in front of them. The next thing 𝐬𝐻𝐸 knew, he was being scooped up and carried by his father All For One as the pair seemed to try and get his attention. He barely registered it as the Vestiges panicked around him, drowning out his thoughts. He didn't actually register much of anything as he found himself sliding into the grip of a full-blown panic attack. It took being basically smothered under a warm, familiar weighted blanket in a familiar living room with the familiar warmth of his mother's tea in his hands that he began to come out of the mental fog. I never realized being kidnapped would be so nice. There was a sputtering cough from his All For One as the man seemed to choke on his own tea. His mother and Ko giggled at her husband's sputtering before turning to 𝐬𝐻𝐸 with a look of concern. Are you all right now? It looked like you were having a panic attack and were unresponsive, so we brought you back home with us to keep you warm until you calmed down. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 took a sip of the tea, pointedly ignoring the still slightly panicked ghosts who had thankfully seemed to at least have lowered their volume. Yeah, that happens sometimes. Thanks for that. I'm not sure how long I would have been out in the cold otherwise. All For One seemed to have gotten himself back under control. Do your parents know that you are out wandering around this late? Well, given that I don't have any, that would be a no. All For One gained a pained look at that. You're an orphan. I'm sorry for your loss. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 shrugged. My mother died before I could even remember her, and my father was apparently not in the picture, so it is not like I have anything to miss. Would be nice if my fosters sucked less though. So what you're saying is we could keep you and no one would carry you out. All For One rubbed the back of his head from where Ko had smacked him in his seat on the other couch. Hisashi, we are not actually going to turn this into a real kidnapping. All For One gave her an amused smile. But why not? The kid needs a home and I thought we both agreed to the idea of kids. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 blinked. Well, this was most certainly not something that happened to Aizawa-sensei. Probably, though to be fair, he probably did not have a bunch of voices in his head and over a year's worth of war trauma that sometimes gave him panic attacks, so had probably just walked straight by them if they had ever crossed paths in that other timeline. To be fair, if you did kidnap me for real, my best friend would definitely notice when I didn't turn up at school tomorrow, but I doubt anyone else would care. That earned him a bright smile from the symbol of evil. See, he wants to be kidnapped and everything. Ko found herself laughing slightly at that. Hisashi, stop calling it kidnapping. Surprise adoption then. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 snorted. He had very few memories of his father as Izuku, but one thing he had always missed about the man was his sense of humor. The vestiges fell deathly quiet before Yoichi tentatively reached out as the pair lightly bickered over whether or not they were actually considering offering to keep 𝐲𝐸 for at least the night. My brother, he was actually your father. Like, this isn't just some trick. Your mother actually married him. 𝐲𝐸 sighed slightly as he sipped his tea to prevent himself from mumbling his response. In my defense, with his injuries and the fact that he never brought it up himself, how was I supposed to know? You never exactly showed me what his face actually looked like, and it had been years since I heard his voice, so beyond thinking it sounded vaguely familiar, I was completely in the dark. I just thought he was working over in the States and kinda sucked about remembering to call us. In hindsight, his calls stopped around the time of the All Might fight. A part of me wonders if the reason he stopped calling is just because he forgot about us. He probably had at least some brain damage from that mess based on his scars. Yoichi looked positively green at the thought but nodded. As much as I want to say he might have stopped calling just because he is an asshole, the part of me that knows just how obsessive my brother was about myself when I was his only family leaves me having to agree. I highly doubt he would just stop caring about what happened to you to the point of being fine with you dying if you really were his son. Maybe that was why he sent me back. It wasn't until it was too late that he remembered who I was. That seems likely. 𝐲𝐸 was yanked out of his mental conversation by 𝐴ll4One gently tapping his shoulder with a small frown. Did you want to stay the night? With how much you are still zoning out, I am not sure I could in good conscience let you walk home alone this late. 𝐲𝐸 blinked up at him. I am probably not going to sleep for most of it. My sleep schedule is kind of fucked at this point. That is fine. If you want to spend the night just watching late-night television on our couch, you are more than welcome to. 𝐲𝐸 nodded. 𝐀𝐦 gave him a small smile as she poured him another cup of tea. I'm not sure if you registered it before, but our names are Midoriya 𝐀𝐦 and Hisashi. Could we have yours? Aizawa 𝐲𝐸. She nodded with a familiar gentle smile. It is a pleasure to meet you, Aizawa. You mentioned living with a foster family. 𝐲𝐸 nodded. They are the third one I actually remember. The ones before them got arrested for neglect after I got caught by a couple heroes wandering the streets at night when I was 10 because I was starving. My current family sucks in a completely different way, so I haven't exactly gone back there in a while. He was not sure why he was trauma dumping on them like Todoroki had done to him over a decade ago for him and yet another decade and a half into the future. He would have to remember to do something about the Endeavor thing after his friend was born. At the moment, with his own former mother not even visibly showing her pregnancy yet, Todoroki Shoto had obviously not even been conceived yet, with Izuku being months older than the other boy. Still, uncertain of the why or why not, he had still done it and was now receiving clear concerned looks from his former parents. After a beat, 𝐴ll4One met his wife's gaze and gave her a challenging look. We are keeping him. She half-heartedly glared at him. We aren't kidnapping him and are not adopting him without his own permission. Hisashi. 𝐲𝐸 blinked. Wait, you weren't joking. 𝐀𝐦 gave him a sympathetic look. I have to apologize for Hisashi for that. Once he gets something into his head, it is hard to change his mind. So, yes, he was actually being serious with his offer to kidnap you. But why? I am literally just a random homeless teen that you picked up off the street. You don't actually know anything about me. That is true, but the same goes the other way, and despite that fact you seem rather comfortable with us despite having no reason to seemingly trust us. I don't imagine it is normally this easy for you to lower your guard around strangers. 𝐲𝐸 winced at being called out by 𝐴ll4One, but he couldn't help it. Even with having not seen either of them in over a decade and now knowing just what one of them did for a living, they were still his parents. If it hadn't been for the fact one turned out to be one of the villains who he had been fighting when he had died, 𝐲𝐸 probably would have considered just telling them the truth that he was their time-traveling, currently unborn son. You just feel safe. I can't really explain it better than that. That answer seemed to completely catch his former father off guard. To be fair to him, 𝐲𝐸 had to admit that had he not known him prior as his father from the other timeline, he probably would never have registered as such. 𝐴ll4One was a lot of things, but safe. The man was just as tall and imposing as All Might, but with an edge to him that the mind screamed as dangerous. He was a predator and pretty much everyone else was prey. Maybe that was how 𝐀𝐦 won him over, because 𝐲𝐸 had never once seen her scared of him, but he was pretty sure the opposite was true from how he had seen the man fold to her when he had been just a little kid. Still, his former father was now staring at him in a state of shocked delight. His former mother gave the pair of them a soft smile. So I take it that means you are not actually opposed to staying with us, even if only for the short term. 𝐲𝐸 felt his face heat up as he realized what he had accidentally just done. He knew that look from both his former parents. Yeah, there was no getting out of this, was there? He had actually allowed himself to be surprised adopted. Whoops, clearly Yoichi seemed to realize it too from how he sighed and shook his head. 𝐲𝐸, while I am happy that you found somewhere safe to actually live, did you really have to pick my brother? You know that this is only ever going to end in tears. Still, he gave 𝐀𝐦 a weak smile. Yeah, I don't hate the idea. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 gave him a look of exasperation when he showed up at school early the next day as normal and told him what had happened and where he had ended up staying the night. 𝐲𝐡𝐢, you said it yourself, they kidnapped you. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 shrugged and enjoyed a sip of the coffee in the travel mug that 𝐴ll4One had offered to him that morning when he had asked for a cup of coffee as well. They are nicer than my Fosters. Shoo, that is not a high bar to beat. What do they even do for a living? Fuck if I know. Whatever it is, it pays well though. That was a complete lie, but he was hardly going to tell his best friend he had been taken in by the symbol of evil and his stay-at-home wife. He was getting enough shit about it from the vestiges. Well, all of them except 𝐬𝐡𝐢, who was mostly just resigned to the inevitability of his now future adoption. When I mentioned I was planning on trying for UA with you, they offered to help me pay for it. That had 𝐬𝐡𝐢's brows shot up in surprise. Wait, really? I take it back. You should totally agree to the surprise adoption. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 snorted. That wasn't exactly a surprising reaction since prior to that, they had been struggling to come up with a feasible way for 𝐲𝐡𝐢 to pay for his schooling if the plan for scholarships fell through, since 𝐬𝐡𝐢's parents couldn't exactly pay for both of them together in full, and 𝐲𝐡𝐢 sure was not going to get enough tuition money from the government that his fosters would have been much help, even if he sucked it up and dealt with them that long. UA cost an arm and a leg to attend compared to other schools. As it was, it had been hard scrounging up the money to pay for the application fee to take the entrance exam for 𝐲𝐡𝐢. You say that like I had much of a choice in the matter. I get the impression from 𝐀𝐦 that once 𝐬𝐡𝐢 gets something into his head like that, he doesn't exactly ever give up. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 made a face. That is going to take some getting used to. Does the guy have to have a name that sounds so much like mine? I didn't exactly pick him, 𝐬𝐡𝐢. Why did you let them take you home with them in the first place? 𝐲𝐡𝐢 winced. He had skipped over his panic attack, not wanting to admit fully how bad off he was mentally when he couldn't exactly explain the reason behind it. But this was 𝐬𝐡𝐢, and given that he knew that his friend's counterpart had apparently stayed friends with his teacher until the end, maybe he could tell him at least part of the truth. Not the time travel part or about one for all, but I might have had a panic attack last night in the park in front of them. When I was unresponsive, they decided to just take me the short way back to their apartment so I wouldn't freeze to death while I dissociated. I didn't really register what had happened until I had apparently been sitting in their apartment for the better part of an hour. Thus the whole kidnapping joke. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 jolted before really looking him over. Are you okay? What even set you off? Normally you're cool as a cucumber and you were just fine when you left my place. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 shrugged. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 reminded me of someone who hurt me in the past. I don't want to talk about it. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 was quick to snap his mouth shut before he could ask another question, but his hands slightly betrayed him as he unconsciously half-signed his question, wondering what exactly happened. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 sighed and averted his gaze to pretend he hadn't seen it. It was an open secret between them that 𝐲𝐡𝐢's past before they met had not been great. Between the way 𝐲𝐡𝐢 never reacted to physical pain, his ability to completely ignore the need to eat regardless of how his stomach was growling, and his clear nightmares when he slept at night, it was not like 𝐲𝐡𝐢 could really hide everything. Still, he never asked for more than what 𝐲𝐡𝐢 himself willingly offered to him. So this 𝐬𝐡𝐢 guy scared you, but you still are okay with possibly living with him? 𝐲𝐡𝐢 gave another shrug. He is nice enough and clearly made the effort to try and not scare me more. After they got me to their apartment and he set me down on their couch, he made sure to give me plenty of space and didn't block any exits. Plus, it is kinda weird, but he sort of feels safe. I am not sure how to explain it better than that. And the guy who hurt you didn't. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 winced as images of both Tamura and the monster of 𝐀𝐦 flashed through his brain as he threw up a hasty mental wall to separate this 𝐴ll4One from his counterpart. No, he never did. The monster of 𝐀𝐦 was not his father, even if he had been using his body and real quirk. He had attacked Izuku with killing intent too many times to have been him in any meaningful way. The man who played the civilian Midoriya Hisashi, he was fairly certain, would never have attacked him or put him in any danger if he had been in his right mind. A sentiment that even the vestiges had to agree with. The man had always been far too possessive of what he had believed to be rightfully his to have ever considered going through with such an action. Even 𝐬𝐡𝐢's death had been largely unintentional on 𝐴ll4One's part, as much as they all hated admitting it. As strange as it was, if this 𝐴ll4One had decided that he was his, then he was probably better off allowing it from the protection that it could afford him. Especially if the fight that had nearly killed the man before could be avoided, and thus he never left the young Izuku and 𝐀𝐦. And himself now, he supposed. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. A few days later, 𝐲𝐡𝐢 found himself in a courthouse having his custody signed over to the man who raised his murderer. And his mother, he supposed, but he couldn't exactly be dramatic about that. Still, there would be no more running away whenever he felt like it. After all, he could hardly delude himself into thinking that he could ever escape 𝐴ll4One. One good thing about the whole situation was that clearly, while 𝐲𝐡𝐢 knew fully who he was, the man seemed to be fully in the dark about his connection to One for All. Though to be fair, outside of the ghosts and danger sense, 𝐲𝐡𝐢 had not touched One for All since he had become 𝐲𝐡𝐢. Still, he did wish the Vestiges would relax a bit more about the man's presence, given that he would be a near constant for the near future at least. The judge looked up from the paperwork he had been reading to look at 𝐲𝐸. Everything seems to be in order. That being said, before I sign off, I would just like to have a word with young 𝐬𝐻𝐬 here alone. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 gave a worried look, but all for one just smiled and nodded before leading her back out into the hallway. Now alone, the judge laced his fingers together as he looked at 𝐲𝐸. I just want to make sure that you are fully okay with them taking custody over you as your parents. I will admit, the short timeline raises a few red flags. 𝐲𝐸 shrugged. Yeah, my best friend said the same thing. Still, they are way nicer than my current fosters and are offering to help me afford to attend UA, so I would be crazy to say no. You are not worried that they might have less than pure intentions in taking you in? 𝐲𝐸 scratched his head. I mean, we met in the first place when they found me having a panic attack and helped me come out of it. If anything, I feel like I am intruding. The judge nodded before gesturing to the door. You can let your parents back in then. 𝐲𝐸 felt a small smile at the pair being called as such, despite his soon-to-be father being all for one. It was almost as if he had reclaimed a piece of himself that he had lost over a decade before. He opened the door back up and gave the pair another small smile. You can come back in now. After they had all gotten settled again, the judge gestured at the paperwork, with everything seeming to be in order. That just leaves one last detail. Will we be changing young 𝐬𝐻𝐬's name or keeping it the same? All for one turned to 𝐲𝐸. That would be up to 𝐲𝐸. If he wants to fully become a 𝐵𝑡𝐸 or not is up to him. His mother nodded and offered 𝐲𝐸 a smile. Just know that regardless of what you chose, you will still be family, so there is no pressure to accept. 𝐲𝐸 had been thinking about the possibilities since the offer had been raised originally. While he was fond of the name 𝐬𝐻𝐬, that name would always belong to the sensei that he had known. And even if he planned on one day following in his footsteps to try and help change things for the better, well, he doubted he could ever bear to carry the name 𝐬𝐻𝐬 sensei himself. I am not opposed to the name 𝐵𝑡𝐸 𝐲𝐸. And so, that day, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 𝐲𝐸 and 𝐵𝑡𝐸 Deku Izuku truly became one. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. On the whole, his life did not change much as a result. He still went to school and still hung out with Hisashi before and afterwards most days, but now he had a home to go back to at the end of the day and was given the chance to eat his mother's long-missed katsudon recipe again during the dinners he took with them. He still wasn't really sleeping at night. The Vestiges still too on edge by his newly adopted father's mere existence nearby, but now he had coffee and the internet to distract himself from his normal exhaustion. As winter replaced fall as he settled into his new life, he and Hisashi started to study and train more and more for the upcoming entrance exams at UA. 𝐲𝐸 was slightly amused that his new father was so clearly at a loss for how to deal with 𝐲𝐸's goal. He was clearly trying to be supportive, but his complete disdain for the heroics industry clearly bled through. Still, he could hardly argue against 𝐲𝐸 trying for it when UA was one of the best schools in the country. 𝐲𝐸 allowed him to convince him to sign up for the management course as his backup, which seemed to relax him a bit, but only just a bit. It was painfully obvious that all for one was actually worried that he was going to get hurt. While he could say a lot of negative things about the man because of who he was while working, he really could not disparage the paternal instincts that the man clearly had. Instincts that only seemed to get worse when 𝐀𝐦 revealed she was actually pregnant not long after 𝐲𝐸 had moved in. That had been an interesting Sunday that the pair of them had spent oscillating back and forth between ecstatic about the future baby and wanting to reassure 𝐲𝐸 that this didn't mean that they wouldn't still care for him. They had switched back and forth in front of 𝐲𝐸 about 4 times when he blandly told them that he knew how babies were, that obviously they had conceived his future younger sibling before they had even met, and that they were being ridiculous about worrying about him being upset about it. Honestly, it is not like the baby is popping into existence out of thin air. You guys said it yourself that you had both wanted kids. It stands to reason that the two of you were actually trying for them before you found me. I am 15, not 5. I am not going to be jealous of the kid when they are born. That would be completely illogical. That had left the pair amusingly embarrassed, but did eventually earn him several excited hugs from both of his parents. When 𝐲𝐸 turned up at school the next day looking more ruffled than normal, he found himself having to give Hisashi the news in way of explanation. My parents are overcompensating with the affection since in about 7 to 8 months they are going to be pretty distracted by the new baby and don't want me to feel left out. Like I am not going to be one of the ones helping change diapers after they are born. Oh, Hisashi seemed to be at a bit of a loss for that. So, you're going to be an older brother then. That was fast. 𝐲𝐸 snorted and buried his face in his new gray scarf that his mother had gifted him. Well, they had technically already been expecting for a couple weeks when we all met. Mom is just far enough along that now we know about it for sure. I'm not really surprised. I just think the fact that they basically gained 2 kids in the span of less than a month without meaning to is kinda funny. Hisashi seemed to consider that. Huh, what are the odds of that? So everything with your new folks is good then? Yeah, we're all good. They are both just excited since it is both of their first pregnancy despite it being Dad's apparently second marriage. While they are both happy to have me as their kid, they did sort of miss my childhood, so they are excited for all those firsts. The poor kid is going to be absolutely smothered with attention from them when they are actually born if my parents' behavior with me before even finding out about the pregnancy is any good measure. 𝐬𝐡𝐷 bumped his shoulder. So what you're saying is your new folks are good people. Good. You deserve a family as great as you. 𝐲𝐴 had to bury his face in his scarf as he felt his face heating up. I'm not that great. 𝐬𝐡𝐷 flung his arm in a very telegraphed way to give him warning to wrap him in a hug. Nonsense. You're my personal hero after all. If it wasn't for you, I never would have figured out my quirk and never could have followed any of my dreams. 𝐲𝐴 leaned into the touch. You would have figured it out eventually on your own. You're smart enough for that. All I did was speed up the process a bit. 𝐬𝐡𝐷 bumped his head against his own. Nope, you are the brains of this operation. I might be smart, but you are like a super genius. You just need to learn just how awesome you are. 𝐲𝐴 signed and rolled his eyes as he pulled away. Anyone could know all that stuff if they put the extra time in to learn. Shoo, you are like a couple grade levels above everyone else. The only reason you didn't skip junior high completely is because you wanted to go to UA. 𝐲𝐴 huffed and jammed his hands into his coat pockets. I also didn't want to ditch you. You're the best friend I have ever had. And it wasn't a lie. Sure, he missed his friends from his previous life, but his friendship with 𝐬𝐡𝐷 ran deeper than any of his previous ones. Most had only had a little over a year to form, and, well, things with 𝐀𝐦 had always been complicated. While sure, he was still keeping secrets from him, it was not a matter of trust but a matter of protection. The last thing he wanted to do was to force 𝐬𝐡𝐷 to shoulder those kinds of dangerous secrets. Not this young anyways. They were not secrets that one could come back from once revealed after all. 𝐲𝐴 couldn't believe he had forgotten just how bad the UA entrance exam was. Even with the cheated foreknowledge of how the test was scored, he was pretty sure he was still probably going to fail. Still, he was going to save all these idiots from getting themselves or others killed. At least he didn't have to worry about 𝐬𝐡𝐷. Even in the testing center one site over, he could hear 𝐬𝐡𝐷's excited whoops and cheers as he destroyed robot after robot. Meanwhile, 𝐲𝐴 had been leaning heavily on danger sense to avoid attacks not just from the robots but the other testers. At least from the looks of things, he was not the only one in that same boat. One of the other test takers he actually managed to pick out of the crowd as an actual future pro was a teen that he was quick to realize was the future 𝗛𝐷𝐿 of the wild pussycats. He absently wondered how she was managing. He had just moved out of the way of a laser blast from a one-pointer when danger sense spiked massively from a place a few meters to his right. He turned and saw a boy with what seemed to be some sort of cloud-based quirk dodge a blast from the robot as the building behind him exploded. Oh, right, the 0-pointer. Fuck, the two of them were right in the path of travel, weren't they? 𝐲𝐴 flew into action and tackled the cloud boy out of the way of the rapidly approaching tank tread. Unfortunately, this put them both into the line of fire of the robot that had been targeting them before. Instinctively, 𝐲𝐴 pivoted to put himself between the two as they continued to fall. His back suddenly exploded in pain as the attack hit and was quickly followed by the jarring of his left side impacting on the pavement. As he cried out in pain, the other boys seemed to quickly take everything in before creating a wall of cloud between them and the smaller bot. Shit, that looks really bad. Don't move, okay. I am going to move you with my quirk back to the entrance. 𝐲𝐴 winced and looked at the tread rolling by just a centimeter from the pair of them. You okay? Am I okay? I should be asking you that. You took the hit from me because I froze up. 𝐲𝐴 winced as the other boy rolled him onto what seemed to be a bed of cloud. 𝗓𝐴𝐸 𝐸 𝐷𝐸 𝐷𝐸. Really? You don't look very green to me. 𝐲𝐴 snorted as they slowly floated up out of the streets on his cloud. My quirk changed my eye color. They actually used to be green. Besides, I am adopted, so that is to be expected. That makes sense. So how many points did you get before you saved me? 𝐲𝐴 had to think. Only 7 villain points, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was not the only metric they used for scoring us. Otherwise, no one with mental-type quirks like mine would ever pass. Oh, what is your quirk? You said something about it changing your eyes. It's called erasure. When I use it, I can temporarily erase the quirk of whoever I am looking at. My eyes glow red when I use it. Dude, that sounds totally awesome. It sucks that you got screwed over having to fight robots, though. From the sound of things, you would have rocked this test if the villains were actually people. Just, don't use it on me right now. We're kinda high up right now. 𝐲𝐴 found himself snorting again. Sure, 𝐀𝐦 and 𝐍𝐴₂ would probably get along. So how did you do? 26. You think I got enough to pass? If we get points for helping each other out, then you should be a shoo-in. Just remember to work on your dodging for me later. I don't want to have to drag your ass out of the line of fire again. Sure, that is a promise I think I can keep, 𝗵𝐷𝐸 𝐸. 𝐍𝐴₂ felt slightly sick as he sat in the back of the ambulance. 𝐲𝐴 was out cold now, but his back recovery girl had apparently taken one look at the damage and called the current principal to call for an actual doctor. She had been yelling at him about it over the phone about how trying to heal the damage with her quirk would only do more damage in the long run. When the ambulance arrived, courtesy of Nezu going over the principal's head, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 had found them as another boy from 𝐬𝐡𝐢's test site helped load him into the ambulance and immediately climbed in the back with him, refusing to take no for an answer. The boy with the cloud quirk was crushed up next to him as they pressed up next to the door to give the emergency workers room to work as they peeled away the cooked layers of skin from his best friend's back. There were places where his spine showed clear through, the bone discolored from the heat that had flash-boiled his skin clean off. 𝐬𝐡𝐢's stomach twisted as he realized he would likely never be able to stomach barbecue again as the smell permeated the enclosed cab of the vehicle. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 was slightly terrified of how the Midoriyas were going to react. While he did not know them that well yet, with them having only had custody of 𝐬𝐡𝐢 for just over 3 months, he did know that neither of 𝐬𝐡𝐢's new parents would take this injury well. 𝐬𝐡𝐚 was, first and foremost, a warrior. She took to mothering not only 𝐬𝐡𝐢 but 𝐬𝐡𝐢 on his visits so completely naturally that 𝐬𝐡𝐢 had immediately understood why 𝐬𝐡𝐢 had lowered his guard around her. Her husband, on the other hand, while more than willing to fund 𝐬𝐡𝐢's schooling at UA, was admittedly not very happy about the idea of 𝐬𝐡𝐢 trying to go into heroics. But given that evidently both his brother and his brother-in-law had died while working in the field, that was a bit understandable. It had taken a bit of negotiating on 𝐬𝐡𝐢's part to convince the man to allow him to apply directly for heroics over the management course that he evidently preferred for him. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 was worried that even if 𝐬𝐡𝐢 made a full physical recovery, this near brush with death would be enough to make it so 𝐬𝐡𝐢 couldn't join him in the heroics classes. The boy beside him seemed to be just as worried. After they were all offloaded at the hospital, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 had been swept away behind closed doors for surgery to hopefully repair the damage. With him now gone from their sight, the two of them fell into a pair of chairs in the waiting room. It was the other boy who broke the silence. It was my fault. I froze up when the 0-pointer appeared and he had to knock me out of the way of getting run over. In the process, the 1-pointer I had been fighting shot at us. He actually twisted as we fell to shield me from the head. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 huffed and swatted the other boy lightly. Don't blame yourself for 𝐬𝐡𝐢 being a selfless idiot like always. Besides, from the sound of things, it could have easily been both of you going back to get fixed up if you had both been hit. Learn from it and don't let it happen again, yeah. The other boy rubbed the back of his head. So you're his friend? Yeah, since the year before junior high. He was the only one who knew JSL, so we hung out by default. That got him a surprised look. JSL? Why would that matter? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 sighed and scratched the back of his head. While I was mute up until the end of the 2nd month we knew each other. My quirk is tied directly to my voice, so until I figured out how to dial down the volume, I basically had no choice in the matter. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 was the one who figured out my mental hang-up that was keeping me from learning control, and the rest was history. I'm Yamada 𝐬𝐡𝐢, by the way. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 𝐈𝐟. So you've met his parents then? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 nodded. Yeah, nice folks. His mother is probably the sweetest woman I have ever met, and that is counting my own mother, who was willing to put up with me when I was an eardrum-rupturing baby. The first time they met, they apparently helped him with a panic attack. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 was just about to respond when the doors to the emergency room flew open to reveal a terrifyingly angry Midoriya 𝐬𝐡𝐢. Okay, sure, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 had known the guy had a fire-breathing quirk, but he had not realized just how monstrous he could look with flames leaking from the corners of his mouth in his state of heightened emotion, especially with the man's towering height. Behind him was the far smaller, panicked form of Midoriya & Co., tugging on his hand to draw him back outside. Quickly realizing that the man was on the verge of accidentally burning the place down, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 leapt to his feet to meet them before the heroes were called on the man. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 will be okay. He is just back in surgery. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 would have had to have been blind to not see how several people seemed to relax as the demonic-looking man closed his eyes and seemed to swallow back his flames. Yamada, what happened? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 gestured for 𝐀𝐻 to lead the man over to where they had been sitting. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 got shot by one of the robot lasers while getting himself and our new buddy 𝗔𝗂𝐬 out of the way of getting run over by an even bigger robot. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 here is the one that helped evacuate him safely so that the ambulance could bring him here. The guys in the ambulance say he might have prevented spine damage with his quick thinking and quirk use. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 gave him an odd look, knowing full well that they had not actually said anything of the sort but could read the room well enough that he didn't correct that idea. 𝗀𝐻 gave 𝐬𝐡𝐢 a knowing look, but 𝐬𝐡𝐢 thankfully seemed to buy it. So the blame falls solely on UA. Quickly realizing what 𝐬𝐡𝐢 had just done, 𝗔𝗂𝐬 was quick to nod. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I think it is kinda nuts how much overkill the power on those weapons were, and that it was total nuts of them to activate the 0-pointer while two people were basically under its tank tread unknowingly. I see. The venom in the man's voice made the pair of them shiver slightly as he quickly stood back up to his towering height. He quickly leaned down to plant a kiss on the side of his wife's temple and fished out his phone. I am going to step outside and have a chat with UA, I think. Quickly realizing where this was likely going, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 chimed in. Just so you know, both Recovery Girl and 𝐀𝐦 were quick to respond to the incident and were the ones responsible for the ambulance getting called right away. Apparently, the current principal tried to avoid calling them and wanted to force Recovery Girl to use her quirk of 𝐲𝐻𝐬, which she said would have only made the damage worse. The man's face was livid again. I see. 𝐴𝐻𝐸, bless her heart, waited until the doors closed behind him before questioning them. So what really happened? 𝐬𝐻𝐸 gestured to Shirakumo. He froze up slightly at the sudden appearance of a 10-story robot and forgot about the one-pointer that he had been fighting. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had to knock him out of the way before he got run over. The one-pointer shot at the pair of them as they were falling clear of the zero-pointer, so 𝐲𝐻𝐬 twisted them in midair so that only he got hit instead of both of them. After that, Shirakumo took over and used his quirk to get him out of harm's way with as little jostling as possible. She frowned but nodded. I can only imagine how terrifying that must have been. Where were you in all of this, Yamada? 𝐬𝐻𝐸 shrugged. They split up kids from the same schools into different testing sites. I didn't know about 𝐲𝐻𝐬 getting hurt until I spotted him getting loaded onto the ambulance as I left my own site. Not going to lie, that was a nasty shock. She sighed and nodded. Shirakumo, whose gaze had been glued to the door that 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had disappeared through, turned back to her. Ma'am, I mean this in the nicest way possible, but that is your husband? She giggled slightly. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 might have a bit of a temper, but he is really a big softy at heart. You should have seen him the night we found 𝐲𝐻𝐬 for the first time. He turned to putty and 𝐲𝐻𝐬's hands the moment he picked him up. Honestly, I half think that if 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had had a family before us, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 would have gone through with his threat of just kidnapping him in order to keep him. While I have no proof of it, I think 𝐲𝐻𝐬 reminds him of his late younger brother a lot. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 snorted. If I hadn't met him before today, I probably would be struggling to see it too. I mean, I know he warned 𝐲𝐻𝐬 that he had a temper, but man, that was something else. I am struggling to match that image of him to the guy who spent hours arguing with 𝐲𝐻𝐬 over the correct order in which to watch the Star Wars series like the complete nerds they are. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 gained a distant look in her eye as she seemed to think about that with a frown. Yamada, Shirakumo, can you both keep a secret from both 𝐬𝐻𝐸 and 𝐲𝐻𝐬? 𝐬𝐻𝐸 gave her a suspicious look. That depends. If I think 𝐲𝐻𝐬 should know, I will tell him. Shirakumo raised his hands in surrender. I don't know either well enough to make a judgment call. My lips are sealed at least. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 sighed. I suppose that is fair. Just know, I am planning on bringing this up at some point soon with both of them. The thing is, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 is both older than me and has admitted in the past I was not his first marriage or love. While he always swore that he didn't have any kids, when we met 𝐲𝐻𝐬, I will admit, I had a few doubts. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 both looks and acts too much like 𝐬𝐻𝐸 for me to have just ignored it so. When 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had blood work done with our primary care doctor, I might have asked if he could do a paternity test behind their backs. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 is actually 𝐲𝐻𝐬's missing father. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 felt his jaw drop. Holy shit. Really? What are the odds of that? The small woman shrugged. Given how cagey 𝐬𝐻𝐸 has been about his previous partners, honestly no idea. Still, it is rather obvious that he had no idea about 𝐲𝐻𝐬's birth mother's pregnancy, since there is no way he would have left 𝐲𝐻𝐬 to grow up in the foster system for so long had he known. Not with his own bad experiences with his younger brother when he was just a teen himself. Shirakumo was gazing out the glass doors at the man in question as he gave a puff of flame as he seemed to shout at someone on the other end of the phone line. He squinted. Yeah, I can't see it. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 laughed at that. You haven't had 𝐲𝐻𝐬 glare at you with his quirk activated before. Trust me, they look scary alike when he does that. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 hummed. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 also has 𝐬𝐻𝐸's smile. The real final nail in the coffin for me was the fact that 𝐲𝐻𝐬 looks so much like the one photo of 𝐬𝐻𝐸's late younger brother that he keeps on his desk. If it wasn't for his hair being a bit curlier and his hair and eye color, he would be nearly identical. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 froze as a realization hit him. Oh, what color were your brother-in-law's hair and eyes? I only ask because I am not sure if you realize, but 𝐲𝐻𝐬 dyes his hair, and from what I understand, his eye color changed when his quirk came in. She paused and gave him a look of surprise. Oh, they were the same as 𝐬𝐻𝐸's originally. His quirk actually changed his eye color too. They used to be the light green that gave his family the Midoriya name. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 blinked. Yeah, that checks out. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 told me in passing before that his eyes were green like mine when he was still small, but they darkened to their near black shade of brown when he got older in response to his quirk use. And, well, I am the one who has been helping him dye his hair since we were both 11. He says he does it since it was safer to walk around at night with. White is too reflective. 𝐻𝐸 sighed and looked out the window at her husband. I worry about how 𝐬𝐻𝐸 will react when he finds everything out. There is a reason I have been stalling breaking the news to the two of them. He was already bordering on too overprotective before this even happened. I am fairly sure that knowing that 𝐲𝐻𝐬 is his own biological son might make him worse, especially given some of 𝐬𝐻𝐸's more concerning comments. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 growled to himself as he repocketed his phone after hanging up on his lawyer. If the principal of UA was not going to take his threat of suing seriously, He would just have to issue him with papers. At least yelling at the idiot had been a cathartic enough to help distract him from 𝐲𝐸's current condition. God, he hated hospitals. Sure, he knew that they were important, but he had never been to one under positive circumstances, and it did not seem that was likely to change any time soon. Emotions wrestled vaguely back under control. He re-entered the building. It was hardly fair to 𝐀𝐦 to leave her sitting waiting for news without him. She was chatting quietly with Yamada and his and 𝐲𝐸's apparent new friend 𝗔𝗓𝐬 as he fell into the seat beside her so that he could pull her in close in a hug to steady himself. She gave a small sigh from inside his arms and a reassuring pat. How did the call go? The principal of UA is an idiot and really does not think I can sue the school. He is of the mistaken belief that no lawyer would take our case knowing they were up against UA's legal defense team even when our case of endangerment is an open and shut case. The safety waiver that they send out only covers injuries that 𝗓𝐻 can heal, which obviously this is not. Yamada gained a thoughtful look. Do you think that is why he was trying so hard to get 𝗓𝐻 to heal 𝐲𝐸? So that he could argue that you waived the right to sue with the waiver? హిsashi blinked as his appreciation for his son's best friend went up a couple notches. That actually sounds rather likely. It wouldn't matter, of course. Any judge would see the fact that 𝐲𝐸 had to be hospitalized with 𝗓𝐻𝐻 on site and throw out the waiver. Like 𝗔𝗓𝐬 here said, there really is no justifiable reason for the robots to be aiming to kill the test takers. Before they could chat more on the topic, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Is the family of Midoriya here? హిsashi was on his feet to meet her instantly. That is us. She led them back through the door she had just come through. He is out of surgery if you want to follow me back to see him. Just a warning, it will be a while before he wakes up, and even when he does, he is not likely to be particularly coherent for the next 24 hours while the drugs for pain killing and to accelerate his healing are in his system. Hisashi nodded along with the information. How bad was it? The one who called us mentioned something about skin grafts. If you could just be patient, a doctor will be able to explain everything to you shortly. Hisashi's stomach dropped at the response. Something that he had quickly learned back when he had been Yoichi's sole guardian from their many hospital visits was if the nurse was unwilling to offer their thoughts on a condition, it was likely not a good sign for the patient. The sight of 𝐲𝐸's back confirmed his fears as they stepped into the room after donning face masks. The whole of his upper back was visibly deformed and mere skin grafts did little to hide it. He had been burned muscle deep and the thin layer of artificial skin did little to hide the visible discoloration of his spine. 𝐲𝐸 would be lucky to do much of anything independently again if his spinal cord had been damaged from the heat, let alone live out his dream of heroics as much as he personally hated it. He vaguely registered 𝐀𝐦 lancing her fingers with his as she tugged him from where he had frozen in the doorway. He couldn't help it. Seeing 𝐲𝐸 like that, lying motionless with such a massive wound, he blinked back tears as he was reminded of Yoichi's final moments. His idiot brother who had jumped between him and one of the men who had stolen him in the middle of their fight and had taken a blow to his back from the man who claimed to love him when he failed to pull his quirked punch like Hisashi had, who had fled when he realized what he had done while Hisashi rushed him to see a doctor. His brother who had died on the operating table from his pre-existing heart condition. Hisashi hadn't realized he had stopped breathing until 𝐀𝐦 slapped him to snap him out of it, an act that seemed to have shocked the doctor who had appeared while he was disassociating. Hisashi, you need to breathe. You won't be able to help 𝐲𝐸 if you need to be hospitalized too. Now what is wrong? I can't help if you can't tell me. Hisashi casted a panicked look at 𝐲𝐸 but bit his lip hard enough to draw blood to ground himself with pain in the moment. After a few moments of struggling to speak, he got bare minimum the words out. Yoichi died. 𝐲𝐸. Hisashi vaguely registered horrified and alarmed looks from 𝐲𝐸's two friends that had followed them back, but the look of understanding in 𝐀𝐦's eyes. While he had obviously never fully explained what had happened to his brother, in part to hide the truth of what he actually was to shield her and in part because it just hurt to talk about, she did know enough. That his brother had been sickly and been caught up in a hero and villain fight as collateral of another hero and died not long after in the hospital from his existing condition. Enough to put two and two together. She looked at the two boys. We can trust you two to look after him for us for a bit. I think Hisashi needs to get some air. Yamada was quick to nod. You can count on us. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. After the Midoriyas had disappeared around the corner and out of sight, Hisashi slumped. Well, I guess we can add silent panic attacks to the column of traits 𝐲𝐸 inherited from his old man. 𝗔𝗓𝐬 frowned, looking in the direction that they had disappeared to. I didn't even notice he had stopped breathing until you pointed it out. How did you even notice that? While I haven't seen him have one before, I have seen 𝐲𝐸 have a few over the years we have known each other, even if I didn't realize that was what I had been seeing until 𝐲𝐸 finally confessed to having one and I did a bit of research. While I don't know much about Mr. Midoriya, I did know his brother spent a lot of time in and out of hospitals from 𝐲𝐸, so I figured that there might be some medical-related trauma to look out for. Looks like I guessed one of his triggers right on the money. 𝗔𝗓𝐬 went rigid. Shit. When he said died. He probably meant that 𝐲𝐴 looks like his brother did when he died right now, yeah. The other boy cast a worried look over at 𝐲𝐴, but the doctor said he would be okay after a couple days in physical therapy to help rebuild his muscles. Shirakumo, did it look like he heard any of that? He winced and shook his head. Right, good point. 𝐬𝐴 sighed and patted him on the shoulder. Just something to keep in mind for the future so you know how 𝐲𝐴 is when he has one of his episodes to better help him out. Shirakumo gave another small frown but gave a jerky nod of determination. Yeah, okay, what do I need to know to try and help prevent Midoriya's panic attacks? Like triggers and stuff. 𝐬𝐴 ran down his mental list. Never throw your arm around him without warning or sneak up behind him. Hospitals and doctors are hit or miss even in conversation, which honestly probably is only going to get worse when he wakes up here. There is something about the word morning that wigs him out completely, so try to avoid that one. Oh, and never grab him unexpectedly either unless you want him to literally attack you. I've never had any issues with that last one, but I have seen 𝐲𝐴 literally try and deck his father for it in the past. It's because you loud. Can hear. Coming. 𝐬𝐴 nearly jumped out of his skin as 𝐲𝐴 blearily opened his eyes to look at them. 𝐲𝐴, you shouldn't be awake yet. Go back to sleep. To his surprise, 𝐲𝐴 just gave a yawn before closing his eyes again without protest. Okay. The two of them sat in silence for a few minutes as his breathing evened out again. After a bit, Shirakumo let out a small hiss of breath. Damn, what is he even made out of to fight off all those drugs that easily? 𝐬𝐴 just slumped and shook his head. I don't know, but the fact he can is probably not a good sign about what he might have gone through before we met. I am just glad he trusts me enough to have listened. The last thing he needed was for him to try and move right now while the drugs run their course to speed up his recovery and ruin any chance of his back healing back up. Shirakumo patted him on the shoulder. You're a good friend, Yamada. Midoriya is lucky to have you to help watch his back. 𝐬𝐴 offered the boy a smile. You're not so bad yourself. You didn't have to tag along with us through all this. Shirakumo offered a shrug. Midoriya probably saved my life. I couldn't just ditch him after that. 𝐬𝐴 patted him on the shoulder. And that is why I am pretty sure 𝐲𝐴 won't mind if you stick around with us. 𝐬𝐴 shook his head. But enough of that sad stuff. Why don't we get to know one another while we wait for the Midoriyas to get back? 𝐲𝐴 was not sure what made him madder about the situation, the fact that he had gotten so badly hurt that he was now permanently scarred over the vast majority of his back, or the fact that despite earning enough points to pass the entrance exam, his application had been passed over due to his injury, with the thought that it would be a permanent impediment of his ability to become a hero. Hilariously, 𝐲𝐴 discovered that the latter offended his father so much that the man had flipped from reluctantly supporting him as a hero to backing him at every turn. Okay, sure, it was a bad enough injury that he had to do some physical therapy after he had been healed up, but he was back to fighting fit before the first day of classes. At least one good thing had come from it in the form of his and 𝐬𝐴's newfound friendship with 𝗵𝗲. Trauma bonding at its finest, as his ghostly uncle had put it. That was another thing that had come up in the aftermath of his hospitalization. His mother had apparently had a paternity test run on him and all for one behind their backs and found that 𝐲𝐴 was legitimately his son. That had been a bit of a shock, but in hindsight, he and the Vestiges had to admit it was actually painfully obvious. After all, the whole reason he had started dyeing his hair black was because he looked too much like his father when he used his quirk. He was still going to keep dyeing it black. Given he was still fully intending to go underground, white hair would just be a health hazard with how reflective it would be at night, even if the discovery that he shared the same hair color with his now very excited and slightly possessive father meant the reveal that he intended to keep dyeing it black had depressed him slightly. Sure, his father could follow his reasoning well enough, but the realization that there was another thing that he and 𝐲𝐴 had in common had excited him slightly. There, however, was now the underlying mystery of where 𝐲𝐴 had even come from. Apparently, the reason that All For One had been so certain that he had no illegitimate children knocking about was because of the fact that, up until 𝐴, he had only ever slept with other men. Apparently men that were his type were generally more common than women, which 𝐲𝐴 viewed that as pretty cursed information. If the muttering that he overheard his father doing when he wasn't paying too much attention was anything to go off of, apparently, his father's money was on him being a clone of some sort. Given the muttering about homunculi and not trusting the doctor with his genetic information, 𝐲𝐴 suspected a repeat would be unlikely, unless there had already been one. 𝐲𝐴 couldn't shake the sneaking suspicion about 9 from the Nabu Island incident possibly being his brother, half-brother as well. Given that his father was now on the case, perhaps that issue would resolve itself before his old and yet future Class 1 had to deal with it. Ei. As 𝐲𝐴 strolled out onto the UA Sports Festival field, he had one goal in mind: winning. After all, the school board that had prevented him from joining WhatIf from the start could hardly say his injury was career-threatening when he kicked the asses of all the existing hero students. He just hoped that 𝐬𝐴 and 𝗵𝗲 would forgive him for probably making them look like fools on live television. The first round was a game of capture the flag of sorts. 42 flags had been hidden around the field that had been transformed to a small industrial battleground. Those that found a flag and returned with it to the start moved on to the next round. 𝐬𝐻𝐸, knowing 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was quick to find one of the flags hidden practically in plain sight right at the start in the referee's hand. After the majority of the group had run off, he had strolled up to her and just asked for it, earning an amused smirk from her before she handed it over. 𝐲𝐸 then intentionally waited for the young future ingenium, an older brother of his friend 𝐸𝐡𝐚𝐧𝐻, to return, flag in hand, before hopping down from the platform to take an easy second place. 𝐸𝐸 gave him a puzzled look as he walked over, tying the flag around his neck like an oversized bandana. "Why did you wait? You could have easily taken first." 𝐲𝐸 shrugged. "I am planning on going underground, so sweeping the whole festival would not be good for me in the long run. I probably would have waited for a few more people to finish if it wasn't for the fact my parents are watching and I want to give them a decent show." "Oh, you are trying to transfer into heroics then? Was your quirk a bad match for the practical exam?" "Yeah, but I technically didn't fail. I was rejected due to an injury that I only got because the test proctors fucked up. I was more than fully recovered on the first day of classes, but the school board were insistent my injury was career-ending. A part of me is suspicious that they are just covering their asses because my father isn't afraid to take the school to task for messing up. He is the one that got the old principal fired before the year started." 𝐸𝐸 gave an impressed whistle. "Damn, your father must have pretty good lawyers because the ones here at UA are no joke from what my parents told me. I'm 𝐸𝐸, by the way. Midoriya, and yeah, my dad is not exactly short on money to afford good lawyers. He got a sizable payout after my uncle and his husband were killed in the line of duty as pros over in the States, and he apparently invested it well." 𝐸𝐸 winced. "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss." 𝐲𝐸 waved him off. "My uncles died long before I was born." He pointedly ignored the fact that one of them was happily ruffling his hair at the moment. "I am just saying that my family knows what qualifies as a career-ending injury and I am perfectly fine." 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. To 𝐲𝐸's immense pleasure, the second round was a cavalry battle much like his own first sports festival. It was not hard to build his team of 4 this time, with Hisashi and Oboro appearing from the crowd and gluing themselves to him. Adding it, who had been left alone because of the first place scorer penalty of 100,000 points, made an easy 4 and an easy landslide win with their combo of quirks. After all, once the battle started, they no longer had to have all 3 horses on the ground, with Oboro keeping them airborne and 𝐸𝐸 making quick aerial adjustments. None of the other teams even came close. They didn't even have to use his or Hisashi's quirks for defense. It was an easy pass to the final round for all of them. Like every year, the final portion was a tournament, but unfortunately, with the way the bracket had worked out, provided the other 3 won all their matches, he would be facing all of them after his first fight against a guy he vaguely recognized as the future Mr. Blaster from the Buster Union. Now, the guy's quirk was hardly an issue after years of dealing with 𝐀𝐦's quirk, but the flashbang aspect could be a hard counter for his erasure if the guy was able to get a blast off and blinded him. Thankfully, though, 𝐲𝐸 knew the guy was not immune to his own flashes, and unlike 𝐲𝐸, the guy likely had no idea how to function completely blind in a fight. So, 𝐲𝐸 devised a cunning plan to throw the guy off. He channeled his inner Aizawa sensei and strolled up onto the area platform, slouching slightly with one hand in his pocket and the other covering his mouth in a fake yawn. "I don't suppose I could convince you to just walk out of the arena. I am missing my nap for this." Sensoji bristled at the request. "Why the hell would I surrender to a management course student? You are looking at a future pro here." 𝐲𝐸 shrugged. It was worth a shot. I guess I will just take my nap here." He closed his eyes, trusting that danger sense would guide him, and pretended to nod off while standing as the announcer made introductions. Finally, they counted them down. On go. 𝐲𝐸 stood motionless as Sensoji clearly fired off his quirk, danger sense having him stay put. After about a minute, the blast tapered off, allowing 𝐲𝐸 to open his eyes, erasure blazing, and cocked his head slightly as the other guy blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. "You good?" "Fuck you." Sensoji rapidly rubbed at his face and blinked, but 𝐲𝐸 had moved to quickly cross the gap between them and slammed him face first into the ground as he twisted both of the guy's arms behind him in a standard police-style takedown. 𝐲𝐸 was not even sure the guy realized that he was canceling his quirk as he blindly struggled to try and get free. There was a count of 10 and 𝐲𝐸 released the guy. "Honestly, you should have just walked out." He then stepped away, with another fake yawn before strolling back into the tunnels. Sadly, he would not be able to pull that trick on any of his former teammates, but that was fine. Better to play the exhausted management student with heroic aspirations and not need it than drop the act and need it later. Besides, the idea of a nap actually didn't sound half bad. 𝐲𝐸 turned to his uncle Yoichi. "Do you think you could wake me up when it is about time for my next match?" He nodded and patted him on the head. "Sure thing, 𝐲𝐸. You rest up so you can kick everyone ass later." This was the sort of thing that made him his favorite vestige. He always was happy to humor him. Of course, admittedly there had been a bit of division between him and the rest of them in the recent wake of his adoption and the subsequent reveal of his parentage, so his uncle Yoichi was also sort of winning by default currently while the rest readjusted to the new status quo. It wasn't that any of them blamed him for his apparent blood connection to his father both in this life or the one prior. But they still largely were upset about him so willingly allowing the villain into his life. The man was responsible in part for all of their deaths after all. Still, 𝐲𝐸 couldn't help but think that the best way to deal with the all-for-one issue was just to keep him happy and distracted on the civilian side of things. If it worked out, then that would be the horrible future that he had lived before, resolved with little effort on his part, and if it didn't, then at least he could keep a better eye on him. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 shook her head as 𝐬𝐴𝐵 cackled beside her on the couch watching the festival. She had been worried that he would not end up enjoying watching, since 𝐲𝐸 had gone out of his way to slip just under the radar the whole time up until this point by hiding in the shadows of others. But if all his one-on-one fights were like the first, that was not going to be a concern. She had briefly worried when 𝐲𝐸 had appeared looking so tired that he seemed to be falling asleep on his feet, given that she knew her stepson hadn't really slept well the night before, but it was clear as he slammed the other boy to the stadium floor that it had been just an act. She did have to worry that people might not think he was treating this seriously though. As the match for the next round of one-on-ones was announced, 𝐬𝐴𝐵 winced beside her. Oh dear, the next fight is going to be a tricky one for him. Ada probably won't fall for that trick after working with him in the cavalry battle, and 𝐲𝐸's fighting style doesn't seem to be built with speedsters in mind. 𝐴𝐴 patted him on the shoulder. Have a little faith in him. 𝐲𝐸 is clever and would know that, so I am sure that he has a plan to work around that fact. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 did, in fact, have a plan. It was admittedly not a very good one, but he was working with what he had. As he strolled back up onto the raised platform, he got a puzzled look from Ada. Why are you wearing long sleeves all of the sudden? 𝐲𝐸 offered him a bored-looking shrug. That is for me to know and you to find out. As they were counted down, 𝐲𝐸 casually unzipped the long-sleeve uniform top to a puzzled look from Ada. Well, I hope there are no hard feelings, Midoriya, but I am fairly confident in my own chances. Same. On the signal to go, Ada shot forward with a quirk-assisted punch that had 𝐲𝐸 wincing at the clumsiness, the other boy clearly relaying on his speed over good technique. So it was no surprise to 𝐲𝐸 how he was startled as 𝐲𝐸 easily twisted to avoid the blow and pulled his top off in one fluid motion. As Ada overshot and was still trying to recover his balance, 𝐲𝐸 twisted the shirt around the other boy's face to blind him. 𝐲𝐸 registered the cries of surprise from the crowd as they likely caught sight of his back, but he didn't allow himself to lose focus as Ada recovered and tried to pull him and the shirt off. They struggled around the ring as he allowed Ada to disorientate himself while trying to dislodge him. After a little over a minute, 𝐲𝐸 had gotten him turned around enough that Ada stepped right over the boundary line. Ada froze as his loss was declared before yanking the impromptu blindfold off as 𝐲𝐸 released his own hold. Ada blinked in the sudden sunlight before turning back to 𝐲𝐸 with a slightly amused look. Okay, I will admit that was pretty clever, but what is it with you and blinding your opponents? 𝐲𝐸 snorted and held out his hand for the return of the top as they exited the ring together. Loss of sight is a major hindrance for most people, so it is easy to exploit. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get away with that with both 𝐓𝐸 and 𝐬𝐴𝐵, but I am pretty sure I am the better quirkless fighter between us, so it shouldn't really be an issue for me in theory. So why didn't you cancel my quirk? Didn't need to. I knew that I could dodge the first hit just fine, and once I got you blinded there was no reason to bother. Your technique needs improvement though. Your speed will only get you so far in fights until you meet someone as fast or faster than you. 𝐲𝐸 really couldn't help but think of what had happened to the hero with Stain and wonder if he had ever learned that lesson in the first place in that timeline. Also, stop tucking your thumbs. You are going to break them eventually if you keep that up. Ada snorted as the sounds of the crowds above them faded the deeper into the tunnels of the arena they got. Wow, you really don't pull your punches off the field too, huh? Way to make a guy feel inferior. I would rather hurt your feelings and save your life down the road than not say anything. So how do you know how to fight so well? I don't think I have seen someone who could fight so well our age that wasn't a legacy. 𝐲𝐸 shrugged. Years of hero analysis as a hobby and a lot of practice trying to copy their moves. He found a smile creeping over him as he thought back to the first time he and 𝐬𝐴𝐵 had tried sparring. 𝐬𝐴𝐵 is convinced I am secretly a demon in human form. Meeting my father didn't exactly do anything to help convince him otherwise. You and Yamada go back a ways, right? I noticed that the two of you have been practically glued to one another outside of classes since the year started, and he has brought you up in class before, since the last year of elementary. He's a good friend. He was probably the first person I met who didn't imminently think my quirk was villainous. Ada frowned. Why would people think that? All your quirk does is temporarily make it so people can't use their quirk. Yeah, but some people react badly to their quirk being stolen from them. The stories of a Bujimon that runs around stealing quirks probably doesn't help. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Elsewhere a certain supervillain sneezed. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. To Xiaoda's slight disappointment, 𝗵𝗃 lost his fight against the future tiger. To be fair to him, the other boy had a quirk much better suited for combat than 𝗵𝗃 did. Still, that meant that his semifinals match was against 𝗏𝗏. Xiaoda was not expecting the worried look the boy was giving him as he returned to the center stage wearing his now trademark bored look. Something the matter? Are you okay? You're back. It looks worse than it is at this point. The scar tissue is still just new, so hasn't had a chance to fade at all. 𝗏𝗏 relaxed at that. I was worried that you were fighting with a previously hidden injury this whole time. I thought it was strange that the teachers hadn't said anything about it and were letting you continue on like that. Xiaoda snorted. UA is still covering their asses since it happened during the entrance exam. If word got out that the previous administration let the exam get to that level of danger for the testers, it would come back to bite Nezu, who was the one whose reaction to the event probably saved my back from more permanent damage. Still, as fun as this chat is, that is not what we are here for. 𝗏𝗏 flashed him a smile as he slid into a proper combat stance, unlike the other two boys before him. No, I suppose not. I hope you won't be too upset when I beat you though. 𝗏𝗏 shifted slightly into a relaxed stance himself, slightly happy for the chance for a real fight. Who said anything about you winning? Ongo. 𝗏𝗏 made the first move for a change, quickly activating his quirk as he lashed out to perform a full body throw of the slightly taller boy. 𝗏𝗏 internally laughed at the confusion on his face when the boy had gone to dodge using his quirk and completely failed. 𝗏𝗏 slammed him hard to the ground and tried to grapple him into a pin, but the other boy was quick to recover and kick him off. Once the other was back on his feet, he lunged forward to pull 𝗏𝗏 into a grapple himself, aided in his superior size and training specialization. Nice trick. Your quirk. Obviously. 𝗏𝗏 went limp in his arms, causing the grip on him to loosen before jerking his head back to smack the other in the face, rewarding him with a sickening crunch as he likely broke the other boy's nose. He was immediately dropped as the other clutched his face, allowing 𝗏𝗏 to quickly roll away and back up onto his feet. However, 𝗏𝗏 accidentally blinked during the maneuver, so had dropped his quirk as 𝗏𝗏 was quick to realize and try to take advantage of. Elastic-like arms flashed out to try and wrap around him that 𝗏𝗏 had to jump to avoid. Okay, new plan. 𝗏𝗏 began to dance back, allowing 𝗏𝗏 to corner him back near one of the fire brazier. Not bad, Midoriya. There would be no shame in tapping out now though, since your plan didn't work. No hard feelings for breaking my nose or anything. It's interesting that you think that was my only plan. As 𝗏𝗏 lashed out with one more attempted grapple, 𝗏𝗏 was quick to grab the arm and follow the motion trough so that the boy's arm shot past him. 𝗏𝗏 let out a shocked scream of pain as his hand hit the fire-hot metal. Focus off 𝗏𝗏 and now on his injured hand. 𝗏𝗏 quickly swept his legs out from under him, tipping him over the ring line. Victory. The moment his win was called, he was quick to jump into checking over the other boy's burn. Oh, good, only first degree. You'll be fine if you run your hand under some water to cool it off and see, recovery girl. 𝗏𝗏 gave a shocked laugh. Damn, you really aren't afraid of fighting dirty, are you? 𝗏𝗏 hummed and pulled the boy to his feet and began leading him in the direction of recovery girl. Underground heroes can't afford to fight fair. You're planning to go underground. Damn, my respect for you just shot up a couple more notches. Working purely to help others with no need for recognition for your hard work takes drive. Really, Hisashi just thinks I am a self-sacrificial bastard. That got a startled laugh from the other boy. Damn, I hope when you get transferred into the heroics course you end up in our class. You seem fun to hang out with. They had turned the last corner now. 𝗏𝗏 paused just long enough to raise his undamaged hand in a fist. Now do me a favor and kick your Yamada's ass. 𝗏𝗏 raised his own fist and bumped it. Easily. And so he did. Sorahiko's first impression on his newest student was that there was something off about him. He had pegged that feeling the first time he had seen the kid, even before the sports festival when he had just taken over the homeroom teacher position for the newly appointed principal Nezu. The kid didn't act like a normal kid. Every room he saw the kid enter, the kid quickly checked his escape routes and every person in the room as if he was afraid of a sudden ambush. Then there was the fact that the kid had known who he was immediately from what he had overheard from two of the boy's friends in his class. That he didn't just peg him immediately for his hero identity, but had apparently known about his prior status of Toshinori's homeroom teacher in third year after Nana had died and he had been forced to take her old position. That had set off even more alarm bells. It wasn't until the official parent-teacher meeting to discuss the transfer into his class that he finally realized what was wrong. When the boy had shot him a worried look when he had stepped through the door, only to be followed by the devil himself. Get out. All for one had the nerve to look hurt at the reaction before turning to look at his son with a puzzled look. While I suddenly understand why you were so insistent that 𝐀𝐦 sit this meeting out, I do have to wonder how you knew this would be an issue. Midoriya shrugged. You really don't want me to answer that now, do you? All for one paused as he seemed to actually consider that. I suppose that is true for now. I will expect an actual answer when we get home though. 𝐁𝐦, who had been watching all of this with open curiosity, gave the three of them questioning looks. I feel like I am missing some context. All for one, the smug bastard rolled his eyes and chuckled before offering a bow to 𝐁𝐦. My apologies. I expect my ex-husband is just less than happy to see me again since our marriage ended on such a sour note. 𝐬𝐻𝐭 was on his feet, jabbing all for one with a finger, anger overriding common sense. A sour note. A sour note. That is what you call lying to my face at every turn and destroying everything I hold dear to me. Locking me in that damn vault for the 4 years it took for me to escape. It was to keep you safe. Keep me safe. I am a goddamn pro hero. I can take care of myself, thank you. I didn't need any of your so-called protection, especially from my best friend and her family. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. As the pair continued to bicker with one another, 𝐁𝐦 was slightly amused that young Midoriya just slid over to his side of the desk before falling to sit on the floor with the heavy wooden desk between him and the two men. Sensing that this was going to probably take a while, he hopped down to join his student. So is this going better or worse than you were expecting? Midoriya made a so-so gesture. I was expecting more physical fighting, but that could still happen, I guess. Really not sure how I feel about the revelation that they used to date though. 𝐁𝐦 felt his ears perk up in curiosity. You weren't aware of that fact. Why were you so certain that they would react badly to one another then? Midoriya gave a small pained laugh. God no. I knew they had a history of some sort, but nothing like that. Before he could question the boy further, Midoriya's father's voice cut through the room. 𝐬𝐻𝐭, he is your fucking son too. You could hear a pin drop in the silence that fell over the room before Midoriya was leaping to his feet with a shout echoed in Torino's voice. He's what? All the frustration that had been in Midoriya Hisashi's form fell apart as he slumped in on himself. 𝐲𝐴 was a clone of myself altered with your DNA, 𝐬𝐻𝐭. The doctor behind it bolted when he realized I had found out about that line of experiments, but he left most of his notes on them behind. My only guess as to why he might have used your DNA was convenience. Karaki still had a blood sample from you, I could only presume from while he was acting as your physician as well. From his notes, 𝐲𝐴's predecessors that he created had a low survival rate when he used just my DNA or a blend with his own. Apparently, he wrote off 𝐲𝐴 as the latest failure when his surrogate mother died and dropped the project after that to focus on the two he had managed to keep alive the longest. One of them, number 9, has since ran away from him and was written off as another failure, but I presume the other, number 6, is still alive and with him wherever he disappeared to. Poor Midoriya looked nearly as green as his name would suggest, but it was Torino's reaction that held his attention. As Midoriya Sr. went on with his explanation, his employee just seemed to crumple as the fight just went out of him. I can't believe I am saying this, but are you all right? I can't imagine you are taking the discovery that you had kids that you didn't find out about until after they were already dead all that well. Midoriya Sr. just sighed. I am focusing on the fact that 𝐲𝐴 is alive and well with me and that I might still be able to find his 2 older brothers. Honestly, the worst part is that I have no idea what the man even did with their remains, so there is basically nothing left of them but the man's notes to even prove that they existed. Torino hissed. Shit. As the pair lapsed into silence, 𝐁𝐦 found himself in the awkward position of having to clear his throat to remind the pair he was there. As fascinating as all this is to circle back to later, I believe that we are all gathered here for another reason. Namely Midoriya 𝐲𝐴's course transfer. Thankfully, that seemed to jolt the pair back onto the correct track. The meeting ran pretty smoothly from that point forward, ending with Torino jabbing the taller man with a finger and the order to loop him in on things that he was quick to agree to. 𝐁𝐦 waited until Midoriya had escorted his father out the door before turning his attention to Torino. Your ex-husband seems to be an interesting character. Might I ask why you asked to be looped into his investigation instead of taking over it to legitimize the investigation he is apparently doing? Especially when you appeared so hostile to him when you first saw it was him. Torino gave a huff of frustration before gesturing vaguely in the direction his apparent son and ex-husband had vanished. That was fucking all for one. 𝐁𝐦 froze. Whatever he had been expecting, that was not it. Pardon? Torino sighed and collapsed back into his chair. Obviously, I didn't know that back when we were in a relationship. I only found out because Nana ended up as the successor to One for All and looped me into that investigation. Let me tell you, finding out your husband of nearly 6 years was the man planning on murdering your best friend's whole family was not a pleasant surprise. I made the mistake of confronting him alone, hoping that Nana had just made a mistake, only for him to react to me finding out by throwing me in the vault he had used to hold his brother, the original holder, in for a few years. I got out eventually, obviously, and issued him a divorce. It took until I took in Toshinori after Nana's death for it to really stick though. I see. And I assume you have a reason as to why we are not calling All Might about this right now. The man gave 𝐁𝐦 a rather dead inside look. Because I am not stupid. The moment Toshinori knows where to find him, he will go in guns blazing to get himself killed, and the kid doesn't deserve to have to deal with that either. Plus, given what he said, All for One's forces are probably falling apart from the infighting he is having with his former right hand. We probably have a few years before he really becomes a concern again if he is focused on the doctor and his missing kid. That just gives Toshinori more time to prepare himself for their eventual fight. Nedzu hummed. I suppose waiting would also be beneficial in ensuring that Midoriya 𝐬𝐴 is genuine in his stated goal of heroics and that this is not just a plan of his to get a hero on his side. Alright, we will continue to monitor the situation for now and wait for any potential change that might make the benefits of revealing his location to All Might outweigh the cons at a later date. Hisashi studied his son walking silently beside him, feeling slightly guilty. That had not been how he planned on telling 𝐬𝐴 about what he had discovered. They had long left campus before 𝐬𝐴 spoke. You have been keeping all the files you found about this at whatever evil lair you have, right? Hisashi nearly stumbled in his shock. Evil lair? 𝐬𝐴 huffed. Dad, you have been as subtle as a brick to the face about what you actually do for a living. Honestly, I am shocked Mom hasn't called you out on it. You leave paperwork from your less than legal businesses out in the open all the time. Hisashi winced slightly at that. Okay, I suppose that is fair. That still has yet to explain how you knew that Tsuruhiko would recognize me given your surprise when I referred to him as my ex. I looked the name Shimura up after seeing that you were paying someone to watch the family. It isn't exactly hard to link Gran Torino back to them given that Starlight's personal information became a matter of public record when she died like most heroes. He was her hero partner on and off for years. It stood to reason that if you had any link to her death, that he would recognize you for that. Hisashi winced but had to concede defeat there. So, I suppose you want an explanation? And a reason not to tell Mom before handing you over to the heroes. Hisashi gave his son a puzzled look at that. Why didn't you go straight to the heroes anyways when you found out? 𝐬𝐴 sighed and averted his eyes. The HPSC has rules about who can and cannot work as a hero. If you were arrested as a villain before I was licensed as an underground pro and had a good reputation with the other heroes, I would never be licensed since I would never last as a limelight hero with my quirk. Hisashi gave a small hiss of breath. But you have nothing to do with my operation. Nothing excepted one of your guy fucking created me in a lab behind your back. Regardless, the policy is that all heroes with direct familial ties to villains have to be in the full public eye where the HPSC can track them constantly because of the risk that we could be if allowed to operate without a lot of oversight. I'm sorry, 𝐬𝐴 huffed. Thanks for as little as that apology means. You're hardly going to give up your life of crime, are you? I can't really at this point. They lapsed into an awkward silence as Hisashi tried to think of how he was supposed to explain this. I'm a lot older than you probably thought I was. No duh. Gran Torino is in his 72nd and Starlight died only a couple years after Mom was born. Of course you are older than you look. Right. Well, the truth is, I actually date back to the Quirk Wars and the founding of the heroics system. Your uncle Yoichi was one of the original 7 along with his husband and one of their friends. When the hero system was made, I went overnight from being one of the most prolific vigilantes to public enemy number 1. I am pretty sure the only reason Yoichi even got his hero's license was because the people on the new governmental board thought that as my brother, he would be able to bring me in so that they could have tossed me in one of the damn metahuman concentration camps or just straight up killed me. My quirk, my real quirk that is, was considered way too dangerous to just leave me helping people unchecked. With it I was able to take quirks from those born with them who and didn't want them and give them away to those who asked for them. At the time, you could get attacked on the street if it was discovered you had a meta ability. For decades I was forced to hide my true hair and eye color due to their unnatural color, and I only was able to stop after I had accumulated enough quirks to use to defend myself and those I cared about. He carded his fingers through his own short curls. Things escalated from there following my brother's death that everyone seemed keen to blame me for, despite the fact that it was his own husband's quirked punch that inflicted the blow that killed him. My brother's quirk was like mine in that it is transferable in nature, so it has been changing hands through various heroes over the decades since, as they all continue the blood feud that Katsumi started when he blamed Yoichi's death on me. Since he was the hero, Hisashi spit out the word like venom. They believed his claim of what had happened over my own. Shimura was the latest in the line of the heroes before All Might who holds it currently. I was watching over her family like I have done the families of all the other holders to make up for the family's losses. Hisashi considered the most recent news he had been given of the family. I am actually worried about the boy there. Shimura's son is not reacting well to his own son possibly being quirkless since his quirk is already overdue to manifest. I'll probably have to find the time to visit the kid in person to see if it is true or not and if it is to slip him a quirk. While my man watching the family hasn't seen any proof of things coming to blows yet. The escalation in the yelling from the house is rather concerning. That seemed to really agitate 𝐬𝐴 from how his own son was clenching and unclenching his hand over his right elbow. What quirk were you planning on giving him? Hisashi thought back through his own catalog of quirks. Most likely airwalk given its similarities to his grandmother's float. I have plenty of flight-related quirks that, While that one is the easiest to use, I can more than make up for its absence. While I have both telekinetic and energy shield quirks like his parents and elder sister, they are in shorter supply. Why do you ask? A bit of the tension in 𝐬𝐻's shoulder bled away. Strange. No reason. Just curious. Hisashi pulled his son into a side hug as they neared their apartment. Any more questions, or am I set to face 𝐀𝐻's wrath? 𝐬𝐻 leaned into the touch and basically melted into his side. No, I'm good for now. If I think of anything I will let you know. Would it be okay if I walk over to the park for a bit? I could use a bit of time to process everything. Hisashi sighed and released his hold. All right, just be home by dark. I am sure your mother wants to celebrate your course transfer tonight. 𝐬𝐻 offered him a weak smile. Yeah, I'll be back. He turned and walked back in the direction of the park they had passed on the way home. He waved over his shoulder. See you later. 𝐬𝐻 waited until he was tucked away out of sight in the trees to confront his uncles. Was that true? About how Yoichi died? Yoichi was giving his husband a slightly green look before turning back to 𝐬𝐻. About my death, I have no idea. My last hour or so was a complete blur. I remember that Hisashi and Katsumi were fighting and that at some point I ended up in the hospital, but all the details are fuzzy. Katsumi pointedly avoided meeting Yoichi's eyes. What does it matter? He still started that fight and you still died. It is still his fault. Yoichi seemed to bristle at that answer. Katsumi, it matters because if it is true you have spent over a century lying to my face about my own death. I couldn't care less about which of you idiots actually landed the killing blow. I knew the risks when I jumped between the two of you when the fighting escalated to the point that you were going to kill one another. All this time I thought Hisashi was toying with all of us from how he was acting around all the other holders. But it was really true. If it wasn't for your lies about what the hell is going on, who fucking knows how things would have played out with the other holders? Nana and N most certainly would still be alive right now. Hell, maybe even Deguara would. Deguara snorted. Gonna have to disagree on that last point, Yoichi. One for all kills the holder if they already have a quirk, remember? There was no way I would have figured that out before it was too late when 𝐀𝐻 didn't, and well, he is the next biggest brain in this operation after 𝐬𝐻. No offense to everyone else obviously. He clapped his hands together. Still, you've got a point about N and Nana at least. 𝐬𝐻 was quick to flare his quirk as Yoichi began sparking with the power of one for all while glaring daggers at his husband. This was going to suck in the long term, wasn't it? Knock it off. While I agree that Katsumi was a bit of an idiot for doing that, it doesn't really change anything for us now, does it? It is not like we could tell All Might everything and he would believe us. All that really has changed is I feel less like an idiot for trusting my gut feeling about my father. A pause. And I suppose I also have the really cursed knowledge that he and Gran Torino were together long enough that they were actually married at some point. Speaking of, Nana, what the actual fuck? She just shrugged. I never thought Sorahiko's horrible taste in men would ever come up. She paused and gained a pained look on her face. But now you are his and all-for-one son and I really have no idea how I feel about that fact. 𝐬𝐻 rubbed his face. God, stop reminding me of that. Let's talk about the possible good news that Dad is probably not planning on turning your grandson into Tamura, so it is entirely possible that he was originally unplanned for and just a case of Dad taking advantage of a gift being handed to him. That means that we might be able to save Tenko from ever becoming Tamura in the first place. 𝐬𝐻 was not terribly surprised that Monday when Gran Torino pulled him aside after his first day in 1A. Kid, you know who your father is, don't you? 𝐬𝐻 nodded. Honestly, I have no idea how Mom doesn't know. He isn't exactly hiding his work when he brings stuff home. I would appreciate it if you didn't try and tell her yet though. The last thing she or the baby needs is the stress that will come from that sort of reveal right now. Gran looked bewildered at that. Baby, 𝐬𝐻 nodded. Yeah, she is due midway through July, and it is definitely his. 𝐬𝐻 snorted. Well, as far as I know, Mom wasn't cheating on Dad a few weeks before we met. But if you want confirmation, we could always do a paternity test once the baby is born. Gran waved that off. Sorry, that was a stupid question. I am just shocked that the bastard actually slept with a woman. I know he always claimed to be bi, but he never seemed all that interested in women in the first place based on his reactions whenever Nana was around, even before they became proper enemies. She have an interesting quirk. 𝐬𝐻 shrugged. A weak telekinesis quirk. Though if it were to combine with all for one, there could be issues. I imagine a small child running around, able to take quirks at range would not be great. Gran looked green at the idea. Yeah, that would definitely not be good. 𝐬𝐻 gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. I don't think it is likely though. Between myself and the recorded quirks of my half-siblings, all for one doesn't seem to like to be passed down so much as the quirks it holds inside it does. My erasure was the only case of a quirk that interacts directly with another quirk out of all 10 cases, so the odds must be terrible. The man froze slightly. How does your quirk work exactly? 𝐬𝐻 frowned, quickly realizing the hero's concern. I disrupt the mental connection to one's quirk factor, tricking your body into thinking it is gone and preventing use. It is why my quirk only works with emitter and transformation quirk types, which is why you didn't use it in your fight against 𝐴𝐻𝐷. 𝐲𝐻𝐷 shook his head. No, I could have still used it on him. The main function of his quirk acts as an emitter despite his quirk classifying as mutation. It is actually pretty rare for a quirk to actually be fully a mutation type. There are often aspects of a quirk that are more in line with an emitter or transformation. Honestly, right now the only full mutation type quirks I know about here in Japan are Principal Nenzu's and Inui Senpai's. Gran's brows shot up at that. So you wouldn't classify my quirk as a mutation? 𝐲𝐻𝐷 shook his head. No, you pretty clearly have an emitter with mutation aspects to help with manifestation. If it was pure mutation, you would never get the lift you need to move with your quirk the way you do. Even if your lungs were the same size as the whole of the rest of your body, you would still never get enough air flowing through you without the emitter aspect. He had run the numbers out of boredom a while ago. Quirks generally don't disobey the laws of physics unless there is an emitter aspect to it. After that, it is basically witchcraft for the amount emitters ignore the laws of physics when they inconvenience the holders. Gran nodded along with the explanation before freezing and pinching the bridge of his nose. God, I hate the fact you sound so much like your father right now. 𝐲𝐻𝐷 chuckled lightly. Well, I mean, he is my father. Yeah, I know and I get that. It is just I am struggling to see how you are secretly my kid too. 𝐲𝐻𝐷 did consider that. Admittedly, since he was still basically his old self crammed into his older half-brother's body, it was not all that surprising that he had little in common with the man. But still, thinking back to Aizawa-sensei and some of the things he had picked up from him over the years, growing into Midoriya 𝐲𝐻𝐷, I think I have similar tastes in food generally based on what Dad says, and a love of pranks. He scratched his head. I mean, it is not too surprising I have more in common with him given my life before he and Mom found me was less than great. We have the same shitty coping methods from similar shitty early childhoods. Gran looked like he had taken a punch to the gut at that last admission. Kid, you are making it really hard to resist just bundling you up and taking you home to try and protect you from all this shit, especially after seeing that scar on your back. Hey, give it to you. 𝐲𝐻𝐷 jerked to full attention. They didn't tell you. That was from a one-pointer robot during the entrance exam. There is a reason Nenzu suddenly took over as principal. The last guy's negligence nearly killed me and 𝗵𝐻𝐷. According to both Hisashi and 𝗵𝐻𝐷, Dad scared the people in the emergency room waiting area half to death when he showed up because of how pissed off he was about it. Say what you will about what Dad does for a living, but don't you ever think he is less than the most overprotective and attentive parent I could have asked for. Gran winced and averted his eyes. I suppose you have a point. The bastard was practically smothering me with his affection when I began to break things off. Plus there is his whole vaulting habit. 𝐲𝐻𝐷 saw Yoichi wince in sympathy. He hasn't tried it on me yet, but I am fairly confident in my ability to escape pretty fast if he does try it. I am nothing if not as bull-headed as both of you. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. While that comment would probably one day come back to bite him in the ass, months later any thoughts of such a thing had long flown out the window. The reason? He was holding his newborn baby self. Okay, sure, this Izuku would never become himself. He had changed too many things that would affect his early life for that purely by being there, but he couldn't help but look down at the tiny bundle in his arms in a mixture of wonder and confusion. He's tiny. His dad snorted and held out his arms to take back the infant. Yes, newborns generally are. How are you feeling as a brand new big brother? 𝐲𝐻𝐷 very reluctantly handed little Izuku over, worried for him mostly. He looked so completely fragile. His father shifted Izuku to carefully cradle him in one arm before reaching over with the other to ruffle 𝐲𝐻𝐷's hair. Looks like the protective older sibling instincts are kicking in. I'm sure you will do a great job in helping look out for him. 𝐲𝐻𝐷 blushed and buried his face in his new capture weapon that he wore as much as he could get away with. I mean, I have always liked little kids. It is only natural. His gaze caught on the two little gems that were his new little brother's eyes. Yeah, he would do it was only because he reflexively activated one for all for the first time in well over a decade that he was alive. That he might have saved 𝗵𝐻𝐷. Of course, had he not activated it, he also would not be in this mess, trapped below a slab of concrete in complete darkness. He also would not have broken his limbs, misjudging the power he could safely handle while moving on instinct. But that wasn't important, as he felt 𝗵𝐻𝐷 struggling to breathe himself underneath him. With a wet cough that tasted like blood, 𝐲𝐻𝐷 shifted his head as much as he could to try and hear his friend's heartbeat. I thought I told you to work on your dodging so I wouldn't have to try and save you again. A pause before he felt 𝗵𝐻𝐷 give a pained laugh. I couldn't not do it. I had to save the kids. A sob. I wasn't planning on getting you killed too. Don't say that. We are still alive, aren't we? Just stuck. Ʒashi is still free up there. He'll get us out of here in no time once the area is secure. There was a long silence as they strained to try and hear the fight going on now above them. Hey 𝐲𝐷𝐷, what was with the green lightning? 𝐲𝐷𝐷 considered the best way to answer that. I might have more than one quirk at my disposal. My quirk is technically haunted by the ghosts of my late hero uncles and a couple others, so I have access to all of their quirks. That was my Uncle Yoichi's quirk. I only ever used my own erasure because if word got around that I had more than one, it would draw the wrong sort of attention to me. But you could do so much good if you used all of the tools at your disposal. Yeah, and risk All Might punching first, asking questions later. No thanks, All Might. There is a villain that goes by the name All for One whose quirk allows for the transfer of quirks of others. The doctor who made me in his lab was copying the effects of his quirk to try and make the most powerful super soldiers he could with multiple quirks. Because of the history between All for One and All Might, he would automatically assume I worked for the former because of my multiple quirks instead of me being the latter. He has never been all that merciful to those that work with All for One from what I can tell and what Gran Torino and Nezu have told me. Well shit. They lapsed into another drawn-out silence. Do you think one of your other quirks could get us out of here? No, I broke pretty much all my limbs trying to tackle you out of the way and the building got the rest. What about you? No, my clouds can't lift this much weight. They lapsed into silence once more. 𝐲𝐸 found himself absently wondering how his dad would react to finding out he got a building dropped on him. The air was getting harder to breathe. They were running out of air. 𝐲𝐸 vaguely recognized the sound of the vestiges around him freaking out. He was just so tired of it all. Closing his eyes for a few minutes wouldn't hurt, would it? 𝐸𝐡𝐢𝐬 was on the pile of rubble digging and tearing up his hands the moment the villain moved away from it, distracted by other heroes. He knew he should be helping with the evacuation of the monster's path of travel, but he didn't care. 𝐲𝐸 and 𝗵𝘃𝗏 could still be alive under all of this. He was pissed that the heroes he had been working with had written off the pair as dead as soon as the building fell. He knew 𝐲𝐸, the bastard, was too stubborn to die from something like this, and he doubted 𝐲𝐸 would stand for that to happen to 𝗵𝘃𝗏 if he could help it. Another pair of familiar hands appeared next to him as 𝐀𝐻𝐬 scrambled to help him. Slowly but surely they shifted rubble alone until at last the rescue heroes trailing the destruction arrived, and with them Ragdoll, who, with a look of horror, immediately pinpointed both 𝐲𝐸 and 𝗵𝘃𝗏 as alive but beginning to suffer from hypoxia. Now, with the exact location pinpointed, the rescue heroes were desperately trying to clear an airway down to the pair to buy them more time to be properly excavated, while Ragdoll had to bodily pull the now exhausted and bloody Hisashi to an ambulance to get his hands looked at. As he stared down as the medic cut off what was left of his fingerless gloves and began to clean up his hand, he found himself glad he likely would not have to help restrain 𝐲𝐸's father when he found out about this, like he had back when 𝐲𝐸 had been hurt during the entrance exam. After Ragdoll had pulled back 𝐀𝐻𝐬, she came over to pat Hisashi on the shoulder. Both Eraserhead and Loud Cloud are still alive. They have almost dug an airway to them to begin pumping clean air down to them. You did good staying at the site to let us know to look for them. I'm not sure we would have found them in time had I not known I needed to check for them. How bad are they hurt? Hisashi was not stupid. He had noticed that Ragdoll had been avoiding using the phrase that they were okay. She sighed. Both are unconscious at this point and suffering slightly from hypoxia. Loud Cloud is largely in one piece but seems to have suffered major whiplash, a cracked rib cage, and while he miraculously does not seem to have a concussion, he did still suffer a pretty bad head injury. Eraserhead is in much worse shape. Honestly, I have no idea how he could have suffered some of the injuries he has. Both legs look like they destroyed themselves from the inside out, as well as one arm. The other arm is currently being crushed by one of the slabs pinning them, while it also rests on his already hurt legs. Additionally, several of his ribs have been crushed and are currently at risk of puncturing his internal organs, as well as one that has already punctured a lung. Thankfully, so long as it doesn't continue to shift, it is pugging the hole in his lung that it made and keeping him from drowning in his own blood, but we are still on a timer for that to get him out. I know I am not a medical professional, but I am worried that he might lose the ability to walk from his injuries. Hisashi snorted. Yeah, and the doctors all thought he would never be able to recover fully from his back injury, and you saw how he has recovered from that. He is just going to take your doubts and throw them back in your face out of spite. She blinked with a look of doubt on her face before she turned to look at the other heroes digging and sagged slightly in relief as a cheer went up. They are getting fresh air now. Sorahiko's mouth was dry in fear for the kids he had accidentally found himself growing attached to. He also had a decision to make to try and get the kids help as fast as possible. The rescue heroes on site lacked the physical strength to remove the rubble over the two boys, and, well, he had two viable options for who to call to remove it ASAP. If he called Toshi, then there would not be any issues with the heroes trying to stop him and clearing his location, but on the other hand he was going to have to call All for One about that, and there was no way that the man he had previously married would not immediately rush to the location and start digging his kid out the moment he heard. Sorahiko was not stupid enough to let the poor kids get caught up in the drama between the two of them or think that he could talk his ex out of it. So after a few moments of waffling on the idea, he dialed Toshi and made the decision to wait until after the boys were on the way to the hospital before calling the Midoriya's in. Toshinori nearly had a heart attack when he had been told by Mirai that Gran Torino was on the phone for him. Nervously, he picked up the phone line. "Toshi, I need you to get to 𝐴𝐸𝐸 Ward now. 2 of my students are trapped underneath rubble from a fallen building, and one of them is on the clock for bleeding out internally from a punctured lung." On it, as confused as he was by Gran Torino mentioning students that were not himself, he was quick to jump into action. He hung up the phone and tapped deep into one for all to travel quickly as possible to the site just a city over. It did not take him long to find the aftermath of the disaster. A massive form on the ground covered in massive burns on his back from 𝗵𝗲 and his sidekicks who had gotten to the site first. As he followed the trail of destruction back to try and find the site that Gran Torino had called him out to help find, he was eventually able to find a large group of heroes trying and failing to shift a large slab of concrete from over top of the 2 students. Cheers went up as people noticed him and cleared the way for him to take care of the heavy lifting. It was tricky work shifting the large slabs around so that the ones around them would not shift and potentially crush the 2 young future heroes who had apparently gotten trapped while helping evacuate a group of small school children as the hero who they had been doing their work studies explained as he dug. His Purple Highness had evidently briefly been knocked out and was horrified to find his last remaining work studies student had desperately been trying to dig out her underclassmen with the 2 boys' other close friend while he was out cold before the closest rescue heroes arrived to help get them out. He had been the one to call their homeroom teacher, Gran Torino, who had then in turn called himself. Finally, he lifted the final slab between himself and the 2 slightly blue-tinged boys. They were both out cold, and the black-haired one on top seemed to be really struggling to breathe while the other seemed to be giving off a mist from his exposed skin. But now that they were exposed, the medical professionals from the 2 waiting ambulances swooped in. A blonde teen hero with bandaged hands was beside the darker-haired boy immediately and climbed into the ambulance he was loaded up into while the mist-covered boy was joined with one of the young heroines that had been with the blonde. His work on the matter done, he was quick to join the rest of the group as they continued with the cleanup. He would have to call Gran Torino later to check up on the pair and find out how exactly the man who hated teaching at UA so much had apparently picked it back up again. 𝐸𝐸𝐸. Well, that plan could have gone better. Dr. Garaki Kyudai decided. His plan to recover the body of what he assumed previously to be another failed clone attempt that had killed its surrogate mother that he had incorrectly assumed had died as well during the process had not succeeded. Now its broken form was being fiercely guarded by his now former lovely master all for one. There would be no slipping in with his new Dr. Alias and spiriting it away. Thankfully, with the man so focused on defending the experiment from any outside threats, he was able to play with the boy that had been with number 10 for a bit of fun and stress relief. The hospital on the whole was under the incorrect assumption that his head injury had allowed him to slip into a small coma, while the truth was Kyudai was slipping him anesthetic on his regular checkups on the boy. Slowly but surely, he was preparing the boy's body to accept the quirk copies that he had kept stored away for a rainy day. The boy's cloud quirk would make an excellent base for an improved warping quirk over the one that his little experiment Johnny had. If the quirk that came from the experiment was a viable alternative, he would maybe be able to recreate it in his own Namu later. 𝐸𝐸𝐸. 𝐲𝐸 felt like shit when he woke up. His mouth was bone dry and still full of the taste of his own blood and dust. His chest and limbs were full of a deep aching pain, but given how he had felt when he passed out, that was hardly a surprise. His father was watching him with a puzzled look in his eye. 𝐲𝐸 looked around the room, smacking his lips to try and get some moisture to them, only for his father to hold up a glass of water with a straw to his lips. They were alone in a private room. Well, aside from the vestiges that only he could see and hear. 𝐴𝐸𝐸, alive but currently comatose from his head injury from what I understand. Your friends are currently sitting with him while we were waiting for you to wake up. I was hoping to speak to you alone first before I told them you were awake. 𝐲𝐸, when were you planning on telling me you had my quirk? My real one, not the one we have been pretending that I have for the sake of our family. 𝐲𝐸 froze, as the vestiges around him tensed. Before he could even ask, Yoichi clarified. Hasashi tried to give you a healing quirk while you were out cold. When it didn't work after he gave it to you, he tried to take it back but obviously couldn't. He might have noticed that you had more than one quirk at the time, even if he couldn't grab any of them to figure out what they are. He bit his lip as he reached inward and was able to quickly find the healing quirk that had been sitting inactive alongside the other quirks in his small little collection. Tentatively, he reached out and turned it on, and immediately, the pain began to fade away to be replaced by exhaustion. The moment his right arm was healed enough to move, he lifted his wrapped arm up and grabbed his father's hand and shoved the quirk away at the other man who had been watching him with an expression of worried caution. His stomach sank slightly when it worked, despite himself lacking the holes in his palms that both his father and the alternate Shigaraki had held as the hope that it was a misunderstanding caused by being a holder of one for all vanished. It seemed that unlike them, his version was a 5-point activation which had worrying implications. I'm not a thief, so it didn't matter. The 8 other quirks in your possession begged to differ. 𝐲𝐴 glared at him. I don't know how I got those. I've always had them. His father frowned but seemed to accept that. Could you tell me all of what you have? I know one of them had to have been responsible for shattering your bones in your legs at least. 𝐲𝐴 considered his words carefully. While he knew he could hardly hide the fact he held the quirks of all the holders of One for All, he could at least try to hide his knowledge of that in the ghosts. Besides erasure, the only one I use regularly is basically a form of super anxiety. It tells me where danger is near me so I can react a little faster. The one I broke my limbs using was a power stockpiler that I misjudged what I could safely handle in my hurry to save 𝗵𝗲𝗄 due to the lack of practice using it. Besides those, there is a form of kinetic stockpiler as well, a form of acceleration quirk, an emotion-based energy construct quirk, a weak flight quirk, and a smoke quirk that seems like a weaker version of 𝗵𝗲𝗄's cloud. His father had paled by the end of the list. You don't just have my quirk, you have One for All. How is that even possible so long as All Might? He cut himself off. Oh, shit. You are a time traveler, aren't you? That is why you had a panic attack the first time we crossed paths and how you figured out I was All for One so fast. You already knew. 𝐲𝐴 blinked in shock. Okay, that was not the reaction he had been expecting. Before he could ask for an explanation, his father kept going. That being said, you clearly were just as much in the dark as to our relations, so I can only presume that it failed to come up in your prior life, but why would I use that quirk on you? What happened that I was willing to erase myself from existence? 𝐲𝐴 blinked again before cautiously cutting in. Well, given that you probably had brain damage from your fight with All Might based on how you were acting. Honestly, I have no idea. The other you was not exactly mentally stable and was sort of trying to kill everyone. Also, I sort of died at the end there, so I had no idea what really even happened before I woke up again in the body of a 4-year-old again. His father looked visibly ill at the thought. Did I? Yes and no. The 𝗓𝗄𝐻 gave your original copy of your quirk to 𝗓𝗵𝗏, which turned his already emotionally and mentally unstable self into a complete unstable abomination. He was the one that killed me. Brain damaged, you was busy playing with the numbers 1 and 2 heroes at the time. Fuck, 𝐲𝐴 snorted. His father gave him a clearly worried look which he took to be a good sign. And you were the 9th in that timeline. 𝐲𝐴 nodded. Obviously I won't be in this timeline since, you know, I already sort of have it. The last thing I need is 2 copies of Uncle Yoichi's quirk to break all my bones with. His father rubbed his face. Well, at least I can see the logic behind giving it to you. Erasure and One for All likely would have been a good combination for stopping me. But that being said, how did 𝗓𝗏 kill you with that combination on your side? 𝐲𝐴 grimaced. The thing we were fighting was not even human at that point. Even with erasure being held on him constantly through the fight, he was still able to grow horrifying masses of limbs to use as weapons, as well as being so strong and fast that he was hard to keep up with. So what you are saying is I should really prioritize finding the doctor so your history doesn't repeat itself here, and really keep a closer eye on 𝗓𝗏. How was he the last time you checked on him? Well enough. I might have stolen his real quirk of decay in exchange for airwalk. With how things with his father were going, I was worried how people might treat him when it did finally manifest, so thank you for making me think to get a closer look sooner. That could have ended poorly for him. 𝐲𝐴's stomach flipped. I think it did in the first timeline. While I don't know much about his past, he did at one point claim you saved him when none of the heroes did and still had his original quirk. Additionally, he was walking around with dismembered human hands all over him, one of which he referred to as father and calling himself 𝗓𝗏, which definitely raised some concerns at the time. His father stiffened. Right, I will definitely be keeping an eye on things there very closely. 𝐲𝐴 let his head fall back into the pillows. Might be a good idea to point Gran Torino in their direction. We don't have to tell him everything going on, just that you have concerns about how 𝗓𝗏 Kotaro has been acting around his family. Probably not a bad idea. He sighed. Anything good from the other future to share? 𝗓𝗏 considered that. Not really. I can't really talk about most of it without ruining some major future surprises that are better off unchanged if I can help it. Plus I have sort of changed a lot just by meeting you and Mom in that park that day. It is getting harder to find things that haven't changed at this point, but that probably isn't a bad thing. It means I can probably go back to living my life like most other people now, provided I keep you from getting your skull bashed in. His father winced at that. Yes, that does sound preferable. He stood up and rested a hand back on 𝗓𝗏's head, causing the healing quirk he had given him earlier to click back into place. Finish healing yourself with that. I am going to make a few phone calls to cover up for you using it, and send your friends that are awake your way. 𝗓𝗏 sighed and complied, since it would have been completely illogical to not heal himself while he had the chance. Finally, he was alone with the vestiges. Toonami cast his gaze at the door. Well, that could have gone really badly. What would you have done if he had wanted One for All from you in your current condition? Worst comes to worst, I could have bitten him. Yoichi and Degoro burst out laughing at that, practically falling over one another as they laughed so hard. Katsumi just rolled his eyes with a huff. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 tried that before while he was in the vault to try and escape. It wouldn't have worked. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 huffed with a small smile. Yeah, but do I look like I bite? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 definitely does, so he probably saw it coming with him. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 gave a half-hearted glare. Lies and slander. You keep this up and you will no longer be my favorite nephew. I mean, if your new favorite is Izuku, I more than concede defeat. The kid is adorable. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 snorted. You know that sounds a bit narcissistic when you take into consideration that you were him. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 shrugged. Hey, I have been 𝐲𝐡𝐢 longer than I was Izuku at this point. The mood plummeted at that remark before 𝐬𝐡𝐢 sighed and moved to sit on the bed to pull him into a hug. God, I hate the fact that is true. Izuku, you never deserved to die that young. You were supposed to grow old and get married and have lots of kids, so I had grandnieces and nephews. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 huffed and leaned into the hug, tangible only to himself. You know, if you take into account Aizawa-sensei raising Eri, you did get one. Or the fact the class was pretty consistently calling him Deadzawa behind his back, you had even more. His uncle bonked him lightly on the top of the head with a fist. I know you can be a smartass, but you are missing the point there. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 just gave him a shit-eating grin. No, I know exactly what you were getting at. I just don't really care about it anymore. It has been more than a decade since then. Yeah, it sucked, but not that much worse than some of the shit we have gone through since. I mean, I literally just got a building dropped on top of me. The only thing that could have been worse would have probably been dying again. And snorted before deadpanning. Yay, apathy for the win. Deku sighed before reaching over to ruffle his hair. Kid, you need fucking therapy. Of course I do. I am talking to a bunch of voices in my head. Chew. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 froze as he spotted both Hisashi and Kayama-senpai standing in the doorway. Awkward. How much of that did you hear? Hisashi looked torn, but Kayama-senpai just rolled her eyes and shoved him the rest of the way into the room before pulling the door closed. Just the whole talking to a bunch of voices bit. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 winced before gesturing to the chairs beside the bed. So, I know that this is going to sound really crazy, but I am actually not crazy, just being haunted by ghosts that really would appreciate it if you don't tell my dad about them. My uncles don't want to talk with him right now, since once dad finds out about Uncle 𝐬𝐡𝐢, he probably won't leave me alone about him. Hisashi gave him a pitying look. Look, Shu, I know your mental health has never been great. 𝐲𝐡𝐢, not wanting to deal with this nonsense, turned to look directly at Deku on the other side of the bed and deliberately tipped himself and his uncle, still holding him hostage, sideways to crash into him. As his friends panicked at the action, Deku just squawked slightly and moved to catch the pair of them. Their panic immediately stopped when they realized that he was hovering back into position as Deku dumped the pair of them back on the bed. You couldn't have given me any more warning. Shu, how did you just do that? 𝐲𝐡𝐢 turned back to the pair of them, rolling his eyes. The ghosts are tangible only to me and each other. I just fell over onto one of them. He just caught me and put me back on the bed. Have you ever noticed that my hair sometimes moves on its own, even when I am not using my quirk? A couple of the ghosts like to ruffle my hair a lot, including the one who just kept me from face planting into the floor. Hisashi sighed and rubbed his forehead. Okay, fine, you're haunted. Why are you haunted? 𝐲𝐡𝐢 shrugged as he flicked his eyes over to Kayama-senpai. Not really sure how to explain it and not 100% trusting Kayama-senpai to not give away his secret. It is not something I really want to talk about. She looked hurt but seemed to get the message. You don't trust me, 𝐲𝐡𝐢 sighed. Not to keep your mouth shut about this, no. Believe me, I want to, but I could genuinely die if the wrong person hears about this. He averted his eyes. Hell, I still might. It is only a matter of time before he finds out about me and draws the wrong conclusion. And I know he will. 𝐲𝐡𝐢 felt the tears in the corners of his eyes as he finally admitted the truth to himself. All Might was not his friend and mentor in the timeline and likely never would be. Not when he looked so much like his father and was walking around with multiple quirks. Not when he had a copy of 𝐴ll-for-One for himself. His uncle tightened his hug and reached up to ruffle his hair. I know it hurts, 𝐲𝐡𝐢. We're all scared for you too. As he leaned into the touch with a sob, he found another 2 sets of arms coming up around him to fully cocoon him in a hug. Ei. Hisashi slid the door back closed quietly, not wanting to disturb the moment as his son broke down in his friend's arms. It was not hard to figure out what had likely upset him. He had been the 9th holder of One for All, but now he held a copy of 𝐴ll-for-One. The deep bond he had likely shared with All Might had been stolen from him, and now he knew about having his own version of 𝐴ll-for-One. Any hope he had likely been clinging to had likely been ripped out from under him. If All Might found out, he was likely dead, mistaken for Hisashi himself. For once, Hisashi hated that 𝐲𝐡𝐢 took so strongly after himself. His eye color when not using his quirk was essentially the only physical trait he seemed to share with his other father. But he supposed that was to be expected when the DNA split was 20/80th in his own favor over 50/50. There was little he could do about it now though. He would have to wait until 𝐲𝐡𝐢 was more comfortable with the idea. No, the necessary evil that would be removing the symbol of peace from atop his pillar. The man was too large a threat to ignore, hanging over them like the sword of Damocles. 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬, like both himself and 𝗬𝗱, was generally a rather logical person. But, he mused, all of them were prone to making impulsive judgment calls with upset. While it took longer with all three of them to get there, once it happened, reason flew out the window. So he would just have to wait. This time, he would save his family, even if he broke the world to do it. 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 had mastered the art of having silent panic attacks. It had become necessary back when he had first moved in with his parents, with the Vestiges regularly freaking out about 𝐴ll-For-One being so close by, and, he supposed, about the man being his biological father. Then came the news he wasn't even technically a normal human but a clone of all things, and he still had to roll with it. Masked his distress so that his father stayed calm and didn't do anything that would attract All Might's attention and force him to leave sooner. He had kept most of his poker face when he learned that his former mentor Gran Torino was his father's ex, which, no, that had not even occurred to him as a vague possibility and completely upended his already justified concern that the hero would recognize him as All-For-One, which, to be fair, the hero did. But the fact he never called All Might and seemed just as intent on keeping his father away from the hero as 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 probably said a lot about the nature of the older hero's complicated feelings for the man that he had clearly no longer held by the time 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 had met him in the first place in the other timeline. 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 had also remained relatively calm in his shock at the revelation that his current situation was entirely one of the All-For-Ones of the alternate future's fault. Though to be fair, who else could it have been? A revelation that had followed the fact that he had his own version of All-For-One from somewhere, because of course he did. Why not? After those shocks, the revelation that 𝐴𝐴RO's corpse had been used to make the 𝐬𝐻𝐻 𝐬𝐈𝐻 in the last timeline, and that the doctor had been in the same hospital as himself hardly registered outside of the resigned mental note to divorce 𝐴𝐴RO. New appearance from the name 𝐬𝐻𝐻 𝐬𝐈𝐻 in his mind. Like he said, he had mastered the art of silent panic attacks. Little Izuku, however, had very much not and was quivering in his distress. It had been years since the building had fallen, and he had long since moved out on his own to start his hero career alongside his now boyfriends Hisashi and 𝐴𝐴RO, but he had been called home for an emergency family dinner that night. It had only taken him knowing the date to know why. 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 sighed as he rubbed the back of his crying little brother. It is hardly the end of the world, Izuku. Remember, I don't even use my quirk all the time and I am doing just fine as a pro hero. Quirks are just tools in your arsenal. Sure, you don't have one, but all that means is you should use what you do have. Besides, there is always the chance the doctor was wrong and your quirk will just come in later and in a way we aren't expecting. 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 gave his father a knowing look as his mother gave him a look of disapproval, likely not wanting to give Izuku any false hope, completely unaware of the fact that half the people in the room had quirks that could correct the issue. And that was assuming that 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬's silent worried theory of where his own version of All-For-One came from was incorrect. Really, 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 rolled his eyes. Forced quirk manifestations are pretty rare, but they happen. I know of a boy only a couple years older than you that stress manifested a decay quirk months after he was told to never expect to get one. Plus, you need to take into account that our Uncle Yoichi's stockpiling quirk was pretty much invisible most of his life, so you might just take after him. Everyone thought he was quirkless too. That cheered him up immensely and earned both him and his father an odd look from his mother, who, obviously, had never heard anything about Yoichi in the past outside of his father mentioning he had helped raise his younger brother and that he was obviously pretty dead due in part to a long-term health issue due to the medical-related trauma it dredged up in their father. After dinner, his father was quick to steal him away for a private conversation. So what quirk did I give him in the other timeline and how did he do with it? 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 rolled his eyes, having seen this coming for a while. I was actually thinking he could have won for all if you were okay with it. His father jolted slightly. Oh, you would give up your copy so history could repeat itself with All Might picking you as his successor then? 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 shook his head. That would be a horrible idea. Actually, I was thinking more along the lines of arranging for All Might to pass it to Izuku directly. One for All built up too much power when it was passed on to me to safely transfer it. You saw what it did to my limbs when I accidentally used too much of it to save 𝐴𝐴RO. If it grew in power any more before passing to Izuku, it would probably kill him. His father recoiled at the idea. Perhaps one for all is a bad idea. 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬 snorted. For a little kid, definitely. If things end up close enough to my past, I think I can see to it that All Might passes on the quirk to him not long before he takes the UA entrance exam. His father still frowned. You think it will be safe for him to have then? Provided he actually listens to me about how to control it. He should be fine outside of maybe the first activation, but if he gets it close to the UA entrance exam, then that would hardly be an issue since he will have pretty immediate access to Recovery Girl. There is another issue with that though. The only reason All Might was even considering a successor was because of an injury that you inflicted on him during a fight about 5 years from now. The fight that basically killed you even if your body was still running around committing crimes. That earned a wince. So if we want to get one for all out of his hands, we are going to have to risk something similar happening here. It is worse than that actually. I am pretty sure the only reason your body survived in the first place was because of the doctor and, well, That obviously won't work here. Really selling this idea to me, 𝐲𝐻𝐬. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 winced. Sorry, it is just that the benefits to going through with the fight are better in the long run over possibly avoiding it. Part of the reason you got away with so much stuff that led to 𝗵𝗲 winning was because All Might was convinced you were dead. If we could get something to happen like that here, he would lower his guard and all of us would be safer. His father hummed in thought. Plus I suppose trying to avoid the fight would only be stalling in the long run. All Might would probably keep hunting me until he died otherwise. Okay, instead of trying to figure out how to avoid that inevitability, let's focus on how to get me out of the fight alive. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Hisashi loved his son 𝐲𝐻𝐬. He really did. That being said, he really wished his son was better about not trying to hide potentially life-saving information from him because he was squeamish about either of them using their versions of All for One. A molecular reconstruction quirk in the hands of a man that 𝐲𝐻𝐬 clearly held nothing but disdain for, and yet it had been like pulling teeth to get 𝐲𝐻𝐬 to even mention overhaul. Who better to be his first real quirk theft victim? Hopefully after he took a few more quirks, 𝐲𝐻𝐬 would relax a bit more to the idea of doing it, given it seemed he lacked the instinctual drive to use it as a result of it likely having been a parting gift from his counterpart before 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had been sent back. His counterpart confused Hisashi greatly. Why would he allow 𝐲𝐻𝐬 to be killed but then choose to send him back with his own version of All for One? The former only made sense if he had no idea that 𝐲𝐻𝐬 was his son, as had clearly been the case in the reverse for 𝐲𝐻𝐬, but the latter could only be explained if he had known. Had he discovered the truth too late to save 𝐲𝐻𝐬 and had to overcorrect to try and save him? There was no way to really know at this point, he supposed. Still, that brought the two of them to tonight. It was one of 𝐲𝐻𝐬's nights off from heroics, and the two of them would finally be going out quirk shopping together like he had admittedly wanted to do since his discovery of 𝐲𝐻𝐬 having his own copy of All for One. He had long wanted someone to share the joy of doing so that really could understand. God, he hoped 𝐲𝐻𝐬 would finally start to understand after tonight. Presently, however, he was standing in the living room of his son's apartment as 𝐲𝐻𝐬 was awkwardly confessing to their plans for the evening. An act that was baffling Hisashi slightly, given that his son's partners were not just his romantic ones but heroics as well. You know how you guys have both mentioned that if I ever went completely off the deep end, you guys would help cover for me. Yamada eyed Hisashi suspiciously before nodding to 𝐲𝐻𝐬 along with Shirakumo. Yeah, shoo. Please don't tell me that you and your old man are planning on going out tonight to murder someone. I mean, if you are bothering to premeditate it, whoever it is probably deserves it, but this seems to still be pretty short notice. Shirakumo scratched at the back of his head. Yeah, I would have appreciated a little more warning in advance if you are going to need us to help you hide a body. Oh, well, that was not the reaction that Hisashi had been expecting. Did they really think that 𝐲𝐻𝐬 was that likely to kill someone? 𝐲𝐻𝐬 just rolled his eyes. No need to break out any shovels, though for future reference, 𝐴𝐻𝐬, given that you have a warp quirk now, all you would have to do was open a portal far enough out to see that recovering the body is unlikely. Yamada gave a smug look to Shirakumo, who was grumbling slightly to himself as he fished out a few yen notes from a small portal and slapped them into the other man's hand. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 blinked at the exchange before massaging his forehead. Good to know the two of you have been making bets behind my back about me and my possible villainy. Way to really cheer me up. Yamada patted him on the shoulder. There, shoo. Think of it less like we were thinking about it like you were eventually going to snap and kill someone, and more like that we had full confidence that if you did that you would never let anyone find out it was you. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 snorted. Of course not. I'm not an idiot. Yamada brightened. Exactly. Despite Shirakumo's form preventing him from seeing it, Hisashi was pretty sure he rolled his eyes. So why do we need to cover for you and maybe your old man? Hisashi waved the young man off. My alibi is already more than covered. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 huffed and shook his head. Dad is going out in full villain persona, so there is little chance that the hero and lead of his case will know to link the case to him, since he has no reason to link the two identities. The issue is if I accidentally use erasure in front of the wrong person. My quirk is pretty distinctive, so if suspicion was to fall on me, I would need the two of you to say I was here with you all night. Hisashi was not sure if he should be worried that the pair did not even blink at 𝐲𝐻𝐬 casually dropping the fact he himself was a villain, though to be fair, 𝐲𝐻𝐬 probably told them at some point prior. Shirakumo scratched his chin and nodded. We can order our usual takeout for dinner tonight that you can eat when you get back and settle in for a movie night or something. We can rewatch something you have seen before. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 shot a glance back over at Hisashi. You could watch any of the All Might movies if you want something new to watch that I have already seen. I've seen them all thanks to Izuku, some more than once, which is why I have never really been all that interested in watching them. Hisashi winced as he was reminded of his youngest's obsession with his nemesis thanks to his classmate. Given the fact that 𝐲𝐻𝐬 had not even blinked before buying Izuku a limited edition All Might action figure without prompting for the boy's birthday just weeks prior, probably said a lot about what Hisashi's own future at home was likely to be for the next couple years. Yamada, however, gave a sad smile. How is the little listener holding up anyways? Hisashi shrugged. He is doing well enough. The whole reason we are going out tonight is to work towards a plan to get him his own quirk actually. That made the pair jolt. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 looked back and forth between the two of them. Wait, don't tell me you are going out to try and cut a deal with the boogeyman of the underground to get little 𝐬𝐸𝐻 a quirk. If he is even real, how did you two plan to keep him from cheating you and just taking your quirks? So 𝐲𝐸 had not told them everything about who he was as a villain after all. As 𝐲𝐸 stifled a laugh, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 gave the other two men his broadest grin. Oh, that is hardly a real concern given that the boogeyman is me. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 went rigid, but Yamada just gave him a slow blink before shaking his head. Of course you would be. I guess that explains the whole you not aging thing. You stole a quirk for then, I suppose. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 hummed. A few as well as was gifted one. The latter, Life Force, originally belonged to the doctor who created 𝐲𝐸 as a gift of good faith after he successfully figured out how to give himself a copy of his own quirk. His quirk on its own would have halved the rate at which I age, but in combination with cellular regeneration and limber, provided I am not killed by an outside force, I believe I am likely functionally immortal. I, at the very least, will not be dying of illness or old age anytime soon. So, what? The two of you are going out tonight to find the little listener a good quirk. Don't you think he might be upset to learn you stole it for him later? 𝐲𝐸 shook his head. No, that is not the plan. We are aiming for him to be gifted the original copy of my uncle's quirk by its current holder without him knowing that he is actually returning it to our family. One for all is like dad's all for one in that it can be transferred from host to host. It is functionally a transferable power stockpiler. To his surprise, 𝗔𝗂𝐬 cut in. I thought you said that you had your uncle's quirk. 𝐲𝐸 shook his head. I just have a copy of it. The original is still in the hands of its 8th holder. We are just working to ensure that 𝐬𝐸𝐻 becomes the 9th and final holder. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 gave his son an amused smirk. And since I am sure he hasn't told you, given your surprise about my villain alter ego, for future reference, 𝐲𝐸 has a copy of my own quirk as well that he has only ever used to make me take back any healing quirks I have given him thus far. Perhaps you would be able to get him to see reason and actually hold on to the copy of cellular regeneration I had specifically made for him after the incident with the UA entrance exam. 𝐲𝐸 glared at 𝐬𝐡𝐢, clearly annoyed with being outed like that. Dad, after tonight, I am going to have overhaul. Cellular regeneration is going to be redundant and frankly would see better use by either 6 or 9 if we could ever find them. Hell, if you hold on to it long enough, 𝐬𝐸𝐻 could use it. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 did have to concede defeat there. Thankfully, he was saved by Yamada from having to admit as such. Overhaul? Is that the quirk that you are going to steal? 𝐲𝐸 hunched in on himself at his boyfriend's clear discomfort at the idea. It is a molecular reconstruction quirk that is currently in the hands of a guy in the Yakuza. The guy could literally go around curing cancer if he wanted, but obviously doesn't. I am going to take it to keep as insurance in case Dad's next fight with All Might goes wrong, since as powerful as his healing quirks are, they do have limits. Yamada blinked. Have you considered, just not fighting him? That just seems like a bad idea unless you want to get caught. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 sighed. As nice as it would be to avoid, he is actively hunting for me. Either I fight him on my terms at this point or we risk him discovering our family, which would go extremely poorly. To give you an idea of how bad it would be, despite knowing perfectly well who I am now and very much being on All Might's side, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 never once considered actually telling All Might how to find me after he discovered my current civilian identity. I worry that if he were ever to discover the full truth about 𝐲𝐸, he would not hesitate to kill him like he would myself due to the combination of the fact he has my quirk and is not technically a normal human. Both of the other men looked visibly ill at the thought. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 turned to 𝐲𝐸. Okay, yeah, we are never leaving you alone somewhere that you are likely to run into the #1 hero. I hope you realize that, right? Also, how on earth do you deal with the fact that your little brother is a fan of his with that knowledge? 𝐲𝐸 shrugged. With the knowledge that so long as he never finds out, he would save me like anyone else from Dad if he saw us in the same room together. Yamada sighed and pinched his nose under his glasses. 𝐲𝐸, I hope you realize this explains a lot about your mental health issues, and why you have been so worried about the wrong people hearing about your quirks. I'll be honest, I am half tempted to just bundle you up in our bedding and keep you locked up here in the apartment safe and sound. If it wasn't for the fact I know you would escape in only a couple minutes if I tried. 𝐲𝐸 just gave him a level look. Please don't give Dad any ideas. I have it on good authority that he is not above vaulting loved ones. 𝐬𝐡𝐢 huffed. I am slightly offended that 𝗬𝐻𝐻 thought you needed to be warned about that. 𝐲𝐸 glared back defiantly. You can't just vault people and not expect them to warn other potential future victims. Yamada leveled him with a look. So I guess we will just pretend we didn't hear that you actually tried locking both Gran Torino and possibly others up at some point then. 𝐲𝐸 just nodded with a sigh. Yeah, it is best to just ignore Dad's vaulting habit. His quirk hoarding impulses just transfer slightly over to people sometimes. Don't worry about it. I am pretty sure I can avoid it. 𝗔𝗂𝐬 snorted. Really leaning into the whole dragon thing, huh? 𝐬𝐡𝐢 gave an unrepentant grin at that. Why do you think I went out of my way to find a fire-breathing quirk for my civilian persona? He checked the time. Still, I think we have loitered here long enough, don't you? 𝐲𝐻 sighed. Yeah, probably. Okay, let's go get this over with. With a parting kiss with each of his partners, they were gone out into the night. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 felt a bit silly following at his father's heels into the Yakuza base. After leaving the apartment, they had swung by one of his father's nearby hideouts for a costume change, changing both of them into fitted suits, himself shaving, and his father using a color-changing quirk to revert 𝐲𝐻's hair to its natural white to fully disguise him. Okay, sure, it was extremely unlikely that anyone would connect this new clean-cut persona to his normal scruffy hero one, but just walking in to take the quirk still didn't feel like a real plan, or at least not a good one. One of the Yakuza men was quickly running in front of the pair of them, leading the way to the meeting that his father had basically ordered, an action that was not winning them any favors with the other Yakuza there that they could see. The meeting room was still empty when they arrived outside of the two couches facing one another to either side of a coffee table. 𝐲𝐻 followed his father's lead and sat down beside him. If I had known this was your plan, I would have questioned you more over it. His father flashed his signature grin at him. Now where is your sense of adventure? This is more fun, 𝐲𝐻 snorted, watching the men guarding the exits of the room for reactions. It died about 10 years from now when your original successor broke Japan and killed me. That earned him surprised reactions from the guards and a pout from his father. You wound me. You can't seriously hold something alternate me did against me still. He knew 𝐲𝐻 didn't, obviously at this point, but the question was for the Yakuza's benefit. According to his father, it was not an uncommon tactic for them to eavesdrop on their guests to get a feel for them before entering a meeting. His father had barely finished speaking when the doors flew open again to reveal 4 men that 𝐲𝐻 could easily identify. In the lead was Mimic, actually in his human form with a clipboard and pen in hand, followed by 𝐸𝐻𝐸 on the left-hand side of the man that was still very much in charge of this branch of the Yakuza, and to the right, 𝗵𝗲. Kai couldn't help but feel the predatory gaze that fell on him from the man with the long white hair that sat at the side of All For One. Now, Kai didn't scare easily for as much as he recoiled from the very thought of germs, but in that moment, he was suddenly painfully aware of the fact he was in only a relatively small room with both the boogeyman of the underworld and from his position next to All For One on the couch, his new right hand. The boss also was quick to note the man's gaze clearly as he suddenly signaled behind his back for Hari to step in front of Kai to block the man's gaze. Ah, sensei, to what do I owe this unexpected surprise visit? All For One hummed and gestured to the young man next to him. Oh, I am merely here at my son's request. He is the one who asked to arrange a visit. It is my understanding that he heard of a quirk among your men that he himself is interested in. Oh, shit. Kai found himself taking a nervous step back as all of them nervously bristled. The boss glared at the pair. So that is it. You come here intent on stealing my adopted son's quirk for your own son. All For One looked sickeningly delighted at the accusation. Oh, I never said I would be the one taking it. Before they could even blink, the man who had been at his side was gone in a flash of green lightning, in between Kai and Hari, with his hand wrapped around Kai's throat, eyes glowing red and hair wiping away from his face like he was standing in a force wind outside, now hidden from Kai's sight. All For One continued. After all, my son is more than capable of taking it for himself with his own copy of my quirk. Kai brought a hand up to try and destroy the man, but his quirk never activated. It was just not there. He released Kai to fall back to the floor, rubbing his likely bruised neck and breaking out in hives. The man blinked before looking at his hand with a puzzled expression. I had wondered about that. He turned back to All For One. You was a lazy bastard, you know that, right? It probably would have taken you about a week to learn how to use overhaul properly to heal yourself, but instead you picked rewind despite the risk of that one killing you. All For One shrugged. Guilty. Why bother with quirks with a steep learning curve when I can get the same effects with none of the work? All For One is wasted on you. All For One just grinned. Well, that just makes you a good successor, doesn't it? 𝐸𝐸𝐸 would forever deny how cathartic ripping overhaul away from Chisaki was for him. Okay, sure, he had sort of pitied the guy when he had seen him after the breakout from Tartarus, but the guy had lost both his arms and had been clearly miserable. This Chisaki, while obviously still innocent of the crimes he had committed against Eri, given that she hadn't even been born yet, still could have easily done the same. Now Eri would be safe and hopefully live a good enough life with her grandfather that their paths would never have to cross. But now he had to deal with his father's smug ass, since now 𝐲𝐻 no longer had any chance of holding the moral high ground with him again. He had stolen a quirk and had enjoyed the feeling as it slotted into place in his little collection courtesy of the other vestiges. He heard Chisaki's panic as his vestige manifested. As the other vestiges panicked as that happened, since that had never happened before. But it was fine. He could tune out the screaming from his quirk now. Tune out Yoichi's clear fear of himself as he began to take the first same steps as his father had all those years ago. He was not going to panic over something so minor in the grand scheme of things. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 had a new headmate, one who was probably just as unhappy about the arrangement as he was. Chisaki Kai evidently was just as unpleasant of a teenager as he would be as an abusive guardian for 𝐲𝐻𝐸 did have to admit to feeling a bit guilty about taking his quirk when he had realized that fact. Chisaki was only 16, just like he himself had been when his own world was turned upside down by the war. And now, this piece of him would never see adulthood. That was one of the downsides of being a vestige. You stopped aging at whatever age you were when you became one. That was why Anne, despite being over a year older than Nana chronologically, was a good decade younger than her now. There wasn't much for it at this point though. While he could give it back for a couple years, there was little chance of him ever recovering it, so he was now stuck with a germophobic teenager in his head. At least the quirk was worth that inconvenience. 𝐸𝐻𝐸 was one of the most versatile quirks he had ever come across, and 𝐲𝐻𝐸 suspected that the only hands besides his own that would be able and willing to fully utilize it were, funnily enough, his own. Little Izuku had latched onto the theory that he likely had an invisible quirk like his uncle, like a lifeline, and was channeling all his quirk-loving energy into trying to unravel the secret requirements to unlock it. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 had to wonder what his reaction one day would be after All Might gave him one for all and he learned the truth about their own family. How he would react to learning that he had indeed manifested his uncle's quirk like 𝐲𝐻𝐸 had brought up. He had been pondering on the topic while cleaning up the apartment on his own day off to get Chisaki to shut up about the barely existent mess enough that he could stop muting the auditory connection he had with his quirks when he got a knock at the door. 𝐲𝐻𝐸, please for the love of God tell me that your father recently found one of your brothers. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 winced and he gestured for Gran Torino to come in. I think you already know the answer to that question. His shorter father seemed to consider him in the doorway and didn't move to enter. I am not Dad. If you would come inside I will explain. This is hardly an appropriate conversation for the hallway. I'll put a blindfold on and sit on the opposite side of the room from you if you want. His father shook his head before walking through the door. No, I don't think that will be necessary, but the offer is appreciated. He lashed out with his recently obtained cane to whack 𝐲𝐻𝐸 on the shin. Now you better have a damn good reason for this or I am running to grab All Might to arrest your ass. A fucking teenager, 𝐲𝐻𝐸. Really? 𝐲𝐻𝐸 sighed and closed the door behind them. Before I start, how much of what Dad and I said in front of the Yakuza actually got back to you? His father paused. Yakuza? Really? They were claiming that you jumped some spoiled rich kid after All for One tricked them to invite him inside. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 snorted. What, is he a fucking vampire now? No, we were fully inside a Yakuza compound and said rich kid was standing at their boss's right hand. His father did seem to consider that. Okay, so why did you steal his quirk? And since when could you even do that? 𝐲𝐻𝐸 picked up 𝐸𝐻𝐸's bonsai tree from the kitchen window and brought it over to set it down on the table in front of his father and began tearing leaves off it, making his father wince at the sight. What are you? I have had access to a copy of All for One since my quirk came in at age 4. In one moment I went from having no quirks at all to having 9 or, well, I supposed it is technically 10. If you count the transference quirk and the stockpiling quirk that make up One for All as separate. A little over a decade from now, the world as we know it started to end. The heroes had already lost Japan and we were just struggling to desperately stop the monster behind it all from moving on to the rest of the world. We planned an ambush to split the villains that did mostly work, but ultimately it was for nothing. I remember the moment Shigaraki Tamura grabbed my face with decay fully active, and then I was standing in my bedroom at my first foster's place, only 4 years old again. I realized almost immediately that One for All had traveled back with me, but given the copy of All for One I was apparently handed before being drop-kicked into the past lacked a vestige given it was a copy. I only found out I had it in wake of the incident during our work studies when Dad forced a healing quirk on me to try and help me recover and wake up, only for it to not work and for him to be unable to take it back until I returned it to him when I woke hours later. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 scooped up the leaves and bits of plant matter that he had created in one hand and grabbed the trunk of the small tree with the other before activating 𝐸𝐻𝐸. The damage that had taken him minutes to create was undone in less than a blink of the eye. I needed 𝐸𝐻𝐸 because it is one of only 2 quirks I know of that can reverse the kind of damage that Dad and All Might are going to do to one another the next time they cross paths. Dad cannot be allowed to be left as he was in the other timeline. If you think he is dangerous now, you should have seen the monster he became. As he spoke, understanding seemed to dawn on his father alongside horror. You were the 9th. You are the 9th. 𝐲𝐻𝐸 sighed. You were right the first time. I forfeited my chance to ever be Yaga's successor the moment I agreed to allow Dad to adopt me in this timeline. You should probably inform both him and 𝐸𝗔𝐸 that the 9th will have to be quirkless unless they want the new 9th to die a horrible death as the quirk tears them apart from the inside out. Tell them to look up the 4th holder, Shinomori Hikage, if they don't believe me. He died at 40 from old age from the stress the quirk put him under, and he only held it for less than 20 years. The only reason it has never been an issue for Yagi is because of his formerly quirkless status. His father paled. Then you. I'm fine. I was genetically designed to have more than one quirk in the first place. We would have noticed I had all for one sooner otherwise probably. 𝐬𝐻 met Nana's gaze from her place hovering near her former best friend. She gave a small nod before signing a quick message. Yeah, Nana says hi in case you were wondering. And that you. 𝐬𝐻 blinked as she huffed and signed the message again. Nana, I am not telling my father that. No, just no. He looked between 𝐬𝐻 and the point over his shoulder that 𝐬𝐻 was so intently staring at. Wait, is Nana here? Like right there. 𝐬𝐻 gestured around the room. She is there, yeah, and is over there. The fifth holder, 𝐷𝐴𝐽, is over near my cleaning supplies teasing 𝐍𝐴𝐭 for trying to pick them up I think, which 𝐜𝐡𝐬 just slapped him over the head for. Thanks 𝐜𝐡𝐬. Anyways, second and third, or Katsumi and Taoyami are listening in from over by the window where I think they were people watching and my uncle Yoichi. He trailed off as he realized he couldn't actually see him only to start as the man appeared out of nowhere to ruffle his hair again before throwing himself over the back of the couch to come to rest half on and half off 𝐬𝐻's lap. Clearly laughing even if 𝐬𝐻 couldn't currently hear him. 𝐬𝐻 grabbed his feet and shoved them off himself. And my uncle is being an ass since I can't hear any of them right now. He blinked at 𝐬𝐻 before narrowing his eyes slightly. You can't hear them. Then how did you know what Nana is trying to say? 𝐬𝐻 huffed. She was using JSL. And I can hear them normally. I just muted the connection for a bit for the sake of my sanity. 𝐍𝐴𝐭 is not taking the change well, understandably, so I haven't really been able to hear myself even think unless I muted them since I got him. Before you ask, I figured out how to do that ages ago since I couldn't exactly afford them distracting me and giving me panic attacks all the time while out working. He looked a bit suspicious of that. And you can just see them all the time. Ever since I had one for all for more than a year in the previous timeline, yeah. They only really got the ability to interact with me fully corporally after I was sent back though, so I am unsure if that was something that was going to happen naturally or if it is a side effect of also having all for one now. Regardless, whoever ends up as the ninth is going to be haunted too. His father frowned. Couldn't that be dangerous if for some reason one of them wanted to attack you? Both the vestiges in his direct line of sight looked a bit ill at the idea. 𝐬𝐻 took that to be a good sign at least. He glanced quickly around to see Taoyami smacking Katsumi over the head with 𝐍𝐴𝐭 looking on at them in open interest that was quickly getting corrected by what seemed to be 𝐷𝐴𝐽 openly threatening him with his own quirk that he was quick to respond with his own sparking hand. 𝐬𝐻 quickly flared a razor at the pair. Knock it off you two. You can't actually kill each other so stop trying. 𝐷𝐴𝐽 gave a cheeky grin before signing. Might not be able to kill him, but I can sure strangle him for a while. 𝐬𝐻 just gave an exasperated sigh before falling back into his seat as 𝐍𝐴𝐭 recoiled from the larger man to go hide back inside the quirk proper where he would be left alone, given that none of the vestiges beside him ever went in there while 𝐬𝐻 was awake anymore. Should I be worried about that? Hell if I know. To answer your previous question, I am pretty sure the vestiges from One for All would stop 𝐍𝐴𝐭 from making an assassination attempt. Since I am not exactly planning on stealing any other quirks, I am pretty sure I am safe for now. Who were about to fight anyways? You said that the fourth and fifth holders were over there with the kid, right? It was 𝐷𝐴𝐽 who was going to strangle the kid for probably considering it. While the kid is still just a kid, his quirk can be extremely deadly if utilized correctly. As an instant vaporization deadly, so if he could use his quirk on me directly, I would have some major concerns about him, but given that none of their quirks can interact with me without me wanting them to, probably means I am pretty safe from that. 𝐬𝐻 overhauled the plant once more, reducing it to nothing more than a fine mist. I can only assume that is a fail-safe built into All for One, or I am sure Dad probably would be significantly less alive right now. He restored the tree back to normal as his father stared at it. No, at 𝐬𝐻 in clear open fear. 𝐬𝐻 was not sure how he felt about that fact. When Gran Torino stumbled back into Might Tower that evening, Toshinori couldn't help but feel worried about what he found chasing the lead he had said he potentially had. Did you find a lead on All for One or the supposed second man with his quirk? Gran Torino practically fell into the meeting room chair. When is that detective getting here? Mirai frowned from where he had been doing paperwork while they waited. You found something then? You could say that. For starters, the kid who had his quirk stolen is Yakuza, so their whole story was pretty much bullshit, but we kinda already figured that. Secondly, the guy who stole the quirk is definitely not All for One. And I can't believe I am saying this. We should probably just leave the quirk where it is at for now. Frankly, I trust him with it over it potentially falling into All for One's hands directly. At least if he has it. All for One can't use it to literally vaporize you on the spot. Toshinori paled. I'm sorry, but did you say vaporization? I thought it was supposed to be a basic healing quirk. Gran Torino shook his head. according to its new holder. It is a straight-up molecular reconfiguration quirk and there is no delay at all when he uses it. It is just, he snapped his fingers, and poof, anything he wants reduced to a fine mist. Of course it can be used for healing, but I doubt either 𝐴ll4ONE or the original owner planned on using it exclusively for that like the current guy. Mirai was giving 𝐷𝐸 his full attention now. Your source. He is the thief, isn't he? Toshinori's stomach sank as 𝐷𝐸 just winced slightly. You don't want to tell us about him. You are trying to protect him. That is why you were so insistent about going to meet him alone. He sighed. Well, I wasn't lying about the fact I was pretty sure he would run if he saw you with me at his front door. He is legitimately terrified of you and frankly I don't blame him for it. The kid has the misfortune of having his father's quirk whether he plans to use it or not. Toshinori's mouth went dry. 𝐴ll4ONE has a son. Assuming the two I don't have a current account of are still alive wherever they ended up, he has 4 actually. There were more cloning attempts but only a few survived. The whole reason his organization split like it did was 𝐴ll4ONE found out about his doctor cloning him behind his back and was reasonably pissed off about the fact that he had at least 7 dead kids unaccounted for. Toshinori was probably going to throw up. Even if the man was a complete bastard, no one deserved that, let alone the poor kids that it happened to. Still he had to know. Did the other 3 inherit the quirk too? Toshinori felt guilty that he was relieved when 𝐷𝐸 shook his head. Overclock. Weather manipulation, and currently unmanifested. The last kid is still only a little kid and is happily living at home with his mother blissfully unaware of who his father is, and I am planning on keeping it that way for as long as possible for the Rugrat. Number 6 is the real issue since unlike 9 and 10 who escaped the doctor, 6 was working with him willingly the last any records of him mention. The doctor found a way to make copies of quirks before his break with 𝐴ll4ONE, meaning it is still completely possible that when 6 does reappear it will be with a copy of 𝐴ll4ONE as well. Mirai was furiously writing on his scratch notepad. And which one is which? 9 and 10 for future reference. 𝐷𝐸 sighed. 9 has the weather quirk and 10 is my contact, but you really don't have to worry about him. Mirai shook his head. I think we should make individual judgment calls on him instead of just acting on the blind faith in him that you seem to have. I do wonder why you are going to such lengths to try and shield him. Before he could respond there was a knock on the meeting room door before Tsukachi slipped it. Sorry I'm late. I didn't miss anything important, have I? Just that 𝐷𝐸 has been hiding the fact that 𝐴ll4ONE has kids somewhere and actively shielding one of them from us despite knowing that he has his father's quirk and was the one to steal that quirk we heard about. Tsukachi seemed to lock up as he processed that information. Okay, we will have to circle back to all of that. 𝐷𝐸 had buried his face in his arms on the table. Just close and lock the fucking door. This is not something we want someone walking in on. Tsukachi was quick to comply and opened up his own notepad. Okay, what is this about that lead of yours being the one to steal the quirk and why you clearly didn't want us to know about him? 𝐷𝐸 sat there motionless for nearly a minute, just as Tsukachi seemed to get ready to ask him another question to try to get a response. He sighed before he turned and looked the detective dead in the eye. 10 is my time-traveling idiot clone bastard child with 𝐴ll4ONE and was the 9th holder of One for All in his previous timeline. Since the world was ending in his last timeline, because he only played hero, he basically said fuck it and is currently trying to prevent the same thing from happening here by keeping 𝐴ll4ONE happy, healthy, and most importantly distracted so he doesn't go completely nuts and apparently level Japan and maybe later the rest of the world. 10 didn't exactly make it to the end to find out the first time. The worst part of hearing all of that from him is I know he wasn't fucking lying. He is like 𝐴ll4ONE in the fact that he could probably talk circles around the truth, but unlike him is completely hopeless when he lies. The kid puts on the fakest smile you have ever seen when he does, which is extra obvious when the kid normally defaults to looking annoyed and a bit dead inside. Toshinori watched in horror as Tsukachi seemed to slowly die inside himself as he seemed to reluctantly nod along. Okay, let's back up to that first sentence. 10 is what? 𝐷𝐸 sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. You have no idea how much it physically pains me to say all this. He told me he thinks his other father is the one who sent him back in time, but he had no way of knowing for sure since he was pretty sure he died in the middle of all that alternate future mess. He is an idiot because he was fucking hiding all of this from me for years at this point, only to just info dump all of it in my lap this afternoon. Like the other 9 cloning attempts, he was cloned using a slight mix of another's DNA, since apparently using 𝐴ll4ONE's DNA straight never worked due to his weird genetics as a result of having all those quirks. He is the only one that the doctor used my DNA for as far as we are aware. The rest apparently used the doctor's own DNA. However, since the vast majority of the kids came out so fucking nuts for some reason using that combo, only 2 lived to make it to their late teens, which is when he and 𝐴ll4ONE split and I found out about all of that shit. I don't think I have to explain the bastard part given it was literal. How did this doctor even have access to your DNA to use? 𝐷𝐸 winced at that. We think he held onto a blood sample of mine that he took decades ago back when he was actually my doctor. The asshole is an evil bastard with a major god complex, but I didn't exactly know that at the time. He was just my ex's general practitioner, so it was convenient to see him for more routine visits. That really got Toshinori's attention. Your ex, I remember you mentioning that you were married at one point, but you have never brought it up since. Do you think she would be involved in all of this? Gran Torino snorted. Oh, that would be an understatement. I do wonder how he would react to finding out that you assumed that he was a girl, though. Toshinori blushed. Oh, it was silly of me to assume. I am normally better about that sort of thing. Gran Torino just leveled him with a look. Toshi, I was there for all your awkward attempts at dating. I know you wouldn't know what physical attraction in someone would look like if it hit you over the side of the head. I am just surprised you never heard Nana giving me shit over my horrible taste in men, given my husband turned out to literally be all for one of all people. Toshinori gave a small wail of despair as Tsukachi confirmed that last statement as true. Why? Of all people, why him? Gran Torino just snorted. Do you really want me to answer that? It should really be enough that I divorced him basically the same day I found out. Mind you, it took us several years for him to get the message through his thick skull and have it stick. And about half of those I spent locked in a literal vault that I have since been informed used to be where All for One locked up his own brother. Murai tapped the back of his pen on the table in clear thought. You do realize none of that explanation has truly given us a reason to trust your judgment of 10. All this tells us is you believe everything he has said to you, not that it is true. If anything, I have to wonder if you should be allowed to remain in this investigation when you are actively protecting a known villain. Gran Torino seemed to bristle at that. The reason I am covering for the kid is because he is one of the best damn heroes I have met over my career. And that is including Toshi here. I have no trouble fully believing an alternate you would have picked him as your successor with how recklessly selfless he is. Before he even got his license, the kid nearly died twice that I know of trying to save people around him, and before you call bias on me. I know a couple of you here would agree with me if he was brought up solely by his hero name from when you have worked cases together. That was concerning. He is a licensed pro. One that some of us have worked with before. Gran Torino rolled his eyes. And other heroes. That is all you are getting from me on the matter, Toshi. Tsukachi huffed. This is getting nowhere. Your issue is that you don't want All Might to know where to find him, right? How about a compromise? You tell me and only me who 10 is, and then if I agree with your assessment after talking to them about this, then we will drop them as relevant to the investigation, but if not, I can tell All Might and Sir Night-Eye both who he is. Deal. Toshinori almost gave himself whiplash with how fast Gran Torino agreed. You are that certain? Damn right I am. Believe me, once the detective here hears who it is, he is going to agree with me too. Iyai. Hated that Gran Torino was right with his assessment. So much for being a bias-free third party in this disagreement. He sighed as he braced himself for a less than fun conversation with one of his few other friends who worked in heroics. He wasn't sure if it was a good or bad thing that 𝐲𝐸 opened the door to his knock. Detective, did you need something? Is it just you home right now? I need to ask you a couple questions about something. It's Friday afternoon. Both Hisashi and Aburo are at the radio station prepping for their broadcast tonight. Truth. But you already knew that. Truth. Miyamasa winced at the pointed comment. Can I come inside? This is not exactly a conversation we want to have out in the hallway. 𝐲𝐸 moved out of the doorway and gestured inside. Miyamasa went through the motions of kicking off his shoes and putting on the house slippers that 𝐲𝐸 had bought for him after they had ended up working a kidnapping case together in their off hours. Miyamasa had spent the week it took to find the kid couch surfing due to the apartment being closer than his own to return to. It was only once they had settled in their normal places, as when they worked together with a cup of tea each, that Miyamasa decided to bite the bullet and start. So time travel, huh? 𝐲𝐸 didn't even outwardly react. Not surprising given that he probably knew it was only a matter of time until they had this conversation. I died 11 years from now and woke up again roughly 16 years ago. Truth. Shit, this conversation was going to suck, wasn't it? With not only your erasure but copies of both All for One and One for All, as well as all the other quirks One for All picked up along the way. Truth. Miyamasa blinked in surprise at that. Then you have 10 quirks now with the one you stole the other night. Technically it is 11 now. Truth. One for All at its core was 2 quirks to begin with, transference and a power stockpiler. Truth. He snorted, still disregarding that it was kinda fitting, I suppose. 10 quirks for clone attempt number 10. Truth. Miyamasa snorted before rubbing his face with a sigh. And you are not actually planning on stealing any more quirks? I wouldn't have necessarily even stolen Overhaul, despite how much I hate him for what he did in the last timeline, if it wasn't basically the only option that I could think of that I think will prevent my dad from going off the deep end completely. Truth. Sure, my dad is the supervillain, but believe me when I say that he could be far more dangerous if he wanted to. Truth. What I am doing is making sure he never wants to. Truth. Miyamasa let out an exhale of relief. Okay, he could work with that. He is currently the lesser evil from your perspective. 𝐲𝐸 snorted. That is an understatement. Truth. With how focused he is on little Izuku right now, going out with me to steal overhaul has probably been the most villainous thing he has done in years at this point that wasn't directed at the doctor's fractured off organization. Truth. I am pretty sure what he has been up to lately more qualifies as vigilantism, but to be fair, he was one before he was arbitrarily labeled as a villain and had his brother and brother-in-law sicked on him by the United States government. Truth. Okay, we are going to have to circle back to that in a bit. First, I think we should probably talk about Chisaki's quirk before we get too far off topic. What did he do that you had no issues attacking him as a kid here in this timeline? 𝐲𝗏 began counting off charges on his fingers. Murder and drug trafficking. Truth. Put his former boss in a coma to kidnap the man's currently unborn granddaughter. Truth. Using said granddaughter as an ingredient to manufacture quirk erasing bullets to remove a target's quirk factor completely. Truth. Which obviously was child abuse. Truth. There were other things, of course, but I am sure Sir Night Eye would be interested to know the man was the one who was responsible for killing him using his quirk, landing the blow in front of both of his work-study students and the little girl. Truth. A sigh. In front of myself. Truth. He was also among the numbers of people Shigaraki Tamura broke out of Tartarus. Truth. Naomasa paused in writing in his notepad that he had pulled out for the list. Shigaraki Tamura. 𝐲𝗏 waved him off. Already handled. Truth. He never manifested the quirk that forced him down the path to become a villain and take that name because Dad took it and replaced it with something less dangerous after I prompted him to look into the kid. Truth. Now he is just your average 8-year-old with dreams of being the next All Might. Truth. You aren't worried about the fact you basically hand your father such an apparently dangerous quirk. 𝐲𝗏 shrugged. It wasn't the quirk that was the issue but Tamura's twisted psyche that came from a really fucked up childhood before basically being handed the passcodes for a bunch of nukes after the doctor gave him a copy of All for One and a shit ton of other quirks. Truth. He was the one who killed me. Truth. Naomasa winced at that news before a thought seemed to strike him. But despite that fact you don't hold this version of him accountable but you do hold Chisaki. 𝐲𝗏 grimaced. Shigaraki was a monster, yes, but ultimately he was just a scared little kid in a fucked up situation. Truth. Chisaki, on the other hand, actively chose to become a monster with no outside influence. Truth. He is hardly the only villain from my previous life like that, and the same goes for Shigaraki. Truth. I am dealing with them as I come across them on a case-by-case basis. Truth. You have dealt with others. Villains that you think you have prevented from becoming villains now. 𝐲𝗏 curled in on himself, gaze focused on his cup of tea in his hands. Oboro didn't survive the building drop the last time. Truth. As Naomasa gave a hiss of shock at that statement, 𝐲𝗏 powered on. His body must have been stolen at some point by the doctor in the other timeline. Truth. It was used by him to create something called a 𝗀𝗄, which is a creature made from a human corpse and stuffed with extra quirks. Truth. I didn't find that out until after he was wheeled into my hospital room a few days later after the incident, this time round to discover to my horror that the doctor recreated the experiment on him while he was still alive this time. Truth. His quirk mutation was not a mutation but the result of 2 more quirks getting shoved into his body while neither my dad or I were looking. Truth. All 3 quirks eventually combined and stabilized into one, but the process could have easily destroyed his mind and left him the husk that Kurogiri was in the other timeline. Truth. Naomasa reached out a hand to gently rub a reassuring pattern on his broken friend's back as the man stifled a sob. This all frankly explained a lot about 𝐲𝗏. What he had assumed was just trauma from the incidents that had left him so badly physically scarred was just scratching the surface. Why don't we talk about something lighter? Were we friends in the previous timeline at all? That would most certainly explain why you specifically sought me out that first time. 𝐲𝗏 huffed and rubbed his eyes. No, we were mostly just acquaintances. Truth. I sought you out because I knew I could trust you though. Truth. I didn't really have many friends last time around. Not really. Truth. He paused and gave a small smile. Hazashi was my only real friend for a good while. Truth. Oboro was a pleasant surprise this time around. Truth. It would be nice if he stopped nearly dying in front of me though. Truth. That made Naomasa snort as he stifled a laugh, earning him a familiar half-smile from the normally dour man. Apparently All Might did not take the revelation of 𝐲𝗏's existence very well. This was painfully obvious due to the fact that the man doubled down on trying to find All for One and the mysterious 10 that both Gran Torino and the detective said was not an issue before kicking them from the investigation, stating point blank that he was uncertain if he could trust them anymore. Neither of them took that well. Thankfully for everyone involved, Nezu was still looped in on the investigation even if he had never been a real active part of it, and would occasionally slip 𝐲𝗏 information on the investigation in exchange for 𝐲𝗏 taking up a teaching position since he was still in desperate need for a homeroom teacher for one, given his father still really did not want to be a teacher. Honestly, 𝐲𝗏 was surprised the man lasted as long as he did. 𝐲𝗏 knew that he only got the job offer because Nezu wanted him where he could see him, but he was not all that bothered by it. He liked teaching and getting to mess with his students to teach them situational awareness and sorting out the kids who really should reconsider their choice in courses. He was pretty sure that Nezu liked the brand of chaos he was bringing to the table, taking inspiration not only from his own Aizawa-sensei but both his father's as well. Insane monster or no, the all for one of the past forced him to learn fast as well from his mistakes, so he never repeated them, and it was not hard to inspire the necessary fear in his students by kicking some out of his class, even if only temporarily when they did not take the quirk assessment test and threat of expulsion seriously. So with that in mind, 𝐲𝐸 was not surprised that he was at UA when apparently All Might finally succeeded in stumbling across one of his dad's safe houses while he was in it working there to track the doctor's latest movement. 𝐲𝐸 and his current homeroom froze as the intercom clicked on in their room near the start of the day. "Midori, it seems we have a 𝐀𝐦 situation. If you could come to my office, I will take over your classes for the rest of the day after you depart." 𝐲𝐸 found himself cursing as he flew through packing up, absently noting his class exchanging confused looks and comments. 𝐲𝐸 couldn't help thinking of the irony of the current situation when Shimura Tenko's voice cut through the class. "What the hell is a 𝐀𝐦? Belongings collected." 𝐲𝐸 met his student's eyes. "Long-term case related, not school. Sorry, but I have to leave." "Shimura, as class representative you are in charge until Nezu or another staff member turns up." Tenko gave a huff of frustration but sat back in his chair. Even after teaching the boy for nearly 2 months now, he was still glad for the clear visual disconnect between him and his alternate timeline counterpart. With his hair and eyes still their original black and lacking most of the scars and skin issues of Tamura, all he really saw when he looked at the boy was a leaner male Nana. Of course, then he would open his mouth spewing gamer terms and he would be forced to remember. He was still happy for the kid, even if he unnerved the hell out of him. Nana was so proud of him following in her footsteps at least. The fact his own hero name was made in reference to her own was a nice touch, 𝐲𝐸 had to admit. Star Racer to match her starlight. It was something to distract himself with as he hurried through the hallways, furiously texting 𝐴𝐻𝐻 to open a portal into Nezu's office and meet him there for the emergency. The door to the office opened for him before he could touch it to reveal 𝐴𝐻𝐻 reading over sets of coordinates on the computer. He looked up to meet 𝐲𝐸's eyes. "I'm coming with you." 𝐲𝐸 nodded. "Obviously, you're a ride. How bad is it?" Nezu turned the screen so he could see better. It was security camera footage from the front of a building showing that the opposite side of the street had been leveled. It looked like footage that had been recovered after the fact from 𝐀𝐦. 2 titans clashed in the air over on the other side of the wreckage as a shockwave knocked the camera feed out, and Nezu quickly typed to bring up another feed. "It is going to be tricky to get you in close to stop the fight before it gets much worse." 𝐲𝐸 winced before turning to 𝐴𝐻𝐻. "I need to swing by the apartment first to change. I can't show up to the fight as Eraserhead or we risk All Might putting 2 and 2 together and going on the offensive against not only me but all of UA since I work here." 𝐴𝐻𝐻 reluctantly nodded before gesturing to his hair. "What are you going to do about that?" 𝐲𝐸 activated Overhaul and pulled the dye from his hair in a motion he had been practicing on loose strands for a couple years at that point. "Done." Nezu twitched his whiskers in interest. "That was an interesting application of Overhaul, I take it. You will have to walk me through how you did that later. Now shoo and don't get arrested because I won't risk UA to get you out if you two get caught." As the two of them hurried through the portal and into their bedroom, 𝐲𝐸 pulled his suit from where he had hidden it at the back of the closet and quickly changed before pulling his hair back into a half ponytail in a practiced motion. "You should open up the portal in an alley away from the fight. I am fast enough using my quirks that the distance shouldn't delay me reaching them long and should keep them from connecting you to us." 𝐴𝐻𝐻 narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms. "𝐲𝐸, I am not just going to hide in an alleyway and play taxi." "A roof then." 𝐴𝐻𝐻, we really can't risk you getting caught associating with Dad and me. You will lose your license at a bare minimum and your life at the max. I can handle All Might. I literally have a more powerful version of his quirk so I can counter all his blows." After they stepped through the new portal, 𝐴𝐻𝐻 quickly grabbed 𝐲𝐸 and tugged him in to give him a parting kiss. "Don't get caught." 𝐲𝐸 gave him a wild grin. "See you in a few." He activated One for All in gear shift before darting off over the roofs in the direction of the destruction. As he darted closer, his stomach flipped as he realized he might have been just a second too late as he watched an All Might with organs falling from his left side plowed his father's skull into the street with the most sickening crunch he had ever heard. 𝐲𝐸 felt his vision go red as his erasure reflexively activated as he flew at All Might with a quirked punch of his own before landing next to his father's unmoving form. "No, no, 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 no. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸." Toshinori was not sure what just hit him, but his head was killing him. And his side, he supposed. But the organs still falling out of his chest had been doing that beforehand. He cracked open his eyes and struggled to look back in the direction of where he had just been moments before. There was a young man covered in sparks that had not been there before, looking clearly panicked as he rocked the form of the relievingly dead All for One back and forth, beginning to cry. "Dad, please come back. You aren't supposed to die." "Oh, shit." That was one of 𝐴ll-for-one's sons, wasn't it? The young man looked up from the form cradled in his arms to meet Toshinori's gaze. In that moment he realized exactly who this one was as his mentor Gran Torino's eyes stared back at him in clear disappointment. Ten staggered to his feet, still holding the limp form of his father. This isn't over. Toshinori shivered at the cold certainty in his voice before he just disappeared, darting away in a manner between buildings that he had only ever seen in his mentor. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸, 𝐲𝐷 dumped his father's corpse on the dining room table back in the apartment. He was genuinely not sure he could fix this, not sure how he would explain this if he failed to his mother and little brother, who were still painfully in the dark about his father's less-than-legal past that he had more or less dropped outside of his hunt for the doctor for the past few years, to spend as much time with both 𝐲𝐷 and Izuku as possible. It had been easy enough to pick up all of his father's remains with overhaul and stuff them back inside his skull and put a temporary patch over the massive hole, but even if he put all the pieces back into place, would his father even wake back up again? But he couldn't waste any more time as his father's cells likely started to die. He absently noted 𝐴ll had vanished after they had arrived back, but he couldn't risk himself getting distracted wondering where he had disappeared to. He got to work completing likely the world's most morbid jigsaw puzzle as he prayed. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸, he was alive. Normally, this inconsequential stray thought would not even register. Of course he was alive. After all, he was thinking, so being alive stood to reason. The issue, however, was the fact that Hisashi was fairly certain he had just died, that the blonde idiot All Might had won. But here he was, breathing, a pulse thundering in his ears. His next thought when he opened his eyes was that 𝐲𝐷 looked terrible. His son stood over him shaking slightly, face stained with tear tracks. You were right. Waking up again after definitely dying is a rather strange experience. 𝐲𝐷 gave a broken sob and scooped him up into a hug. Damn it, Dad. I told you that he would keep fighting until he killed you. Why did you lower your guard like that, you complete idiot? Hisashi internally preened at his son's open show of normally carefully guarded affection as he returned the hug. In my defense, ripping out someone's lung and stomach generally makes people stop fighting. 𝐲𝐷 reached up to smack him. And what the hell was I supposed to tell Mom and Izuku about how you died if overhaul hadn't fucking worked? Hisashi winced at that low blow. Well, I suppose you don't have to worry about that anymore at least. 𝐲𝐷 sighed and collapsed into one of the chairs beside the table that Hisashi had evidently been laid out on. And you couldn't have waited until I wasn't in class to get caught. Hisashi huffed as he swung his legs off the table and stood up, absently noting there did not seem to be a speck of dirt on him and the tears in his clothes had all been repaired. I wasn't exactly planning on him finding me anytime soon, 𝐲𝐷. I just missed the alert Nedzu normally sends me when All Might got close to a safe house to warn me to pack up and get out. Speaking of which, did you get my phone? 𝐲𝐷 gave him a blank look. No, I did not. I was a bit distracted practicing fucking necromancy on your ass. Don't worry, Nedzu sent me to get it. Hisashi was embarrassed as he jolted as a portal opened up next to them to reveal Shirakumo dropping off the phone in question, as well as his suit jacket with his wallet and house keys that he had slung over the back of the chair that he had been working in before All Might turned up. Hisashi and I got called in for the cleanup, so I need to get back to that before anyone realizes I have been gone longer than it takes to drop an injured bystander off at a hospital. Did you have anything else on you that could be linked back to the rest of your family? Hisashi was quick to shake his head, earning him a thumbs up before Shirakumo disappeared again. That reminds him. So when are you marrying those two? You shouldn't let that sort of loyalty slip away. 𝐲𝐷 snorted and walked over to the bookshelf in the living room to pull out a book seemingly at random and flipped it open to show a pair of ring boxes tucked inside a cutout of the pages. 𝐴ll also has rings hidden in the back of the drawer of one of the bedside tables. I have been waiting for one of the two hopelessly romantic idiots to just propose already for months now. If neither of them can get their act together by the next time it is my turn to do the grocery shopping, I am just buying a pair of ring pops from the American candy section of the store and chucking them at their heads when I see them after. Hisashi burst out laughing as 𝐲𝐷 scooped the book up to reshelf it. How on earth did you find out about that? 𝐲𝐷 rolled his eyes. 𝐴ll forgot that I keep my extra eye drops in his drawer, and of course I noticed the new book on the bookshelf and got curious about it. I am more surprised that neither of them has realized that they both bought engagement rings. Hisashi reached out to ruffle his son's currently white hair. I am just glad the three of you are all happy together. Honestly, I guess I should have realized that you were stuck with them after your first trip to the hospital. Did this happen in the other timeline too with them? 𝐲𝐷 winced at the question. No. Before Hisashi could ask, he elaborated. 𝐴ll didn't live long enough to become a pro-hero. Hisashi's stomach dropped at how much of a statement of fact that had clearly been. Though, is that why you jumped in to save him so quickly both times? You didn't want to see him die again? 𝐲𝐷 just sighed. He could have been anyone in either case, and I still would have jumped in to save him. I have seen too much death already. If I can save someone, I will. Period. Hisashi reached over to pull his son into a tight hug. And that is why you are my little hero. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Really wanted to hit Toshinori when he saw him laying in the hospital bed. He didn't, of course, but the temptation was really there, especially after his phone conversation he had with 𝐜𝐡𝐢𝐬. Instead, he lashed out with his cane to hit 𝐬𝐿 sitting at the man's bedside. What did I tell you too about dropping the all-for-one thing to focus on the doctor? 𝐬𝐿 recoiled, clearly not expecting the attack on his shins. It wasn't for nothing. All-for-one is dead and won't be an issue anymore. Yeah, and you did it at the price of killing a man with a wife and 9-year-old son who have no idea about any of this and leaving my kid to have to deliver the news that his father is never coming home. He pinched his brow as he took a calming breath. Damn it, I wasn't telling you to stop investigating him completely. I was just trying desperately to get you to wait. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 felt a stab of satisfaction as both men flinched at that. Toshi looked at him like he had just kicked his puppy. Just 9 years old. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 gave him a level look. You can do math, can't you? It was only just 5 years ago that I told you that the kid's quirk hadn't come in quite yet. That sort of implies a kid 5 and under, or did that part not register because you were too busy freaking out about 10? Toshinori averted his eyes to avoid answering that question. When were you going to mention that you trained 10 how to fight? 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 blinked in surprise. I didn't. Why do you ask? Toshinori leveled a glare of all things at him. He moved just like you do in a fight when he carried off all-for-one's body. Huh. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 scratched his chin. Well, if you take the whole time travel thing into account, it is possible the other version of me taught him at some point after the other you gave him one for all. I've never seen him use one for all in a fight, so I suppose it does make sense that he would move differently with it than without. Of course, knowing the kid, it is possible he just picked up the style after watching me move over the years. I would hardly be the only hero he copied in a fight. He learned how to punch originally by just copying you and apparently only stopped because doing so with one for all active made him keep breaking things from the increase in power. Toshinori sighed. Do you know what his plans are for all-for-one's body? 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 shifted his weight to rest more on his cane. Outside of ensuring the doctor can't grab him? No idea. I was a bit more concerned about the fact that you were disemboweled, Toshi. Both of the other men winced at the reminder. Sir pushed up his glasses and gave Toshinori a sad look. Gran Torino does have a point there. We really should focus on what our next actions should be now that you have been so critically injured. All-for-one might now be gone, but there are still the issues of his former followers, and now that 10. He gave 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 a clear look as he said the name. Has made it clear that we are now considered his enemy. We should plan for his eventual retaliation. With that to consider, I really think that it is time for you to leave, given you have made it perfectly clear who you side with in this conflict. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 glared at the greenette. There would not even be sides if the two of you had just listened to me, but fine, I'll leave. I know when I am not wanted. Before he opened up the door to the hallway, he paused. Just a heads up, if you are planning on finding a successor for one for all, you are going to have to find someone quirkless like Toshi. According to 10, the quirk would eventually kill its holder if they already had one due to the stress on the body from holding more than one quirk. It is what killed the 4th holder, 𝐶INAMORI 𝐸𝐻𝐻. The only reason 10 never has had any issues was the fact that he was designed to have more than one quirk in the first place. Feel free to look up 𝐶INAMORI if you don't believe me. With that, he yanked open the door and resigned himself to possibly never seeing the boy he had helped raise ever again. He took one last look at the injured form in the bed. Goodbye, Toshinori. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Toshinori stared at the door shutting behind the man he would have never admitted to having thought of as good as his own father in the quiet moments in the years since Nana's death. His heart ached from the guilt and hurt as he blinked back tears in the wake of his leaving. As much as he hated to admit it, the older hero was likely right. Up until now, 10 had basically been a ghost as far as they were concerned. A complete non-entity when it came to the associates of all-for-one that they likely would never have even known about had he not gone out and stolen overhaul. In killing all-for-one, he had traded one enemy for one likely far more dangerous. One that, if his story of time travel was actually true, had not only the power of all-for-one but a more powerful version of one for all than he himself currently carried. One that he knew nothing about but would know him personally. Even if he recovered fully, he would still have to find a successor. Mirai huffed and turned away from the door himself. As if we are actually supposed to believe that. I'm sure that having you pick a quirkless successor would be just what they need to give 10 the extra edge to beat them. Toshinori frowned. He would hardly need that. He has a copy of both one for all and all for one at his disposal already. Allegedly. Toshinori had to concede that point at least. Still, we should independently confirm the possibility that he was being truthful with the warning. He gave us a name to look into. Mirai sighed and shook his head. He gave us a name at least. We need to consider that the name he gave might not have any connection to the previous holders as well and might just have been selected to back up what would otherwise be unsubstantiated claims. If that is true, then there would be no connection that we will be able to trace back to him. If we can trace back my predecessors far enough, it should be easy enough to confirm. Assuming that it is not just them sending us on a snipe hunt to delay you finding and training a successor. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 sighed. I would rather be safe than sorry. If he was being honest and we ignored him, then the guilt of a potential young hero dying early because we ignored his warning would be on us. On me. Mirai sighed and shook his head. Something you need to keep in mind is regardless of your own feelings about Gran Torino, he is not our ally any longer. He has made it perfectly clear on multiple occasions that he would side with 10 over you despite your history with one another and the other's villainous actions. Additionally, we have to consider that the man was apparently married to 𝐴ll for a time, which brings into question if he was really ever on your side at all. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 grimaced. I am pretty sure that at least isn't true. You never saw a fight between the two, but I am pretty sure Gran Torino's hatred of 𝐴ll was real. I doubt the pair of them would have ever managed to stand in the same room as one another without him trying to kill 𝐴ll for what he did to both Nana and me. And yet he was vehemently opposed to the idea of you fighting him. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 let his head fall back on his pillow. And I can't really blame him for it either, given that I very nearly lost. Mirai. The argument he used to always use against me going after 𝐴ll was that I wasn't ready for a fight against him. A fact that I realize now was still true when I went into that fight. I won, sure, but only because I got lucky. If 𝐴ll hadn't lowered his guard after he ripped out my lung, I never would have won, and it would have been my corpse that we were left with, not his. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 sighed and rubbed his face. I, at the very least, should have found a successor beforehand in case everything went horribly wrong like it did. Mirai gained a pensive look at that. After a few minutes that lapsed into silence between them, Mirai spoke again with a hint of caution in his voice. There is something else we can do. It could be risky as it would lock us into one path for the future, but I could always check your future to see who your successor will be. It would remove the issue of whether we should listen to Gran Torino about 𝐴ll not being able to be held by someone quirkless or not at the very least. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 gave Mirai a worried look. Are you sure? You would likely be looking further into the future than you normally would want to risk. Mirai sighed and nodded. I suspect that it would actually be the safest course of action with so many variables of uncertainty. Additionally, my searching your future could provide warning as to any future attacks by 10, or the doctor that created him. He nodded. That too. An agreement reached. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 held out a hand for his last remaining trustworthy friend in Japan to take. Mirai's face glazed over as his eyes shifted to the violet and black that gave him his hero name as he began fast-forwarding through the future. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 found himself starting to worry as the minutes stretched on. He watched the clock on the wall as his worry grew. Finally, as his sidekick nearly hit his hour limit, Mirai blinked and pulled his hand away to rub at his dried-out eyes. Your successor's name is Midoriya Izuku. He's the younger brother of Eraserhead and either has an invisible quirk like an apparent late uncle of his or is possibly just quirkless. Regardless, he has a strong heroic spirit that you will like when you eventually meet him roughly 5 years from now. That being said, you will have to help him do some physical training to get into the physical shape necessary to hold the quirk without major backlash. While he is not a near-complete hopeless case on that front thanks to his older brother, he will still need a lot of work for you to train him to be ready in time for his chance at the UA entrance exams. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 sagged in relief. You didn't see any hint about 10 then for the next couple years. No, nothing obvious at least. A small mercy at least. So what are your thoughts about the boy that I apparently pick? Mirai frowned and sat back. He is no future symbol of peace, but he has a good head on his shoulders that could be a good counter for 10 based on what little we know about him. I think we should maybe consider the possibility that we should be considering 2 successors for you. One for your role as the next future symbol and Midoriya as the next holder. The boy strikes me better as the future #1 underground hero as opposed to Limelight. He clearly doesn't like too much outside attention like his older brother, so I would not be surprised if he would be better off following the same path, given that his brother is currently flirting with holding that position himself even while teaching at UA full-time. That really does not seem all that surprising, 𝗀𝐻𝐻 had to admit. You do have a point though about the idea of 2 different successors. While one for all would be a useful tool for the next symbol after me to hold to give them an edge in a fight, it would hardly be necessary if they had the right stuff. So long as they can make people feel safe and are good enough at what they do, it would hardly be necessary. Mirai nodded. My thoughts exactly. Well, since we will not have to search for your successor for one for all given your paths are fated to cross, perhaps we should begin our search for your more public successor. 𝐲𝐻𝐻 was getting very close to using a 100% one for all powered punch on his dad. The reason? The bastard was stalking him on his late-night patrol. Again, it was beginning to become a recurring issue at this point. Following his father's death and subsequent resurrection, 𝐲𝐻𝐻 had put a blanket ban on the man from working on the villain side of things himself, since he was, supposed to be dead, and the only way to keep All Might believing he really was gone was for him to actually be gone. This, of course, left his dad with way too much free time that he had no idea what to do with. And of course he couldn't just stay at home with all that extra time. not without drawing attention to it for both his mother and younger brother. As it was, he was pushing it by working from home more often than he used to, but he couldn't just stop his business trips overseas completely. So he had started spending those week-long trips crashing with 𝐲𝐸 and his now fiancés, which would in turn lead to him following 𝐲𝐸 on his patrol. Up until tonight, all that had really meant was an annoying shadow for him to put up with, but tonight, 𝐲𝐸 looked at the corpse at his father's feet before looking back up at his father with a pointed glare. The bastard just shrugged. A corpse can't complain about a stolen quirk. 𝐲𝐸 pinched the bridge of his nose. Why did you even go after him in the first place? His father gestured vaguely in the direction that 𝐲𝐸 had originally seen a woman running from that had prompted him to circle back to the alley in the first place. I thought that he was going to sexually assault her. I couldn't in good consciousness just stand back and watch. 𝐲𝐸 took a deep breath to fight back the urge to punch the man again. And you couldn't just, come and get me. But then I wouldn't have gotten the quirk. 𝐲𝐸 hated that he understood his father's twisted logic. It by no means justified his father's actions, but he understood it. Just go while I call the cops about the body. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸 was less than happy to be sitting in the interrogation room as the hour ticked over past what should have been the end of his shift. He knew it was standard procedure to interview the hero who found a body to ensure that they were not the ones to kill the individual, and to hear their thoughts on the situation. But 𝐲𝐸 had been looking forward to getting at least some sleep before he had to head to UA to teach. Needless to say, he was happy to see 𝐬𝐬 appear through the door with 2 mugs of coffee. So what happened? 𝐲𝐸 accepted his mug happily. My shadow for the past couple nights apparently spotted the guy assaulting a woman. By the time that I was pointed that way by her, he was already dead. 𝐬𝐬 frowned. Your shadow, 𝐲𝐸 hummed. Dumas. That earned a wince before the realization seemed to click and his jaw dropped. I thought he was dead. 𝐲𝐸 snorted. He was. The devil didn't want him and sent him back. 𝐬𝐬 slumped back in his seat, flicking his eyes up to the camera that they both knew was watching them and would be reviewed by a third party later. Shit. Who all knows about that? Besides myself, Nedzu, present Mike, and Loud Cloud for sure, but I won't be surprised if Gran Torino knows by now too, what with Dumas originally being his problem and all. And now you, I suppose. 𝐬𝐬 messaged his forehead and nodded. So do we know if this is a one-off thing or should we expect more bodies over the next couple months? If it isn't, the next body after that will be his. Maybe death might even stick this tie. 𝐲𝐸 immediately cut himself off as danger sense flared in warning. Moving on instinct, he ducked under the table, pulling 𝐬𝐬 with him before a massive boom shook the room. In less than a blink of an eye, the ceiling above them collapsed down as the floors of the building above them crashed down, plunging them into darkness, the metal table having just barely shielded them. 𝐲𝐸 felt 𝐬𝐬 begin to shake underneath him at the shock of the near miss. When he spoke, it was with a clear tremor in his voice. 𝐲𝐸, what just happened? No idea, but given it triggered danger sense just before it happened, it was clearly an intentional attack on the station. A familiar taste of electricity in the air danced over him as danger sense flared again. Then there was a flash and another boom before 𝐲𝐸 picked out a familiar voice from the confusion. Do you think we got them all? 𝐲𝐸 hissed under his breath. 9 is here with at least one of his friends, a guy called 𝐀𝐦. Damn it, why are they here? They didn't do this last time. Around them rain began to fall from the quirk-conjured storm clouds. Are you going to fight them? 𝐲𝐸 looked out from their small shelter to try and get a beat on the group before looking back down at 𝐬𝐬 still half underneath him. Do you have your phone on you? Yeah, good. You are going to call 𝐴BRO to get you out of here. 𝐲𝐸 activated overhaul on his hair to quickly strip the dye. Sorry about this, but the last thing we need is for me to walk out there as 10 openly wearing my hero costume. What are you? 𝐲𝐸 activated overhaul again on their clothes, making a clean switch between them. Wish me luck. He activated one for all and launched himself out into the rain. He was quick to circle around behind the 3 figures he could see so that no one would hopefully realize he had been inside the building. Angle on them achieved. He shot out to collide with his fellow clone, quirk flaring. It didn't stop the rain, of course, now that it had started, but it would keep him from lashing out with any other potential quirks he could have if he had gone back to the doctor for a copy of All for One like he had the last time. 9's eyes widened as he looked up on him in shock as his allies cried out around them. That was fair. Most people are not expecting to randomly be tackled by someone near identical to themselves out of the blue. The rumors were true. He did make more of us. 𝐲𝐸 reached out and caressed his elder half-brother's cheek with his fingertips, brushing up against his quirk, making the other clone shiver slightly at the touch. Only one quirk. He didn't have a copy of All for One yet. Hello 9. I'm 10. Is there a reason you are attacking the station that my favorite cops work at? I'll be rather cross with you if you killed one of them. Before his stunned brother could reply to the quiet question, danger sense flared as his brother's friends came to his aid. He launched himself up into the air, allowing himself to blink. 9, are you all right? He watched Slice come over to check on 9 before glaring up at him, floating above them in the rain, only illuminated by the odd crack of natural lightning. Before she could attack, his brother grabbed her arm and shook his head. "We're leaving." 𝐀𝐦 growled at that. "What about Mummy? You can't seriously be thinking about leaving his body here." "Oh," 𝐲𝐸 thought back to the corpse from the alley. Since he had never fought Mummy himself and he had been captured so early on during the fight for 𝗏𝗏 Island, the man had completely slipped his mind in the past couple decades. It was no surprise he hadn't recognized the man, especially since his dad stealing his quirk likely meant he had absconded with his signature bindings without 𝐲𝐸 noticing. 𝐁 pulled himself up to his feet and glanced up to 𝐲𝐸 hanging suspended in midair above him. "I am not fighting him for a corpse. We can recover Mummy's body later. Let's go." 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Tonight had been an unmitigated disaster. First, 𝐻𝐸 had slipped away on his own to apparently have some fun only to wind up dead. Who knows when they would have discovered had his phone not been on him, and for the police to try calling his emergency contact to try and identify the body. Then their attempt to kill the hero that had likely killed him and was trying to cover it up was interrupted by 𝐴ll4One's chosen successor, who had reportedly inherited their biological donor's quirk like the Doctor had been attempting with himself and their predecessors. That was a fact he no longer doubted after the younger clone stole and returned his own quirk, likely to prove a point. And now, 𝗀 sat comfortably sprawled out casually on their sofa in their hideout, having followed them back. He seemed openly amused as both Kurika and Chijuro looked back and forth between the two of them in open confusion, his near-identical appearance to himself now plain for them to see. "I apologize for your loss. I would offer to try and revive him, but between you all dropping the building on his body and the time elapsed, I am uncertain how well it would work." 𝐁 considered his double suspiciously. "I was under the impression that only our creator dabbled with that sort of thing." 𝗀 shrugged. "I don't normally myself, but I was forced to make an exception when All Might cracked our mutual father's skull open like an egg." 𝐁 took a sharp inhale of breath. "𝐴ll4One is still alive." 𝗀 snorted. "Don't get too excited. He is the one that stole your friend's quirk and killed him to cover his tracks." 𝐁 had to close his eyes and take a steadying breath. That was not great news. What are the chances he would give up Mummy's quirk? 𝗀 seemed to consider that. "If I harassed him enough, pretty high. He would have to be the one he gave it to, of course. Your other friends here would either go insane or die from the stress of holding two quirks unlike us. And you know where he is to ask to do so." 𝗀 turned to Kurika. "Obviously, he is theoretically back at my apartment waiting for me to get home, but he might have left to try and come find me in wake of your attack on the station." That was something that had bothered 𝐁 from the start. "How did you even know that we were there?" "I was talking with my detective friend who was there when the attack started. I noticed the freak weather and put two and two together knowing what your quirk is. He would be the one who might have tipped off to Dad that something happened, since I told him to call for someone to dig him out of the rubble while I dealt with the three of you." 𝐁 felt himself pale. "You were inside the building." 𝗀 held a finger to his lips in clear amusement. "Don't tell anyone. I have worked hard to keep All Might from linking my hero persona to this one." "Heroic persona? Why the hell would you even bother with that?" 𝗁 was extremely tempted to punch Chijuro for the question from the strained look across 𝗀's face. "Because I have far more in common morally with my other father and our late uncle than I do Dad, as much as I love him. Also consider the fact that among the heroes he trusts would be the last place All Might would look for me, even knowing that I have a hero's license under my legal identity." 𝗁 frowned. "Other father, are you not a clone after all?" 𝗀 shrugged. "I am just as much one as you are. We both just have different secondary donors for stabilization. You and all the ones before you after the Doctor started hybridizing our father's genetic code with another's have the same donor, while I was a one-off before he seemed to have dropped the project entirely to pursue the Namu project." 𝗁 went rigid. "We aren't pure copies then that mutated slightly?" 𝗀 snorted. "Is that what he told you?" "No, it is roughly a 80/20 split for both you and me according to the files Dad found while investigating the project after he found out about the Doctor's little secret. I think 6 was closer to 60/40, which is why he looks so much more different from our father than us. 𝐴ll4One's genetics are too unstable thanks to his massive collection of quirks. If the Doctor ever wanted to clone him properly, he would have to offload all his quirks first before the DNA sample was taken to remove all the variability. That is why none of us naturally inherited 𝐴ll4One as our quirk." 𝗁 had to give him a look of pure disbelief at that. "But you have 𝐴ll4One." "I have a copy of it, yes, but it was not my first quirk. It was my 8th. 𝗁 felt slightly dumbstruck at that revelation. 𝐴ll4One gifted you with that many quirks?" "No, I believe it would be far more accurate to say my brother did." 𝗁 flinched and whipped his head around to look back at the door to their hideout. The grinning man stood in the doorway casually leaning up against the frame with his arms crossed. 𝐴ll4One. 𝗀 barely glanced in his direction. "𝗁 wants that quirk you just stole earlier back. The guy was one of his friends." 𝐴ll4One gave an overdramatic sigh before his act slipped and he resumed grinning. "I suppose there is nothing for it, but why stop with just mummification? I have far more than just that at my disposal to offer you." Consider any of them as gifts of apology for mistakenly killing your ally. Do you have a healing quirk or something else that might counter the backlash of mine? 9 couldn't help but feel a spike of guilt as the words escaped him. Still, this had been the whole reason they had been searching for 𝐷 and 𝐸 over the past few years. Still, he had to wonder about the exchange of a glare and a shit-eating grin on 𝐷 and 𝐸's parts at the question. After a beat, 𝐷 sighed. Yes, actually, I happen to have an extra copy of cellular regeneration that I am not using that I originally created for your brother here before he stole 𝐷. Anything else? 9 glanced over at both Kuruka and Chijuro, who were watching 𝐷 cautiously. Understandable, all things considered. Still, if a copy of 𝐷 is an option, it isn't. 9 turned his attention back to 𝐸, who had cut him off. My copy of 𝐷 is one of a kind, and currently there is no way to create another or for me to pass it on thanks to how it bonded with another quirk. Is there a reason that you want it yourself? 9 wasn't surprised by the answer, albeit slightly disappointed. While he highly doubted that to be true, he wouldn't have wanted to give up his own copy of the quirk if he had it either. I merely thought it would be easier. I have a list of quirks that I suspect would be useful, but if I am the only one of us that could safely carry more quirks, I will have to review it first. Is there some way for us to contact you at a later date? 10 nodded and held out a hand. If you give me your phone, I can add my phone number. Just make sure no heroes ever see it. I only have the one so they could recognize it if they saw it. 9 reached into his pocket to fish it out to unlock it before handing it over. What is your hero persona anyways? It would be nice to know so we don't accidentally trip over you again. 10 took it and began to quickly type in a new contact. I'm Eraserhead. Do me a favor and avoid Loud Cloud and Present Mike too. I would prefer it if you didn't fight my future husbands either. 9 blinked. Your future husbands? 10 gave him a look as he handed back the phone. You have a problem with that? 9 was quick to shake his head. Sorry, I was just surprised. I wasn't expecting you to be in a relationship with a hero, let alone two. He froze as a hand came to rest on the top of his head. It seemed that 𝐷 had moved while he had been more focused on 10. Suddenly the pain in his chest that he had long grown used to over the past few decades seemed to fade away. Are there any quirks from your list that you are certain that you would like for yourself while you review the others in the meantime? I could certainly use the distraction a quirk hunt could provide. Playing possum is terribly dull. 9 considered that. There are a couple that some heroes have that I think would be nice. 𝗵𝘃𝑗's, quick draws, and possibly guardians. 𝐷 scratched his chin and thought. Hydra, bullet laser, and air wall. Yes, that would be a nice combination for combat that would counteract most weaknesses. Have you considered adding utility quirks as well? I suspect radar scanning would play well with your clear combat focus, since it would allow you to determine which of your quirks would be the best fit in a fight. That was one of the ones on the list I was still considering. 𝐷 patted him on the top of the head again. Consider it done. I'll have your brother call you when I have finished collecting them for you. We don't want to do it all at once, of course, lest the heroes realize there is a serial killer on the loose. He gave 9 a wink before strolling over to 10 and holding out a hand. Come on, we need to get you back to your place to recolor your hair before another hero realizes that you are unaccounted for. 𝐸𝐸𝐸𝐸. Toshinori stood outside the ruins of what had been Tsukachi's home police department. Both 10 and 9 had been here just hours before, according to witness accounts. He had just missed them. It's my fault for missing this. If I had just paused long enough while looking ahead to discover the source of the destruction, we might have been able to save more lives even if we could not stop it. Toshinori sighed at Murai's clear guilt he felt and shook his head. What is done is done. Don't blame yourself. Blame 9 and 10. They are the ones that were behind the attack, not you. 9 at least was. I am less certain about 10. Toshinori turned to the source of the new voice joining their conversation. Eraserhead looked miserable, but Toshinori supposed that was to be expected given that he had been inside the building when it collapsed. The man had apparently been sent back to his apartment by Loud Cloud when he found him, but he had come straight back after showering and changing clothes to help with the body identification process. What makes you say that? Eraserhead took a sip of his coffee that some of the emergency workers were handing out to warm people up while they worked in the rain. 10 openly attacked 9 and stopped him from hitting the building with a third strike of lightning. 9's buddies then reacted like he was a hostile. That doesn't exactly imply that they are friendly with each other. I think it is far more likely that this was the first time they crossed paths, so the attack was solely done by 9. Murai narrowed his eyes behind his glasses. How do you even know enough about them to know which is which? You aren't on the case. Eraserhead gave Murai a bored look. Unlike you limelight heroes, I actually keep my ear to the ground. There have been plenty of rumors floating around about 10 since he made his debut at 𝐷 side when he stole that quirk from the shy Hasekai, and more than a couple about 9 and his little trio of friends. Toshinori frowned. Trio? I only heard that he was accompanied by 2 others, not 3. Eraserhead gestured to the still ongoing corpse removal process from the basement morgue. One of those bodies is number 3 based on what I overheard while Tsukachi and I were still trapped. I found him dead on patrol about an hour before everything went to shit. That was why I hadn't headed home yet. No fucking idea why they didn't just come to identify and collect his body like fucking normal people. We literally had no way of connecting them to the name 9 before all of this. 𝗏𝗏𝐬 turned back to watching the morbid sight. How did he die? Broken neck. We have a vigilante, 𝗬𝗲𝗧𝗏, around here that has been stalking me on my patrols lately. At some point during the night he vanished and killed the guy. It isn't the first time he's done something like this, just the first time he's killed since he started stalking me. The guy is like a cat that likes bringing his owner the things that he caught. He's followed other heroes then. 𝗃𝗏𝗧𝗏 nodded. Nobody really recently, but he has a regeneration quirk that slowed his aging, so he has been around a while. The last hero he got interested in was 𝐷𝗀 𝐍𝐴, but there are records of him pulling this shit since the hero system was originally made with some of the original 7, though mostly with Captain Hero. I think that 𝐷𝗀 𝐍𝐴 caught his attention with how similar he designed his hero costume to Captain Hero's. Add to the fact that if I changed my hair a bit and wore color contacts, I would be Captain Hero's doppelganger, leaves all signs pointing to him being a superfan like 𝗀𝗱𝗏 for you. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 winced at the comparison, but Mirai seemed to study Eraserhead's face in a new light. After a moment his eyes widened. I never would have noticed that had you not pointed that out. You do really look like him. Eraserhead shrugged. Yeah, by today's standards I am pretty boring, but at the time 𝗬𝗲𝗧𝗏 and Captain Hero were born, Captain Hero was considered one of the most attractive heroes of the time. It was one of the reasons he was chosen for the original 7 despite his heart condition making hero work more dangerous for him. He was basically the face of the 7 at the time, though the commander eventually replaced him as such following his early death. With his scar he was a more memorable face for the history books. Plus there were no copyright issues with his hero persona like there were for Captain Hero, since the latter just ripped his whole hero persona from a character from a limited run of comic books from the 1950s. 𝗏𝗏𝗏's jaw dropped as Eraserhead just kept going with facts about the actual hero and his fictional counterpart in the law case that arose from the similarities between the two, and slowly grew more and more animated as Mirai nodded along and threw out the odd fact here and there. As he stood there slightly baffled at the exchange, Present Mike walked up looking like he was about to ask the underground hero something before pausing and laughing to himself before tapping 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and gesturing to him to follow. You won't be getting your sidekick back for probably another hour or so. Eraserhead doesn't look like it, but he is totally a hero superfan, and once he starts he won't stop until it runs its course. He pulled out his phone. Looks like his kids are getting Nenzu for homeroom again. Probably for the best. Once the adrenaline and caffeine wear off, he is going to crash hard. Suddenly the reason why the two young heroes had always seemed so familiar clicked. His head snapped back around to stare at the dark-haired hero. At building collapse in 𝗏𝗏𝗏 Ward, Present Mike clicked his tongue. Wait, don't tell me you never realized. Yeah, there is a reason 𝗏𝗏𝗏 bounced as soon as we got everyone transported to the hospital. Honestly, I am shocked that Eraserhead came back after having a nightmare scenario like that happen to him again. I swear, at this point I am convinced that he is just cursed. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 studied the young man he had previously thought would have been forced to quit heroics from how severe his previous injuries were. With how badly he was hurt, the thought never occurred to me. Present Mike snorted. Okay, sure, that looked bad, but I am still convinced the accident during the entrance exam was worse. His back is just a nightmare to look at even now a decade later. And I still can't stand the sight or smell of barbecue. At least for the building drop. Once all his bones were put back in place, Recovery Girl was able to fix him right up. He shook his head. I am just glad he reacted fast enough to get him and the detective under the steel table before the ceiling fell in on him. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 found himself quick to agree. While his relationship with 𝗏𝗏𝗏 had been badly damaged with the fighting about what to do about 10, he most certainly did not want him dead. Speaking of 𝗏𝗏𝗏, do you know where he is? Passed out on our couch last I heard. I can text 𝗏𝗏𝗏 to check if he is still there or if he took him home. Present Mike flushed bright red. Oh, whoops, ugh, I was doing so well. He rubbed his nose below his sunglass frames. That is mine and 𝗏𝗏𝗏's. Publicist warned us against publicly acknowledging our relationship outside of heroic partnership for now, since if we do, it would bring a lot of attention onto Eraserhead, which would basically force him into the limelight. Plus, if we ever want kids, it would be a harder sell for adoption if none of us could ever go out in public with the kid and not get recognized. It is bad enough when we babysit Eraserhead's little brother as it is. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 couldn't help but feel sympathetic about that. That was his own reasoning for never adopting a kid himself, despite how much he would have loved to by now. That and his terrible work habits, but he would never admit that last part aloud. So the three of you, Present Mike nodded. Yeah, we have all been together since that incident scared us all half to death. We have been engaged for like a week though. Oh, congratulations, Present Mike chucked. Thanks. Still, I am sort of annoyed with 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and myself about the whole thing. We spent so many months overthinking the proposal to try and make it like super romantic that Eraserhead got fed up with the two of us and went and threw a pair of ring pops at us and told us we were all engaged. Apparently he found the rings both me and 𝐷𝐷𝐺𝐻 bought independently from one another and had been just waiting for either of us to say something. The whole thing was made slightly worse by the fact that we were babysitting his brother at the time. The kid thought it was hilarious. 𝐸𝐸 laughed at that. If it cheers you up, at least you had rings. My friend Dave accidentally lost the ring after doing a massive elaborate romantic plan to propose to his wife. Thankfully Sarah was a good sport about it and helped him figure out where he misplaced the ring. That would be the shield's right. That's right. As they chatted, 𝐸𝐸 couldn't help but feel painfully aware of his limited hours he could be transformed. Sure, it was supposed to be his day off, but how many times had he actually not gotten involved in something on his days off? As nice as it has been chatting with you, I really should go. When Sir Gnideye eventually escapes your fiancé, let him know I headed back to Mite Tower. Present Mike gave him a grin. Will do. The moment that he jumped away, Hisashi felt the tension that had been in his shoulders loosen slightly. What the hell was going through 𝐲𝐻�'s head that made him think talking with them like that was a good idea? He looked back over to 𝐲𝐻 seeing him in a full-blown rant with Sir Gnideye about what he thought was about knockoff All Might collectibles and was suddenly struck with the fact that had things been different, he would have been considering the older sidekick as a potential friend for 𝐲𝐻. He looked so alive and happy talking with him. It was to the point that had he not known 𝐲𝐻 better, he might have been jealous. 𝐲𝐻 very really lit up around other people like this, so very rarely lowered his guard. He had to wonder, perhaps in another life the two of them could have been friends. If All Might and Sir Gnideye had not been so gung-ho about hunting 𝐲𝐻, would Hisashi have watched as 𝐲𝐻 expanded his little circle of friends to one more? This was a pointless line of thinking. It was only a matter of time until the truth came out. He just hoped that 𝐲𝐻 would come out of it still as himself. Not that it mattered. He and 𝗷𝗻 had made their beds years ago now. They were the three dumb Migos, and if one of them went down, they all would.